to the city of Solon in droves. The protagonist looked up and said that he was finally in Solon. He quickly walked up to the guard and thought that the original owner of this body was beaten to death for stealing. He immediately took over his body after he crossed over to this world. He had a token in his hands, and Chuck added that he didn't expect the original owner to be a native of the famous Orlando family. The guard smiled widely, and our hero noted that he had run to this place for many reasons. Our hero was calmly let through, and he noted that this would be the starting point of his new life. Then he grinned widely. Already in the throne room, the ruler noted that he had terrible news for him. Dave looked at our hero and said that his father, Calvin Orlando, had died last week. Then he looked at the document and added that the new successor of the family, his half-brother, Wenger Orlando, he had long considered him a thorn in his side. Chuck stared at him, waiting for him to continue. Then he opened his mouth and asked what he wanted to say. Dave frowned sharply and suggested that Chuck should give up his name. Then he snapped his fingers and added that if he agreed, Venger would give him 500 gold coins to create his own territory. At that moment, a servant appeared with a chest. Chuck took one of the many coins. Then he smirked and thought about what he would do with this in his new life. The ruler lowered his head and noted that it seemed like they had reached an understanding. The protagonist turned around abruptly. Then he leaned back in his chair and said that his name evoked thoughts of success and glory. It was the most beautiful thing he got from his father. Dave raised his eyebrows and asked if our hero refused. Chuck grinned widely and shouted that he should give him more money. The ruler looked at him in surprise. Then he stuck out his finger and said that he would give him 1,000 gold pieces and interest-free loans, but he would have to buy from his city. The coin spun in the air. Chuck caught it and made the deal. Then he turned to the servant and remarked that he had heard that there was a group of mountain barbarian slaves in the Colosseum. Dave opened his mouth and remarked that using slave soldiers to create an army was not a bad idea. Then he leaned on his hand and added that if he was sure he wanted to buy a group of unruly barbarians with his 1,000 gold pieces, he should remind him that these barbarians were known for both their bravery and their desire for freedom, so he should not expect them to obey. Our hero closed his eyes and replied that he was doing it for that very reason. The ruler held up his hand and said that 20 gold pieces per man, that was 50 men, let them send him to the Colosseum. Chuck put his hand on the chest, thought that this was the first step of the plan, success, and heard that the servant would lead him to the star-studded Colosseum. Dave frowned and noted in his mind that this was an unusual boy. The carriage was driving in the middle of the city, and Chuck was humming a song inside. People wandered in an alien world for 10 years, and sometimes missed their former happy life. The servant looked at him and asked what song he was humming. The protagonist, without taking his eyes off the window, replied that a simple song from his hometown. Then he remembered how he lay in the trash and said that after the original owner was beaten to death, he took his body and received the Lord's system. Then, day after day, he studied martial arts and honed his fighting skills. Chuck remembered how he was able to summon the system window. After which he imagined himself in a knight's outfit and added that initially he wanted to be a knight. But who would have thought that old Calvin was so crazy that he gave him the name Chuck, which evokes thoughts of success and glory. The protagonist remembered a man in chic armor. Then his face looking at him and thought that he, a degenerate who lives on the street. Our hero ran out of the city and said that fortunately, he received permission to expand the territory, so he fled here, otherwise he would have been destroyed by people from his family. A moment later, the carriage arrived right at the Colosseum. A huge arena appeared on the horizon. The priest folded his hands together, heard that Chuck was told that he recently brought a group of mountain barbarian slaves, and replied that this is true. The protagonist smiled broadly and noted that Count Augustus wants to sell them to me, and will support him while he forms an army to protect his territory. The priest waved his hand and said that he thought they wanted to watch the fight. Then he went inside where he added that only then they should not say that he did not warn them when these guys put down all the other fighters with one blow. He had already paid a lot for their treatment. The next moment, the heroes passed through the cages with monsters. Here the priest pointed his finger at the beast, and noted that they can also kill crocodiles and eat their meat. Chuck put his hand on his chin and said that they can even find food themselves, maybe they will be more obedient if he beats them. The priest put his hand out and shouted not to be stupid, they can kill wild boars with 2 or 3 blows, they are just inhuman. After which he opened his eyes wide and thought that this aristocrat has gone crazy. Chuck grinned and noted that it was his business. Then he stared straight ahead and thought that it would be better to say that the stronger the barbarians, the more chances they have to live up to his expectations. Then he headed down the corridor and added that he had a trump card in the form of this system. Chuck clenched his fist and asked why they didn't fight him. If they won, they would get freedom. Then he immediately jumped down. He calmly landed on his foot. Then he opened his mouth wide and shouted that if they lost, they would fight for him. One of the Highlanders began to walk through the crowd. Then he opened his mouth and noted that they were the best at this. The priest and the servant opened their mouths. The most powerful Highlander stepped forward and remarked that he should not cry when he lost. Then he crunched and introduced himself. His name was Russell. Chuck stood up and also introduced himself. The priest looked at them and remarked that this nobleman would actually fight a barbarian. Then he opened his mouth and shouted that the scoundrel named Russell was the best among them. He had killed many slaves. Then he turned sharply and shouted that a fight with him would be more deadly than favorable. He needed to convince him to stop. The servant closed his eyes and said that his only job was to carry out the Earl's orders and bring him here. He had no right to rule over the offspring of Sir Richard. The priest turned in surprise and thought that he had worked here for half a fucking lifetime to end up in this position. Then he looked at Chuck and added that if this nobleman died, his arena would be cursed. The Highlanders all laughed and said that this little boy really chose Russell. With a little effort Russell would kill him. It would be problematic if the noble died. Russell looked at our hero and noted that he would be merciless. Then he quickly ran forward. The Highlander put his hands in front of him. Immediately flew into the forehead of our hero. Russell began to beat our hero. Then immediately grabbed him by the collar. Then immediately raised him above his head. The Highlander opened his mouth and screamed. At the same moment, he threw our hero to the ground. The protagonist lost consciousness and opened his mouth. Russell rubbed his hands and noted that he expected at least some fun from him, but he was defeated in a second. The protagonist lay unconscious. Russell approached his comrades and heard that he even destroyed the earth. Will the noble survive? The priest looked at our hero and asked for help from someone. Then he began to cry and shouted that his arena would have to pay a huge compensation. At that moment, Chuck grabbed his opponent by the leg. Russell turned sharply and froze. Our hero smirked at him. Then he clenched his fist and said that he was afraid that he would say had been training for many years, using the Lord's system. How could he lose to someone with such shitty skills? Then he opened his mouth and said that he needed to continue. This time, he would not have a chance. Russell gritted his teeth. Then he jumped on our hero with insults. Chuck grabbed him by the arm. Then he threw him over himself. Then he leaned on him with his foot and noted that he had won. But Russell did not understand how this could have happened, what he had just done. The big guy turned his gaze and asked to repeat everything. Then he flew up and shouted that they needed to do it one more time. Chuck grinned and said that it looked like he had not given up yet, then they could do it again. The other mountaineers looked at this and did not understand what had just happened. Then they opened their mouths and asked how he could win against Russell. At the same time, Chuck grabbed his hand and then threw him to the ground again. Then he hit him again, and then again. The main character stood next to him and asked that he had not given up yet. Russell began to tremble and asked him to repeat it again. Then he barely stood up and added that he could still fight. Another mountaineer opened his mouth and shouted to just give up. He had already lost 10 times. Russell raised his head in surprise. At that moment, Chloe appeared, who ordered to stop. Then she folded her arms and said that she would fight. She slowly walked towards him. Chloe walked towards our hero. The Highlanders rejoiced and noted that the time of the chief, the aristocrat, was over. Chuck put his hand out and asked if she really had the right to make decisions. The girl stopped in front of him and asked if she just needed to defeat him. Then she stood in a stance and added that when he lost to her, they would be free, whether he would fulfill his promise. The main character smiled and replied that he was a man of his word. Chloe, without wasting time, jumped forward. Chuck looked at her in surprise and thought that she was incredibly fast. Then he turned his head to the notification that she was defined as a hero. Chloe dealt a powerful blow to our hero. Chuck moved back. Then he opened his mouth and thought that the pop-up window of the system had ruined everything. But he saw a hero for the first time. After which he looked at the girl and added that we need to see how strong she is. The girl quickly jumped off the ground. Immediately swung and shouted not to be distracted. Chuck was able to dodge at the last moment. The Highlanders happily opened their mouths. The priest leaned forward and shouted that it was a pity for his arena. The servant closed his eyes and thought that this barbarian chief was unexpectedly strong. Nothing good would come of it. Chloe began to pull the stone out of the ground. Then she raised it above her head to the shouts that she should kill our hero. No man stands in the way of the chief. She immediately swung the stone. The stone quickly flew towards our hero. Chuck stared at it in surprise. At that moment, the projectile reached its target. The priest ran into the arena and shouted that everything was bad, this was the end. After which he began to cry and added that she killed him. What would he do with his arena? The Highlanders joyfully raised their hands and began to shout that the chief gave them freedom. Russell opened his mouth and noted that his abilities were not enough, great speed and remarkable strength. Chuck at that moment began to lift the stone. Chloe jumped back in surprise. The protagonist easily lifted the stone and said that it was good material. The Highlanders stared in surprise and did not understand how he was still alive. Chloe froze at that moment. Then she smirked and shouted that now they could continue. Chuck winked at her and noted that to be the chief of the barbarians, brute force was not enough. She would not be able to defeat him like that. Chloe quickly found herself behind him. Russell opened his mouth and asked if that was even possible. Then he looked at the chain fragments and added that these iron chains were forged by the best dwarven craftsmen. They were used to shackle animals. Chloe looked at the shackles and thought that the chains had kept her in a desperate situation for so many years, and he just broke them with his bare hands. The protagonist smirked and noted that she was fast, strong and used certain tactics, perfectly suited for the role of a subordinate. Chloe clenched her teeth and thought that all this time he did not use his real strength. What kind of monster is he? Then she opened her mouth and shouted that since they were both on the same battlefield, she asked to respect her and give it her all. Then she clenched her fists and added that otherwise she does not obey him. Prepared for the blow. After the blow, the shackles on the girl's hand cracked. She looked at our hero in surprise. Chuck smiled and noted that now she had a choice. Then he raised his finger and said that they should continue to fight him until everyone lost. However, after he put out his hand and noted that they could also join him. Together they would become stronger. Chloe stared at his hand. After a moment of thought, she took it. She quickly stood in front of her subordinates and shouted for them to listen. Then she knelt down and said that from this day on, this nobleman would be their leader. Chuck opened his mouth and shouted that he would become an all-powerful lord. Let them join him. Together they would become stronger. The Highlanders looked at each other. Then they raised their hands and shouted that they would join him. They would follow his orders. The priest stared at this in surprise. The servant closed his eyes and thought that it was not surprising that old Chuck gave his name to him. Something began to appear behind the protagonist. A system window appeared in which there were permissions to join the group. Chuck confidently accepted the offer. Behind the night, two armies clashed and the plot told that this is a wild world filled with chaos and blood. Here countless ambitious people became lords and created a world of their own reality. After which people appeared in blood and the plot added that, however, most of them died and left this world in despair. Chuck put his hand on his forehead and noted that as a pioneer, he was eager to begin his journey. The main square of the city appeared and our hero thought that now that he had barbarians, he took his first step in a new life. A moment later, our hero approached the right house. After which he stared at the sign and thought that he needed to dress his army. The Highlanders who entered inside hummed with happiness. After which they began to look at the outfits, and Chloe noted that this t-shirt does not suit him at all. Negan put out his hand and asked how he could help. Chuck smiled at the owner and replied that he was here to buy equipment for his brothers. He heard that he had good weapons. Negan touched the wall and shouted that it seemed that he knew a lot about his goods. After which he pressed the block. At the same moment, the sign changed its name. A secret door also began to open. The Highlander pointed at it and asked how the walls turned. In the next frame, our hero and his fighters were in the armory, and the merchant asked what he needed. All his goods were of the highest quality. The warriors began to carefully examine the weapons. Chuck touched the spear and replied that they needed to give each of them a pike and 3 throwing spears, and Negan calculated that all this would cost 750 gold. The protagonist threw all the coins on the table. Then he smiled and noted that he only had this. The merchant looked down with displeasure. Immediately pressed the wall and noted that they do not do business with the poor and do not issue loans. However, Chuck smiled and noted that the owner should not hurry. Then he grabbed the handle and immediately pulled out a sword and asked what if he added this sword. Negan's eyes widened. After which he began to examine it and shouted that it was a snake killer. It was the first time he saw such a legendary weapon. However, the old man raised his head and thought that since he had such a high-quality sword, he must be a big shot. He should not contradict him. Then he opened his mouth and said that it would be sad to leave the sword here to gather dust. How about this? He will keep it, and he allows him to sign the contract, and he will pay off the loan. Chuck immediately picked up the sword and shouted that each of them should take a pike, 3 throwing spears and leather armor. They need to prepare for the journey. Negan bent down and asked to bring them weapons. Chloe put her hand out and asked what was next. Chuck smirked. Then he turned his head and said that he would take the land that was rightfully his. A moment later, our heroes found themselves in the middle of a field. The protagonist looked closely at the map. Someone was watching our heroes closely and said that pioneers or caravans had not passed here for a long time. The goblin chieftain looked closely through the telescope and added that this time their victim had a lot of things and materials. The jackal chieftain opened his mouth and shouted to give him at least half of the weapons, and Harson asked where even less was needed. The goblin chieftain stuck his finger in his ear, heard that the jackals had 5 times more people than them, and thought that everyone knows that jackals are stupid. After which he looked through the telescope with a smile and noted that they needed to wait until they approached the hunting grounds. They would not have the opportunity to escape or call for help. The leader of the jackals opened his mouth furiously and shouted that the main thing was that he and his brothers had a good fight. A huge crowd watched the heroes from the mountain. Chloe sharpened her gaze sharply. Then she turned to our hero and said that they were being tailed. It seemed like this gang of bandits, but Chuck already knew everything. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked if he really had a plan from the very beginning. However, our hero did not answer, turned back and shouted for everyone to stop, let them put their things inside and prepare for the attack. Then he turned to the girl and added that they should come here. He needed to tell him something. Our hero quickly took out a bag and said to distribute them to everyone and tell them to swallow them, 1 for each. Chuck, about to eat one, said that these were pills from the east. They make people stronger. Let them swallow them faster and prepare for battle. The protagonist twirled his finger, proving that this was not a deception, and thought that he had lied to them. These were just dumplings, but he would use the system. After which he called up the system window. Chuck carefully looked back. Then he stared at the image of the Highlander, and thought that this was a guide to improving the mountain barbarian soldier. He was shown a list of all the warriors, and our hero added that most barbarians are defined by the system as soldiers. He immediately decided to move to another tab. Chloe appeared in front of him, who is defined as a hero. Chuck squeezed the dumpling in his hands and thought that the barbarians will gain experience after battles and be improved by the system. After which he recalled the window and added that this happens because the system is too powerful. In a short period of time the overall strength will increase, and they will feel something is wrong. The protagonist tossed the dumpling and noted that this was why he used it as a decoy. Then he grabbed it. Then he looked at it carefully, and said that they would all feel the power of the magic pill. The goblin, looking through the telescope, noticed that they had stopped. The jackal raised his fist and shouted that now these idiots would die. The goblin leader hit him in the chest and asked what made him so happy. The jackal put his fist on his chest and asked why they were scared. The goblin smiled. Then he turned and noted that it was because their strength scared them and they decided to just surrender, but they didn't care. Then he raised his sword and shouted that they were moving forward and taking no prisoners. Chuck quickly turned and shouted that they were advancing. Let everyone prepare for battle. Our hero's squad stood on the defensive. The jackal raised his axe and shouted that those who wanted weapons should just take them away. Let them kill and destroy everyone. A huge army headed towards the heroes. Chuck swung his spear. Then he squeezed it. It flew towards the opponents with lightning speed. The spear bounced off the protagonist. Then it began to spin in the air. It ended up in front of the goblin chieftain's nose. However, he managed to reflect it. A spear fragment pierced the head of an ordinary goblin. The chieftain clenched his teeth and shouted that it was quite powerful, but not threatening enough. Then he opened his mouth and added that they were several times superior in strength to them. They had no choice but to die. A huge army approached the heroes. The goblins trampled the ground. They had good weapons. The Highlanders clenched their teeth and shouted that they were advancing. No matter how powerful they would not defeat such a huge army. The jackals jumped forward. However, they immediately got hit in the face. The barbarians began to cut up the enemies. One of the Highlanders was wounded, after which the rest fell. The other Highlanders were surrounded by opponents. The surrounded barbarian opened his mouth and called them jackals, after which he clenched his teeth tightly. The troll grabbed one of the allies. However, his hand was suddenly cut off. Chloe opened her mouth and screamed what they should do. Chuck put his hand out and asked for another spear, and the girl noted that he would not finish them off like that. There were too many of them. The main character grabbed the spear, after which he put it down and noted that there was no need to kill everyone, they just needed to find the right target. He sharpened his gaze sharply. Instantly began to turn over. Fire appeared at the end of the spear. The tip was completely covered in fire. Chloe was surprised by such a sight. Chuck swung the projectile, after which he tore the troll's head apart with one spear. Everyone around looked at this in surprise, after which they panicked. The jackals began to run away. The goblins and ogres also joined them, shouting that the troll had been killed with one spear. Impossible. Chuck grinned and suggested that they take care of the giant first. The Highlander raised his hand and shouted that the boss had killed the troll with one spear. They had nothing to fear. The jackal flew back from the kick. The Highlander opened his mouth and shouted for everyone to fight back. However, the enemy was already behind him. The jackal clenched his teeth. The Highlander turned sharply and thought that there was no time to defend himself. At the last moment, the chieftain was pierced by a spear. Chuck stood behind him on the cart. Then he grinned. The Highlander opened his mouth and thought that he had saved him. The protagonist reached for his sword. Then he put it out and shouted that the leader of these guys was dead. They had no strength left. They needed to finish them off. The Highlanders began to destroy the enemy. Chloe smiled and said that it turned out that the boss was aiming at their leader and was standing on the cart to get a better view. Chuck gritted his teeth and noted that in order to catch the bandits, they first need to catch their leader. He finished watching. There was only one guy left to finish off. The chieftain gritted his teeth tightly. Then he lit up with fire and shouted that if this was not an ordinary person, let them see what they did. Chuck looked at him and noted that he looked like the chieftain, whether he planned this attack. Then he smiled and added that he caught them in an ambush, but was not afraid of falling under the hand of more powerful races. Goblins opened his mouth and shouted that the nearest one was in a highland fortress, which was a couple of miles to the east. It was easy to defend and difficult to siege, but these kobolds did not have the courage to go out and steal his battle trophies. The protagonist opened his mouth and said that he was grateful for the information. It would help a lot. He was ashamed that he did not let him take their things, so he would use the snake killer. The goblin grabbed the sword. The protagonist put out his weapon. A moment later, the chieftain was cut in half. The other goblins opened their eyes. Then they opened their mouths and shouted that the chieftain was dead. This guy was just a monster. Chloe put out her hand and ordered to kill everyone. The Highlanders confidently went to attack. The goblin looked at them in horror. An urgent system notification about leveling up appeared. Chuck looked at it carefully. The Highlanders began to examine themselves and noticed that they seemed to be getting stronger. Did these pills really work? Our hero turned around when he heard that they had subdued 2 trolls, should they be killed, and replied that it was not necessary. 1 horse was killed, so they would carry the things. Chloe picked up the paper and noticed that she had found Harson's map. Chuck looked at it carefully. His eyes immediately perked up. Then he opened his mouth and shouted that their next stop was the Highland Fortress. The troll was pulling a cart behind him. Chuck turned his head and said that this was a pretty fast troll. At this rate they would soon reach the Highland Fortress. Then he put his hand out. He called up the status window and thought that after each upgrade he received bonus points for personal attributes in the system. He also noticed another button and thought that the store button was gray now, it was still inactive. Then he scratched and only choose hand-to-hand combat. The protagonist imagined himself in good shape and noted in his mind that right now he is 10 times stronger than an ordinary person. If he continues, he will become a muscle man. Chloe opened her mouth and said that they arrived at the foot of the Highland Fortress. Chuck smiled and asked to take a look. A moment later they were near the water. A small wave arose. The Highlander began to wash himself and shouted that he had spent his whole life in the Colosseum and therefore stank. Chloe gritted her teeth, heard the offer to bathe, and shouted for him to wash himself first. The other Highlanders brought game and noted that there were many wild animals in the area. They caught several and would soon begin a full-fledged hunt, and Chuck thought that these guys had a lot of survival skills. The protagonist turned his attention to Chloe. Then he turned to her and noted that she had been fighting a lot in the last 2 days. She needed to bathe and wash herself. There was a hidden pond here. Then he grinned and noted that he would keep an eye on the guys. Chloe blushed and thanked our hero. A drop of dew fell from a leaf. The girl stood in the middle of the pond and washed herself. She slowly washed her hands. In the next frame, it was night, which began with a shout for everyone to get ready. Chuck sat on a rock and noted that this was a Highland fortress. They would make this place their camp. Then he took a closer look. There were 2 soldiers at the gate, and our hero thought that these were kobolds who had occupied the Highland fortress. The Highlander smiled and noted that these guys were not particularly strong. They could just go and kill them all, and Chuck ordered to attack now. The kobold stuck out his lips. Then he put his hands out to the girl. Chuck kicked the door down. The kobold opened his mouth and shouted who he was. Let everyone gather, there was an invasion. At that moment, the Highlander appeared, who said that they took care of all the kobolds outside. The leader clenched his fists and shouted how dare they attack his army. He has a huge gang nearby. If something happens to him, they will not leave them alone so easily. Chuck grinned and scratched his chin. A moment later, they hung the kobold on a rope, and he was shouting that he was wrong, he was too arrogant. Chloe heard the order to untie him and asked if he wanted to let him go. Chuck looked at her and answered positively. At that moment, the rope was cut. The kobold headed for the exit to the shouts. Then he clenched his teeth and thought that he had never been so insulted. They would get theirs yet. The Highlander opened his mouth and said that he did not expect that they would take the Highland fortress so easily, and Chloe added that these kobolds are so useless. Chuck opened his mouth and said that he inspected the building from the inside. Then he looked at the 2 Highlanders and added that there was a lot of room here, more than enough to set up a lair. The Highlanders carefully looked around in the basement. They also took the towers, and Chuck noted that the fortress facilities were well equipped. There was also an excellent field of view. They could see everything for a couple of miles around. In the next frame, the camp was silent. Chuck slammed his hands on the table. Then he opened his mouth and shouted that they were about to hold their first battle meeting, and the mountaineer asked if they needed to fight again. The protagonist turned his gaze and said that the Highland fortress was high, easy to defend and difficult to attack, and there was also a plentiful source of water nearby. So it was a great place for a base. If this place was occupied by kobolds, who had no strong points, it was likely that they really did have a large army nearby. Then he introduced the kobold army. The mountaineer pointed his finger and said that they had just let their leader go. Wouldn't that come back to haunt them in the future? What if he really brought an army with him? Chuck reached into his pocket and replied that they had spent a lot of money on weapons and equipment, so it was time for their men to get together and earn some pocket money. He then pulled out a coin and added that it was better to attack them. Why had these bandits not done anything yet? And Chuck said that she was too impatient. Haste would ruin everything. A Highlander suddenly appeared and shouted that he was right. Then another barbarian pointed out the window and said that there was a fighting squad nearby. It looked like they were planning a sneak attack. Our hero stood up abruptly. Then he wiped his lip and shouted that here is the money. Let them get ready for battle. Thought that these must be the goblins that the kobold called. He will simply use this opportunity to establish his supremacy on the Highland fortress. The protagonist turned to the squad and said that he would take only Chloe's squad with him. The rest would guard the fortress together with the trolls. Then he opened his mouth and added that it was necessary to finish this quickly. The tent stood in the middle of the plain. The goblins were sleeping peacefully in them. The hand quickly pulled the fabric back. The goblins suddenly woke up. Chloe instantly struck. Blood gushed from the tent. The Highlanders entered the camp and began to attack. Chuck put his hand on his lips and thought that the Highland barbarians had great individual abilities, but their teamwork was poor. The main problem was that they lacked proper training. Strength alone would not make them skilled soldiers. Chloe raised her hand and shouted for them to stay in the hollow, let them destroy them in one move. Chuck looked at the status window and added that these barbarians had now become elite soldiers, capable of organizing their forces. The Highlander put his hand on his belt and wondered who this bunch of losers were. The ground shook beneath him. The warrior looked down and thought it was an earthquake. The next moment, the ground exploded beneath him. The goblin blew steam from his mouth. Then he glared at the Highlander. The barbarian clenched his teeth and realized that it was a dragon goblin. A crowd gathered around him. The warriors quickly looked at each other and noticed that it was a goblin with dragon blood. The goblin opened his mouth wide and screamed. A horde of goblins emerged from the ground. A moment later, the barbarians were surrounded. Chloe opened her mouth and screamed that he would not be easy to deal with. At that moment, the dragon goblin spread his arms and called his huge beast. The ground began to crack. In the next frame, a huge monster crawled out. The Highlanders opened their mouths and screamed. The dragon goblin sat on his pet. Then he put out his axe and screamed to let the dragon's blood punish them all. Chloe immediately threw a spear. However, it did not penetrate the pet's armor. She was puzzled by this moment. The dragon goblin ran at her and screamed that she wanted to pierce the armor of his huge beast with this fragile stick, let him know the power of the noble dragon blood. Chloe clenched her teeth tightly. However, at the last moment, the protagonist appeared. He grabbed the beast by the paw. Then he do with this thing. The protagonist scratched his chin and said that he wondered if the meat was tasty. However, the next moment he put his hand on the creature's head and noted that he would now be driving it. He would call it Windrunner. If he dared to disobey, he would feed everyone its meat. Chloe opened her mouth and shouted that they needed to go back and have lunch. In the next frame, morning came. Chuck was riding his pet and looking at the status window. Finally, the store tab opened. A spear immediately appeared there and Chuck thought that now his wallet is empty, so he can only choose a weapon at a discount. A bright light appeared around him. A spear began to appear above his head. Chuck stared in surprise at the new weapon. Chloe looked at the protagonist and asked if he could even use special magic. The protagonist turned sharply and shouted that there was some movement. The Highlander put his hand out and said that it looked like a group of jackals robbing. The protagonist looked through the telescope. Then he saw a caravan and said that it was a rich caravan. No wonder they attracted jackals. Chloe looked through the telescope and asked if they should intervene. Chuck smirked and said that the first trading experience was very important for the Lord Discoverer. Maybe they would help him with business in the future. The jackal put his weapon out and shouted that they had handed over all the money. It was on their territory. The merchant put his hands out and said that they were from the Voya Trading Company. If they harmed them, the Imperial Army would not spare them. The jackal put his paw out and noted that they were bandits. He thought they were scared. The bandits began to attack the guards. The jackal quickly hit the merchant on the back. The old man put his hand out and noted that he would give all the money, if only he would spare him. The jackal gritted his teeth and said that it was too late to ask for mercy. No one would save him. Something flashed in the air. Our hero's spear pierced the bandit. The jackal gritted his teeth. The merchant backed away. The other jackals looked at him in surprise. Chuck held out his hand and noted that the new spear worked quite well. Chloe's mouth dropped open. Then she held out her sword and ordered to kill everyone. The Highlanders went on the attack. The protagonist leaned on a tree and said that these jackals were just a gang of bandits. This time he would just be an observer. The barbarians cut up the enemies. Chloe confidently walked forward. Chuck grinned and noted in his mind that the barbarians were certainly strong. One of the Highlanders hit the jackal and Chuck added that as a pioneer, he preferred a disciplined army, and that was what his army needed to win. In the end, all the jackals were defeated. The rest tried to escape. One turned to the other and shouted that he had not yet figured out who they were. They had destroyed the alliance between the goblins, trolls and jackals. They had even easily reclaimed the kobolds' territory. The other wolf clenched his muzzle and noted that he was the one who had appeared unexpectedly, the legendary noble lord of the wild lands. Chuck looked straight ahead with a smirk. The jackals began to run away. However, our hero's pet did not want to let them go. The armadillo emerged from the ground. Chuck put his finger on his lip and thought that this time his army would be able to finish off the jackals without his intervention. Now they were not the confused and scattered bunch they had been before. The Highlander put his sword away and announced that he had killed the last one. Someone began to move forward. The priest smiled broadly and thanked our hero. Chuck smiled and noted that if they wanted to repay him, they should just give him money. At that moment, the blonde opened her mouth and remarked that it was as expected from a greedy aristocrat. Then she looked at the protagonist and added that he really was an interesting person. Julie got out of the cart and introduced herself. Then she turned to the warrior and asked if he was okay. Then she bowed and thanked him for his selfless rescue. Chuck smiled and replied that his soldiers were very brave. Jackals were not fit to hold a candle to them, and the Highlander thought why he never praised them under normal circumstances. Julie opened her mouth and remarked that she would like to ask him for help. Chuck stared at her and asked again. The elf turned to the wounded and said that as he saw, they suffered great losses, and many people were wounded or killed. They cannot complete the deal with the remaining caravans. Then she looked towards the carts and added that she hoped they could stay with them for a while. Chuck put his hand out and said that staying at his estate costs a lot of money. In his homeland it is called a 5-star hotel, and Julie replied that they want to use money and weapons as payment. The girl turned her gaze and asked Rito to bring the item. Then she took off the rag and showed the ball. An unknown artifact soared into the sky. Julie looked at it carefully and said that it was a communication crystal. She would use it to send a message for help to their trading house, and Chuck asked when reinforcements would arrive. The girl looked up and replied that they needed at least 3 days. This place was too far from the city of Horan. The protagonist smiled and thought that this was not an ordinary caravan. When his business started, he would be able to make a lot of money. Then he put his hand out and said that they could come with him. He was Chuck, the lord of the Highland Fortress, and he would never refuse friendly guests. Julie looked at him and asked him to take care of them. The Highland Fortress appeared. The protagonist watched the guests. Julie poured a potion and noted that it should be given to the wounded soldiers. The protagonist opened his eyes. Then he stared at the bottle of potion. Then he remembered this bottle in the store and realized that this was the legendary healing potion. Chuck grimaced and thought that this price, as expected, this is a very unusual caravan. There was a crescent moon in the sky. Julie looked at the sky and asked if all the victims were checked, and Rito replied that they had no problems with finances or things, but half of their group was either wounded or dead. Then she closed her eyes and noted that these people were very poor. The man opened his mouth and noted that fortunately, Chuck saved them, otherwise the consequences would have been colossal. The girl turned to him and asked what he thought of Chuck. Rito raised his head and replied that he was, of course, a great lord. When they were attacked by jackals, they were already in a desperate situation. After which he remembered how he stood in front of the leader of the jackals. Then he introduced our hero and added that suddenly his soldiers appeared and immediately turned the situation upside down. Our hero's army appeared. After which their triumph over the enemy, and Rito noted that his soldiers were very strong. Julie looked down and said that they survived thanks to him, and the man noted that he was afraid that their troops were not even close to them. Chuck at this time looked at the sky and thought that the caravan soldiers were well equipped. Perhaps it looked more impressive. At this time, the Highlanders argued whose weapon it was. The protagonist turned more in the distance. Hooves were pounding the ground. The half-horses were rapidly moving forward. A beautiful girl was walking at their head. After some time, a detachment of half-horses approached the walls of the fortress. Heather straightened up and looked straight ahead. At that very moment, a spear flew. The girl strained her gaze. Then she saw a hail of spears. They all landed in front of them. Heather rubbed her cheek and noticed that it was a powerful throw. However, the half-horses did not stop and went on. Chuck smiled and said that they continued to advance and ignored his warnings. After which he began to launch more spears. Heather looked at the spear flying at her. After which she immediately cut it. Then she immediately pulled her hand away, asked everyone to stop and thought that at such a distance it was too dangerous. The girl them. The protagonist opened his mouth and said that their intentions were unclear so they shouldn't remove their protection. After which he went out to the half-horses and shouted for them to explain why they came here. Heather bowed and said that she was the leader of the Storm clan. She came with good intentions. Chuck put away his weapon and also introduced himself. The girl recognized him and asked if he was the same invincible Chuck from the martial arts competition in the southern province. The protagonist smiled and asked if she knew about him. Heather looked down and replied that his reputation had spread quite far. Even the Storm clan, which lives in the wilderness, had heard of his achievements. Chuck blushed and pointed out that it was an undeserved reputation. The protagonist broke the sign and shouted that they wanted to retake the Highland Fortress. Heather opened her mouth and noted that it was true. They also enlisted the help of shamans and sorcerers. Their power should not be underestimated. Chuck opened his mouth and asked what they wanted. The girl immediately put her hand on her stomach and answered, since they face great difficulties, their clan offers him help. The protagonist looked at her and asked why they help him and not them. Heather opened her mouth and answered that the Storm clan once belonged to the Orc Kingdom. They will never join the locals and will not become bandits. She immediately remembered how they worked in the fields and said that they lived a quiet life. Then she remembered how they painted and added that their people had good manners and an amazing culture of poetry and chronicles. The girl put her hand on her chest and said that now they want to count on a powerful lord to return the glory days of their clan. Chuck stared at the system window and said that since the system was receiving their request, Chuck put his finger on his lip and thought about it. Then he smiled and answered that at least 10 days. Rito and Julie exchanged nervous glances. Chloe and the Highlander looked at each other with a smile. Heather looked straight ahead and said that although the locals already had an army, it included many different races. They had definitely divided the work and were preparing food for the army. To get here they would need at least 10 days. Chuck began to get up. Then he opened the map and noted that although the enemy was strong, they had 10 days, that was enough. Then he waved his hand and said that he had created a strategy to defeat the enemy. Chloe looked at leaves. Chuck smiled and noted that, as expected, her technique was excellent. After which he lowered his head and added that these centaurs would strengthen the ranged defense of the Highland Fortress. Heather bowed and thanked our hero. She had not used such a heavy bow for a long time. Chuck smiled broadly and said that she could practice tomorrow. At that moment, a soldier came running, who said that something was wrong. He knelt down and said that they had found reinforcements. The elf turned around and said that it looked like all the reinforcements had been destroyed. The protagonist looked at the corpse and noted that the Highland fortress was not safe now, so he suggests that she send the caravan back to the city of Solon. One of the wounded soldiers opened his mouth and said to take healthy soldiers and horses. Even if they met jackals, they would quickly lose to them. Julie opened her mouth and screamed loudly. Then she looked at our hero and said that she could not leave the wounded members of the caravan. They risked their lives to fight for her. Chuck pulled the spear out of the corpse. Then he turned his head and said that in such a dangerous situation, the rent would be more expensive. What he saw was worth 2,000 gold. The elf lowered her head and said to do as he saw fit. Head so that she could take them out with one blow. The protagonist scratched his chin and realized that Chloe was right. They would just catch them all at once. 10 days later, 2 centaurs were running towards the fortress. The soldiers were training hard on the field. The centaurs ran into the fortress and shouted that they had spotted the enemy. Chuck turned and asked where they were now. The centaurs remembered watching from the cliff and reported that they had settled at the foot of the mountain, about 50 miles away. One of the warriors put his hand on his stomach and shouted that it looked like they were going to attack tomorrow. The protagonist wiped his lip and noted that they had waited so long, and the time had finally come. The guards on the tower gave an audible signal. Chuck pulled out his sword and called out to his army to get ready. The blond man waved his sword and shouted that it was time to fight and that they would cut off their heads and then drink from them. The guys with halberds were already running. The centaurs went to attack while he called for them all to be killed. The man puts on his helmet. Chuck looks at his arm and notices that his armor is very heavy. The elf looks at him and asks what their plan is and how exactly he wants to proceed. The guy turns to her and says that first they will have to shoot them with all the arrows and then just attack, and that if they kill 100 people, the rest will fall on their own. One Eye is indignant that this is the whole plan that he came up with for them, and Julie turns to him and explains that they have at least 600 soldiers on their side and that she is afraid that this number is 6 times more than all the people in their fort. The guy turns away and continues that everything is fine and that they should not worry so much. The army is advancing. The creature asks if these are all their soldiers, because they are asking for certain death. He turns to the bulldog and addresses his dog-headed leader because this time they need to defeat them as quickly as possible. To which he receives in response that they should not rush so much, that their leader is quite strong, and that woof woof. Chuck stands in front of the beast, and someone asks if he is serious. The man-wolves ride on wolves and someone notes that this time their army is fully assembled. The orcs also attack and the voice continues that they must crush them. Bondin frowns and says that God gave them life, but to their and his great regret, they do not value it properly. The guy got into a fighting stance and calls his warriors to prepare for battle. The army of monsters goes forward under his command and someone shouts that it is time to kill and bite these people to death. The archer takes out an arrow and the order is given to shoot at the enemies. The centaurs release arrows. The Okri receive a dose of arrows. Chuck runs on his beast and gives the order to do everything quickly and kill them at last. The orcs prepare a counterattack in the form of spears and declare that they are also shooting. The monster looks at the hail with displeasure. Cold weapons are flying at the warriors. Orcs are running at people wall to wall and shouting that they need to kill. A crack in the ground is glowing. The horned one is in shock. The blonde one is riding Jack and calling on him to do something. They jump and he orders him to show them how good he is. The creature crushes the enemies. A man pierces the horned one with a spear. Another one is running with a halberd and sends someone to hell. Chloe swings and hears an order to kill everyone and that no one should leave anyone alive. Jack tramples the wolves with displeasure. The ogre jumps with a hammer and greets the blonde one. Chuck unpacks all the weapons and says that it's a turn. The ogre hits his folding trident with a hammer. The blonde one flies down. He lands on his feet and notes that his enemies are strong. The ogres are aggressively running straight at him. Chuck goes into a counterattack. The ogres receive a slashing blow. The guy prepares another blow with the trident. The ogre is also pierced. Chuck looks at him. The girl turns around and says that their lord is strong and someone agrees that he is almost like the devil. The ogres lie down and someone screams that this is terrible and wonders if this is even possible. The wolf with half a pair of binoculars calls the sorcerer to use his spell, and Mr. Bulldog nods in agreement to help him and says woof woof. The sorcerer stands in a mask and is burning. She spread her arms out to the sides. The shaman holds out his hand. A semicircle of fire is created. The wolf smiles and notes that their enemies are now dead, and the second says woof woof. Chuck turns around in horror. A fireball flies at him, and he wonders if this is their shaman's magic. The shaman shines a stick. The fireball creates the appearance of a dragon, and the warrior screams if it is flying towards them. The blonde screams for them to be careful. The dragon spits fire at his warriors. Chuck blocks the fire with his trident. He notes in horror that their shaman is strong. The people run away from the fire. Blue Eyes looks ahead and says that this shaman-haired also takes out an arrow and orders her centaurs not to stop. They prepare another volley. Arrows are flying in large numbers. The creature with half a pair of binoculars shouts that a rain of arrows is coming towards them and orders them to quickly protect their shaman. The ogres with shields stand in front of the shaman. The blonde throws his trident and shouts that they just need to take advantage of the opportunity and organize a surprise attack. The wolf smiles and urges them to protect the shaman and assures them that if they do so, everything will be fine with them. He turns around and continues that they can turn their defeat into something else. The wolf is taken aback. A spear plunges into his chest and he is perplexed. He flies back and knocks down the ogres. The shaman is also caught in the crossfire. A fireball flies above them and the green ones, horrified, declare that the fireball was shattered. The wolves are hit by their own fire rain. The ogres are burning and screaming. The green one touches his face and notices that it is hot in here. The ogres are lying on the ground. Chuck smiles and explains that it's called friendly fire. The bulldog stretches his paws towards the wolf and barks. He asks his shaman in horror what they should do. The shaman silently casts a spell over the water. Chuck looks at the orc corpses and notes that it's time to clean up after himself. He turns around. The ogres are rising from the dead. The blonde is horrified and wonders if this is blood magic. Valu is also heading to the front. They are all running at them. The blonde clenches his teeth and prepares to block the blow. He delivers multiple slashes to the wolf. Only pieces remain of him. The ogre swings at him. The blonde flies out of the smoke. The slashes kill the entire new wave of the risen. The guy runs angrily against the backdrop of flying limbs. The ogres don't even have time to react. Chloe swings and wishes the green one death. She frowns and tells him to go to hell. Chuck drags the prisoners and asks Chloe what's wrong with Ted. She frowns and holds him, saying that he has a very serious wound and that he needs a doctor. The guy throws the shaman. Blue-Eyed looks at him with displeasure and reminds him that he killed many of his people and that he ordered him to save them. Maddie looks away with displeasure and makes excuses that she was forced to ask not to call her that, because she has a name. Chuck looks at her angrily and asks her again if she is arguing with him now and insists that she may not believe him, but he will make her suffer in every possible way after this, to which she asks not to do this and that she will help his people. The shaman casts a spell over the wounded. Ted came to. He felt the ground with trembling hands. All three are in shock. They look at his wound and someone says that it is healed and that it is amazing. Maddie looks tiredly and shouts that she is tired. The warriors look at their comrade and notice that he is completely healthy, as if his wound did not exist. Chuck looks at her contentedly and understands that she is stronger not only in destruction, but can also heal people and that in this way she can be useful to them in the Highland Fort. Chloe points her finger back and asks him what they will do with the jackals and goblins that are behind, to which she receives in response that they will bring people to come and clean up the battlefield. The wolves are lying on the ground and the blonde guy orders all the survivors to be made slaves, and someone replies that they have a big catch this time. The guy looks at the system windows with satisfaction and agrees that there are a lot of them. He reads the notifications that the hero has been pumped up to a first-class warrior with an axe and that he gets 2 stat points, that Ted has been pumped up to the 3rd level of a warrior and that another one has been pumped up to the 2nd level of a warrior, and the blonde guy sums up that there are too many of them. Chloe points to the shaman and asks her lord what to do with her. Chuck holds the bulldog by the leg and asks him to take her and this comrade with him and find out where their base is. The plot shifts to night, and Chuck says that he divided the points for pumping Heather between her strength and speed. The blonde guy pokes at the screen and decides to do just that. He looks at the icons. Heather opens the door and reports that they could not find out anything from the sorcerer. The blonde stands up and asks if they have tried torturing her, to which she replies that they have tried all sorts of threats and torture, but she has not told them anything. He smirks and says that catching Phoenix is not that easy, like catching a chicken, and that he is going to show them how to do business. Medai waves her fists and insults the barbarians, because if they hit her, she will turn them all into insects. The shaman sees Chuck and notes that he has finally arrived and asks him to keep an eye on his subordinates, because they do not respect her at all. The blonde asks with a smile where her base is. The witch furiously notes that she has already told him many times that she will not say anything. Chuck smiles and hears that she has dragon blood. He punches her in the face. The guy holds her by her clothes and says that he will ask her this again. Chuck does not look at her and asks where her base is, to which he receives in response that her base is in the mountains 200 miles from this place. She looks at the lord in horror and hears a question about how many warriors are in her tribe, to which she answers that there is not a single warrior left there, and that they defeated everyone. Blue-Eyed looks at her and notes that if she lied to him, then he will gladly watch how her teeth break. Medai looks at the ceiling in horror, saying that she is telling the truth and repeats that all their soldiers went to war and that only old women and children remained there. The guy holds her and orders her to tell how many spells she knows. She makes a cute face and replies that there are many different shamans in the wild and that she has the blood of a red dragon, and therefore she has mastered fire magic to perfection. The girl imagines a minotaur and explains that just like a shaman of this kind, she can control the element of earth, create avalanches and also destroy the earth. Medai continues about the trolls, that their shamans control trees and plants that are capable of killing all living things. Chuck thinks that the wild environment is much more dangerous than he thought. He turns around and suggests that they go to Chloe and make a plan to attack the enemy base. The centaurs ask him what to do with the prisoners. Blue-Eyed sullenly replies that they are useless, and that they can bury them behind the mountain. Medai, horrified, denies this and calls him her lord, saying that she is still useful and that she can be of use to him. Chuck smirks and turns around, asking how she can be of use to him. The shaman, horrified, insists that when she came to the Highland Fortress, she saw 2 huge monsters there. She remembers them and continues that these huge monsters can also teach mages as hollows and asks him not to think that they are so stupid. Against a green background, she explains that she realized at first glance that they are special mages. Medai clenches her fist and notes that she, as a shaman, can train them for him. The ogre burns and the sorcerer says that they will become azure shamans with an infinite supply of mana. 2 days later, a large explosion occurred. The hero watched the others work, encouraging them to be faster and not be lazy. The werewolf and the orc were moving earth. Chuck looked at the destruction and asked Heather how everything was going. The girl looked ahead and reported to the Lord that everything was going according to plan. They would destroy the fort by noon and rebuild it. The monsters were busy moving earth when the young man talked about defeating the enemy. First, they needed to improve the fortress. Let them bring more granite for the foundation and strengthen the city walls. The guy, standing at the gate, grinned and thought about how he wanted to change the appearance of the mountain castle and make it the strongest castle in the wasteland. The protagonist turned to the centaur and said that he needed to discuss something with her. The shaman said that their headquarters were in the mountains 200 miles from here, and he wanted Heather to check. The girl looked at him and asked if Chuck wanted to destroy the rest of the enemies. The boy looked away and said no, she would do it because the people there were weak and old, but they had to be careful. Heather and the other centaurs listened attentively to the young man. The hero put his hand on his belt and said that the girl and the others would now be faster than ever. The centaur looked down and said that for some reason she suddenly felt the wind under her feet, as if she were flying, adding that they were moving out right now. Chuck looked at them and said that if something went wrong, they should come back right away. The boy watched them go and thought that it was time to see the results of the shaman's training. A small river flowed between the trees. One of the orcs chopped a tree with his fist. The second one broke branches, exclaiming. The girl sat on a stone and said that the trolls were so stupid. The young man came up to her from behind, told him not to call her by her name Maddie. She jumped up and, having conjured up magic circles, exclaimed that they were terrible, and the girl would show how to do it. The trolls jumped up from their seats, ready to fight. An orc was shown and Maddie said that in order to avoid the wind, this monster awakened the skill of star skin. The young man clarified what the meaning was. She threw her hands forward and exclaimed, asking again about watching. The troll disappeared from sight, slightly glowing green. After, Chuck asked a question about dodging the wind. He became invisible, and what about the other? Maddie closed her eyes, answering that the awakening of magic requires time and space, and the others have not yet developed their skills. The hero stuck his finger up his nose and noted that the invisibility technique was not very strong, but it still increased their magical power. The elf raised his hand and asked what the Lord was doing. The guy, smiling, looked away and answered Julie that they were training trolls, specifying why she had returned so early. The girl showed the filled cart and said that she was going to take these things to the dwarf tribes, and her path led her here. The hero moved the fabric and realized that it was coal again. The young man looked back and said what he had long wanted to ask, from the very moment they met, why she needed so much coal. The elf smiled and said that they exchanged coal with the dwarves for gold coins and peat. The guy specified what the dwarves would do with the coal. Julie frowned and said that they would smelt iron. Chuck looked at her and asked how much iron they needed with so much coal. The bird was flying over the trees towards the mountains when the girl told them that there were dwarves 150 miles to the west, and that last year they had found mineral veins in the holy lake of Biox. The elf laughed and said that the dwarves had contacted them and asked them to deliver coal, the more the better. The eagle landed on the hero's hand and the girl saw the letter and asked what was in it. The guy read it carefully and said that it was a warning from Lord Corona asking the nobles to return to the city and that a big wave was coming. The centaur called out to Lord Chuck. The protagonist stood by the cart and noticed that she had returned so quickly. The girl was holding her stomach and the young man saw that she was wounded and asked if they had met any enemies. Heather looked at him and said that there was no danger in the tribes of the shaman and jackals, but many creatures were shown lying on the ground, and the centaur added that on the way back they found a mountain of dwarven corpses. Heather looked around and said that the whole field was strewn with corpses, and they did not even know who they were fighting. 2 centaurs looked away questioningly. She told about what she had not seen yet. The guy touched his chin and exclaimed about the bearman. The girl opened her mouth in surprise and asked how he knew. Chuck looked at the letter and said that what she was talking about was written in the warning from Koran. A huge wave of bear tribe is moving here, and the nobles can suffer. Julie clarified what she should do if he did not want to return to the city with her. He looked away saying that it was as if he was running away from danger, adding that the centaur should rest. Heather bowed, accepting the order, when the elf opened her mouth and asked what he was going to do. The guy put his hand on the load and said that he did not think that she would make a deal, and offered to give him the coal. Julie looked at him questioningly. Chuck approached the tents and said that his armory was here. The centaur was forging iron with a hammer. The elf looked at this picture and asked if the Lord was creating his own weapons. The young man confirmed, answering that a mountain castle should have enough weapons to fight enemies. The hero looked ahead and asked Chloe if the weapon was ready. The guy assured that this weapon was only in his homeland. Birds flew everywhere and fed on the remains of warriors. When Heather was asked if she met the bear men here, the girl stood behind the hero and confirmed. Julie looked at the large footprint and said that the footprints were scary. The centaur remembered the angry creatures with cleavers and said that there were so many of them. The girl imagined that fight against them and said that some of them ran away in despair, just to survive. The young man looked away and thought that luckily he pumped up the centaurs and gave them speed. He looked at the pile of dwarf corpse, looked at his hand and said that bears really don't understand the price of soy sauce. The elf noted that gnomes pickle vegetables well and make quality soy sauce, asking why he was so happy. The guy looked at the full jug and replied that it was the first time he saw soy sauce in this area, and it would be a great addition to food. Chuck pointed at the fortress and said that he would open a restaurant in the city of Koran and feed it to the aristocrats of the city, and thus their fort would have more money. Julie raised her eyebrows and wondered if he could really handle the business. The guy stood in the center of the camp and noted that it was getting late, suggesting that they spend the night here. The warrior called out to the young man and asked if they were not simply there to scout out the situation. The hero looked at his palm and confirmed that they were scouting but could not return without seeing the enemy. The firewood was burning when the girl asked to know what was on the Lord's mind. Julie looked down and said that now the army of bearmen was heading south to the dwarves. They should stay away from them. The elf's face changed, saying that they were resting now, and what were they thinking about? The hero noted that she should know why bears start wars. The girl stood by the fire and asked the guy about it all for the sake of iron ore. Chuck's look was serious when he said that it was true, iron ore was irreplaceable. The wood turned into coals in the fire when the Lord told that in the era of war and blood, the one with more resources has the initiative. The young man put his hands in his pockets and said that in the end this ore did not belong to the dwarves or bears, and asked why he did not borrow it. Julie raised her hand and asked if he was crazy, because hundreds of people from the nearby forts were digging deep and did not see even a glimmer of iron. The hero clarified if it was dangerous and if she wanted to join. Chuck smiled and added that now the Highland fort is much stronger than it was before. Chloe put her weapon on her shoulder and said that they were ready. The monsters were dragging cannons. Ned-Eye was sitting on the shoulder of an invisible troll. The elf did not understand what was happening when the guy explained that even he had a squad of magicians, asking Julie if she thought his army was stronger than 1,000 warriors. The girl tilted her head and clarified if he was sure. The hero answered that he was absolutely. Chuck raised his hand, thinking that if he convinced them, he would be able to get closer to the dwarves, and said that when everything was over, he would split the ore with her in half. They shook hands, agreeing. A huge crowd of warriors were at the tower when the order was given for them to line up. A lord stood at the top of the tower, and exclaimed that this time they were participating in the battle for the high mountain fortress and for themselves. He took up weapons and said that in this war they must be the sword that cuts down the enemies. The warriors raised their spears up and shouted that they were ready. Chuck raised his sword up and shouted that they should be ready. The dwarf castle. Silhouettes were visible behind the green bushes. The boy and his friends looked ahead tensely and told them to stop because there was someone there. Reed pipes were visible in the water. Hares in armor crawled out of the lake. The young man saw them and shouted to be careful. The warriors hid in the bushes, taking cover, with cannons. The animals crawled up the stairs, when someone remarked that it looked like these rabbits were preparing a secret attack on the dwarf fortress. Chuck touched his chin, wondering what was strange and asking questions about how shouldn't bears fight gnomes and why rabbits too. Julie looked at him and asked what was wrong with that, since they had made an alliance with bears. The boy continued to watch them. Heather peeked out from the bushes and noted that such strong races as bears rarely use all their strength to attack. Chloe replied that this is why rabbits will help them in battle. Chuck turned into the bushes and asked a question about how everyone knew this. But no one told him anything. The girl replied that who would have thought that the Lord did not even know this. The boy hit her on the head, after which she exclaimed. The hero looked at Maddie, sitting in the bushes, and told her not to think that because of her small stature, wargs would never notice her. The rabbit with a knife in his teeth climbed up the stairs. The gnomes were sleeping at the top of the tower. One of them opened one eye. The beast with red eyes raised his weapon and shouted to the bald dwarf that this time they were attacking. The second dwarf, grabbing a spear, shouted that the enemy was attacking from Lake Biox. The warriors raised their spears up, asking again. The dwarves were loading a large crossbow, shouting to get ready for battle, because they were being attacked. The dwarf warriors went on the attack, shouting to go to hell. The man shot from the crossbow and shouted that they were finished. Huge arrows flew at the heads of the rabbits. They tried to defend themselves, calling for an attack. An army of beasts with shields crossed the moat, shouting that they were attacking. Dwarves with axes ran to the gate. The rabbit with the bandage pointed his finger and said that they were just in time and they needed to be killed. There was an explosion and the beasts scattered behind him. The rabbit turned back and did not understand what was happening. Chuck stood by the cannon and said that it was their turn now. The leader of the beasts pointed and informed the others that reinforcements had arrived. The warriors took up their weapons and were ordered to attack and destroy them. The Lord swung his sword, mercilessly cutting the beasts into pieces. Chloe attacked the rabbit, exclaiming. The warrior struck with a hammer, killing 2 at once. The protagonist looked at the field of fallen beasts and blood and said that the rabbits were strong, and there were a lot of them. He swung his sword and said that it was very risky. Suddenly, a huge bear stepped on the ground. Chuck turned around at the sound and did not understand what was happening, wondering if it was an earthquake. A huge shadow of the creature fell on the young man. The monster noticed the protagonist. The bear growled, opening its mouth wide. The boy stood at his feet and wondered what the bear man was. The bear man put his paw to the side, growling loudly. The protagonist looked ahead in surprise. He defended himself with his sword from the enemy's attack, blocking. The protagonist flew back from the shockwave. There was smoke around Chuck when he said that he had great strength. There were 3 beasts in front of him when he ordered them to attack together. The armed hares ran forward when the boy advised them to avoid them to death, ordering them to rush into battle. The archers fired arrows when they were ordered. The enemies held their shields in front of them, defending themselves. The hares with swords were in the water when the reserve team was ordered to move forward. The warriors crowded in front of the fortress, calling for killing the enemies. Medai stood with her eyes closed when she exclaimed that it seemed they needed her help. A huge ball appeared above her. Light energy enveloped the enemies. The bearmen brandished their weapons when asked if it was fire magic, then screamed that they were not fighting fair. The blade broke in front of the troll. He held his arms out to the sides and screamed loudly. Explosions erupted on the battlefield when the patriarch was asked about these people, saying that they were too strong. The beast's eyes widened. The tornado lifted the hares into the air. The blond boy raised his hand up as he ordered them to be killed. The bear stopped the blade with a chain. It stood right in front of the protagonist. A system notification appeared next to Chuck's face. The boy opened his mouth wide as he ordered the power of heaven to be activated. He held his hand out. The beast opened its mouth in shock. The protagonist cut it in half. The boy looked away with a smile as he exclaimed that it was all thanks to the system. The green monster began to breathe out flames. The bear swung his sword at the girl, telling her to taste his blade. The warrior leaned forward, standing in front of him. The beast lunged to the side. Chloe suddenly closed her eyes. She fell, doing a somersault. The man turned his head to the side, addressing her. He threw the axe at the enemy, calling him a bastard. The weapon ricocheted off the bear, who asked if that was all. Someone instantly decapitated him. The protagonist was behind the troll when he said that he did not expect invisibility to be so useful. The people present looked at Chloe, wondering if she was okay. The girl smiled, sitting on the ground, when she answered that everything was fine, and that the stone skin technique saved her. The protagonist stood next to the green creature when he said that it seemed that the stone skin and invisibility of this guy can be transferred to others. The satisfied blonde clenched her fist in front of her when she addressed the boss, exclaiming that another crushing victory was theirs. Chuck looked away worriedly. The defeated hares lay in the clearing. The bearmen began to rise from the ground. The shaman and the protagonist looked in the same direction when she asked about what happened to them. The beasts stood on their hind legs when someone exclaimed that it was a berserker spell. A creature with long horns appeared when someone told them that the Crescent tribe had come to their aid. A beast with a tail stood on its back when it was called a minotaur. Green hills in the southwest of the Pompeian Empire were shown. The beast with the ring in its nose looked away as a little of the tribe's life was told. The half-bull swung his axe as it was explained that they relied entirely on the magical power of their powerful shaman, minotaurs, to drive them mad. The minotaur stood before his brethren with a weapon. The half-bull struck with a huge hammer as it was explained that this power turned them into fierce and invincible warriors on the battlefield. The horned creature held a lion's head as it was explained that their ferocity in the heat of battle had earned them the name of the Bloodhoof tribe. The bearmen and hares with weapons advanced, their eyes glowing red as they cried out loudly. Medai to do was help the dwarves defend the fortress from the bearmen's raid, concluding that they would receive iron ore from them as a reward. The girls were behind him as he next to the protagonist as he introduced himself, saying that he was the lord of the highland fortress of the Pompeii Empire, and that he and Miss Julie from the Voya Trading Company had come to help them fight the raiders. Then the girl turned to Eric, stating her name. The bearded dwarf was shown in profile as he addressed the blonde, exclaiming that it was indeed her. The elf stopped in front of him as he apologized for being too suspicious, and then asked her to come in, adding that her followers could come in as well. The blonde girl turned to the protagonist as she replied that it was nothing, then introduced the boss, explaining that he was there to help them. Then Chuck wondered why he called him a great lord, a follower, and how it was the same as if he called the man a shabby. The patriarch looked towards Julie as he said that thanks to their great god of blacksmithing, they survived this battle, and then called her inside for a talk. The disgruntled blonde crossed his arms over his chest as he thought about how he should thank him for the victory, and not some blacksmithing deity. The boys stopped at the stairs as the dwarf said that he didn't think the miss would return at such a time, to which she replied that as soon as she and the lord found out that the bearmen were attacking them, They thought that they would not stand against them and immediately rushed to their aid. The protagonist was shown in profile as he replied that he wasn't laughing, and that he imagined it. The elf was between the men when she addressed the patriarch, asking him not to be angry and explaining that the lord was a famous warrior from the Pompey Empire, and that he came to the aid of their fortress with good intentions. The dwarf looked forward seriously, his mouth slightly open, when he answered that it meant that his spiritual power must be at a high enough level. He touched his bald head as he replied that the bearmen would most likely attack again, suggesting that they rest first. The protagonist was standing next to the two girls when he asked him to give them a place to rest in that case. The patriarch folded his hand in front of him as he replied that the city was full of empty stone houses, and that they could use them as they saw fit. The boys stopped in front of the stairs when the elf addressed him, saying that the dwarf had been a bit rude, and asking him not to take it personally. The protagonist's mouth fell open, looking away as he told her not to worry, saying that he was not as petty as this guy. Julie turned her head to the side, standing behind him, as she said that he was not usually like this, and that the battle had changed him, to which the lord replied that he did not think he was fit to be a ruler, and that whining only hurts one's fighting spirit. They exchanged glances when the blonde called Chuck's name, saying that he was too cruel, and that not everyone was as fearless as him, and that some were afraid of war, and he asked if that was true. The protagonist looked away attentively when he said that all people were afraid of war and death, and that only by making their enemy afraid even more could they win. He opened the door, closing his eyes when he advised her to get a good rest today. There was a full moon in the sky. The warriors were sitting near the fortress wall, when one asked the other if he was okay, to which the comrade replied that if he was more careful, it would be easier for him too. The bearded brunette looked away intently when he told them to be quiet, saying that it was better not to disturb the orcs and monsters once again. The protagonist was lying in his bed when he turned to Heather, asking if she was sleeping. The centaur stood leaning forward as she replied that the ceilings in this room were too low and that it would probably be better if she slept outside. She suddenly looked ahead as she wondered what it was, guessing an earthquake. Chuck sat up in his bed, serious, as he wondered why the building was shaking and if it was made of dung and sticks. He glanced at the fallen furniture as he realized it wasn't an earthquake, wondering where the vibrations were coming from. A clawed paw dug into the ground. The minotaur and the bear stood nearby. The dwarves began loading their cannons and blowing their horns. Armed dwarves came down the stairs, shouting that the bearmen and half-bullmen were already there and to hurry and not to be left behind. The crowd was in front of the gate when they noticed that Pompey's men were already there, and that they were fast. The blonde lord looked back, asking if they had come too. The patriarch held a huge hammer when he asked what it meant, exclaiming that since the minotaurs and other beasts had come in droves, they would fight to the death. The protagonist looked ahead with a smirk when he addressed the dwarf, informing him that Minotaurs was there this time, and asking how he was going to fight him. The dwarf with a long beard held an axe when he replied that the bull-headed tribe was very impulsive, and that they would lure them into a trap and then attack them in a crowd. Eric stood in front of the protagonists when he added that they were also too tall, so they would have to bend down to attack them. A crowd of warriors was shown as the dwarves addressed the Pompeians, saying that they would be their reserve force, and that they themselves would try to hold them back. Chuck grinned, looking straight ahead and thinking how magnanimous these halflings were, when Chloe told Briar that she was tall, so it would be dangerous for her to fight today, to which the centaur replied that she herself was not small. Suddenly it began to rain. The dwarves were holding crossbows, when one of them exclaimed that if the minotaurs broke down the city wall, they were dead, to which another agreed, adding that they were too fierce. The long-bearded warrior looked at them, when he told them to stop talking nonsense and get to work. The bearmen advanced, when it was reported that there were indeed many of them, and that they were very strong. The lord stood next to Chloe when he said that they would see a little later, and that they might be able to capture a few and sell them to the arena. Then the girl turned to the boss, asking if it was true that they could fetch a lot of money. The protagonist put his hand in his pocket when he added that it would not be easy to tame them, then she smirked. The frightened subordinates watched them. The sweat was running down the face of the mustachioed dwarf when he thought about how crazy these people really were. The protagonist was standing near the crossbowmen when the patriarch turned to him, reminding him that he could attack them with fire artillery, to which the guy replied that the last time the flame attack worked only because they did not expect it. Eric looked at Bill, asking how many arrows they had for the crossbows, to which he replied that they only had 6 shells. The confused dwarf raised his hand to his face when he asked him again, saying that they had to shoot all the minotaurs, there was no other way. The bearmen moved to attack the dwarves. The huge beasts trampled the halflings. The half-bull clutched one in his hand. The crossbowman took aim when he was told that he needed to get even closer. The enraged bearmen ran forward. The patriarch put his hand forward, ordering them to fire. Arrows flew out of the guns. They rushed forward. The projectiles with the tips pierced the bodies of the minotaurs. One half-bull leaned forward, his mouth open. He impaled a dwarf on his horn, mooing loudly. Behind him was a bear. Eric looked ahead worriedly when he decided that this was the end. The girl and Chuck looked in the same direction when she turned to him, saying that the dwarves were not coping and asking what they would do. Then he agreed with her, answering that the crazy minotaurs were difficult opponents. The blonde looked seriously to the side when he inquired about where their squad of magicians was, and where Maddie had gone, to which he was told that she had tried to escape, taking advantage of the situation, but they caught her. The men were holding a little girl, who was asking them to let her go. The angry protagonist grabbed her by the robe as he protested that they were facing a powerful enemy, and she was running away. The shaman's eyes filled with tears as she replied that the dwarves couldn't defeat them and that she was scared. Eric was behind the protagonist, who exclaimed that minotaurs had madness magic and she had bloodlust magic, and then asked what she was afraid of. The joyful dwarf clenched his fists as he asked him again, then said that was great and told him to quickly make her use the spell. Chuck held the girl in front of him as he said that she tried to run away before the battle started, so she owed him one. He pointed to the side as he added that he ordered her to use the bloodlust spell on the minotaurs and quickly. The shocked dwarf was shown in profile when he asked him again, thinking that he was mistaken for wanting to charm monsters. Meddy's mouth widened when she wondered if he was sick. The smirking blonde looked ahead when he told her to shut up and do as he said. The shaman held her staff in front of her. The half-bull was enveloped in bright energy when someone wondered what would happen to him if the madness spell was combined with the bloodlust spell, which increased his combat powers several times. The monster with the ring in his nose opened his mouth when someone wondered if this should lower the level of madness. The minotaur's muscles increased. The monster stood straight, raising his head up when someone exclaimed that the protagonist was really crazy. The protagonist looked at the girl when he ordered her to not stop and cast the spell faster. Medai stood with her hand raised. Streams of light energy appeared above the half-bulls. The horned monsters looked ahead with glowing eyes. One minotaur leaned forward strongly. The halflings looked up in fear, screaming about how scary it was. The half-bull's face was shown close up. The huge monster put his paws out to the sides, standing straight, then the dwarves were told to run. One man jumped into the arms of another. The shaman looked at the lord's back when she exclaimed that he was crazy, and that now they would definitely die. Serious Chuck held her by the scruff of the neck when he asked why she was making a noise, and then told her to open her puppy eyes wide and watch carefully. The bewitched minotaur looked ahead, mooing. He stood with his legs wide apart when the guy explained that the more strength, the greater the strain on the heart. Suddenly, the half-bull opened its mouth and shook when the protagonist added that the magic of madness and bloodlust strengthened their physical strength. The heart was enveloped in dark energy when he explained that it increased the load on the cardiovascular system several times. The organs suddenly turned pale when it was told that after this load exceeded the permissible limit, they would be finished. Dark energy appeared in front of the minotaur. He fell to the ground with a crash. Chloe looked ahead carefully when she began to speak. The protagonist stood surrounded by the girl and Eric, who asked how this was possible when the system notifications about the increase in experience and gold appeared. The half-bulls lay on the ground when someone cursed, wondering what was going on. The patriarch looked at the satisfied Chuck, called him Lord and asked what it was. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking forward as he replied that everything in this world was governed by certain rules, and that although they were good at fighting, they also had their limits. The boy's blue eyes were shown up close as he added that the magic had made the minotaurs so strong that their hearts couldn't take the pressure, and that it could be said that the bloodlust spell had finished off the brutes. The dwarf looked surprised as he exclaimed that this meant that the magical powers had overwhelmed the half-bulls' bodies to the point that they had simply torn their internal organs apart. The satisfied protagonist put his hands in his pockets as he said that this was correct, and that, in short, they had defeated them with the strength they were proud of. The protagonist introduced minotaurs as he explained that he had come up with this method when he saw them kneel, unable to withstand the power of madness. Medai and Eric looked at him in admiration as the dwarf addressed him, saying that he was simply incredibly smart. Chuck was shown in profile with his eyes closed when he answered that great strength often becomes the greatest weakness. The happy girl clenched her fist when he reminded her that she was the one who cast the spell. The blonde was in front of her when he said that she was working off a debt for trying to escape, and then asked if she really expected to take credit for someone else's achievements. Maddie pouted, turning away when he asked if she really didn't agree with anything, and if she imagined herself to be a super cool shaman with rich combat experience. The protagonist looked serious when he summed up that she ran away when faced with a strong opponent, and after seeing the victory, she decided to take credit for someone else's glory, and that he would tell her straight out that such experience is worse than nothing. He looked sternly at the upset girl when he said that in the future, the Highland Fortress would definitely reach a high level, but her combat experience gained in battles with primitive wild tribes was simply useless. They were standing on the fortress wall when the protagonist told them that painted canvas was less suitable for painting than white paper. The bodies of monsters lay in front of them when someone asked if all of these minotaurs were dead, to which he was told that internal bleeding should have killed them. Chuck looked at the half-bull when he said that he was very sorry, because he was hoping to sell a couple to the fighting arena. The blonde touched his chin, looking forward when he said that the bear men and minotaurs fell one after another, and that now they would surely calm down for a few days. The bodies of monsters lay on the battlefield when he added that after a calm, a storm would definitely follow, and that he thought that the dwarven castle was now in danger. The protagonist looked at Eric when he addressed him, assuming that these arrows were forged from the iron that was mined in their mine, to which he replied that everything was correct, and that the crossbows were too. The protagonist looked at the metal tip, thinking that with the system, they were not afraid if the battle continued, and that the iron ore would be there sooner or later, but they still had to help the dwarves cope with difficulties. Chuck and the patriarch looked at each other when the Lord informed him that they needed to make as many crossbows and arrows as possible, because they would need them in the upcoming battle. The dwarf touched his head when he replied that it was possible to make shells, but there would be problems with guns. Bill stood next to the blonde when he addressed him, telling him that he wanted to show him something. The blue flag fluttered in the wind when someone addressed Eric, noticing that this arrow tower was quite low. The protagonist walked next to the dwarf, who laughed, saying that they just didn't think that people would ever help them. They stopped in front of a cloth-covered object, when he explained that it was a new crossbow that they were currently building. A hand grabbed the blanket. The dwarf was standing next to the weapon when he offered the Lord to look at it. The protagonist touched the installation when he asked about whether they had made it. Eric looked at the weapon when he answered that of course, and that they had several bronze engravings that contained the secret of creating such crossbows, assuring that he simply followed them. They were both standing next to the weapon when Chuck asked about its range, to which the patriarch replied that this little one was capable of hitting an enemy at a distance of 500 to 800 paces. The blonde was holding a pipe in his hand when he exclaimed that if they used this sight, they would be able to shoot much further. The men stood opposite each other when he added that the power of the crossfire from 3 such crossbows would be simply incredible, and that he did not even know who could resist them. Eric looked frustrated as he addressed the boy, saying that the weapon's range wasn't really the issue, and that the problem was with the bowstring. The protagonist sadly looked forward as he asked him again. The weapon's thin strings and worm were shown as the dwarf explained that the strain of using a solid metal crossbow was too great, so the ram's wool bowstring they used before simply couldn't take it and snapped, and that he wanted to try making one out of a giant monarch leech, but unfortunately, he was never able to buy one. The pensive protagonist was shown in profile as he said that this meant they didn't have the right part, and that now it was clear why the dwarves didn't use it in the last battle. Eric introduced the turquoise worms as he said that monarch leeches were very rare, elastic, and incredibly durable. They were hanging from a rope and were illuminated by the sun when the patriarch explained that if they were dried and processed, they could be made into a very strong bowstring. Chuck looked ahead tensely when he asked him again, saying that it was a difficult task. The bald halfling was in front of him when the boy addressed him, asking if they had any gold, then he wondered if the Lord could sell them some of these leeches. The blonde looked ahead, his mouth slightly open, when he apologized, saying that he did not have any. The offended dwarf looked ahead when he cursed silently, wondering why he was talking so much then. A system window appeared in front of the protagonist when he said that centaurs use Komodo dragon sinew as bowstrings for their bows. His hand was touching the system window when he told that if several of them were twisted into one, he thought that such a string could replace the monarch leech. The confused patriarch was in front of the protagonist, who said that his pockets were empty, so he could not help. Then he thought about the fact that using Komodo dragon tendons instead of monarch worms was an interesting idea. Eric imagined a mountain of gold when he answered that the dwarves used to sell iron ore and furs, so money was not a problem. A surprised Chuck opened his mouth wide when he asked if this was true, saying that then they should hurry up and carry everything they had. The dwarves were dragging a chest when they asked the commander why the leader suddenly needed so much gold. Bill looked away when he answered that he said that he was going to buy a bowstring for a steel crossbow from a lord. The halflings were carrying the chest together when one of them said that this Pompeian was not as simple as he seemed, and that he was more than sure that he was helping them not out of good intentions, but solely to achieve his own goals. Then his comrade agreed with him, exclaiming that he thought so too, and that they would not be deceived. The mustachioed dwarf was shown in profile when he objected, reminding them that he was helping them after all, and that they should remember that the shadow of failure had not gone so far. The dwarves carried the treasures outside when Bill added that Chuck could be their last hope for victory in this war, to which his comrade replied that he knew. The dark-haired man touched his beard when he said that in their entire clan there was no one stronger than him. The halflings helped, standing near the gun. The blonde was watching them when someone addressed him. A worried Eric looked ahead as he realized that if too many enemies attacked them, this bowstring would not last long. The protagonist looked boredly ahead as he asked what was wrong, assuming that he was afraid of losing. The bald patriarch covered his face with his hand as he replied that it was not that he was afraid of losing, but that they had been fighting for half a month and that most of the dwarves in their fortress were injured or killed, concluding that they could not withstand another defeat. The leader looked at his people with tears in his eyes as he finished speaking. He stood next to the protagonist, who said that to be honest, he had a smarter tactic for this battle, and Eric inquired as to what it was. Chuck imagined the mountains as he asked if it was true that the iron ore they were protecting was the cause of this war. The boy opened his palm when he explained that they could retreat, leaving them Lake Bayou, and then wait for the tribes to start fighting over the territory, and then just finish off the rest. The patriarch showed the blonde his open palms when he objected, saying that they could not give up Lake Bayou, and was asked why. The worried dwarf's face was dripping with sweat when he turned to the Lord, admitting that in fact, they were not only guarding the iron ore. The protagonist looked worried when he clarified, saying that this meant that they were guarding more than just that. The halflings were swimming in the lake. The depths of the water were shown. A skull was lying at the bottom of the pool, when the protagonist suggested that the dwarves were hiding some kind of secret there. A light was burning in the tower, when someone exclaimed that this was their most important secret. The dwarves were sitting in the room when one of them added that he was categorically against revealing it to strangers. Bill was sitting next to the patriarch when he said that the secret that was important to them might not be so important to others. Then the patriarch explained that Lord Pompey was not a naive kid at all, and that he needed a good reason to help them. Another dwarf crossed his arms when he exclaimed that Renault was right, and that he did not think they should trust this Pompey guy. The squad leader slammed his hand on the table when he addressed everyone, reminding them that without this guy, the castle would have already fallen to the onslaught of minotaurs. Two halflings turned to each other when one of them said that his words made sense, then the other added that the Pompeyites did everything they could to save them. The gnome with the long mustache looked away as he explained that getting help from the Pompeians and revealing their secret were two different things, and that no matter how hard they tried to convince him, he would not agree. Eric opened his mouth, looking away in concentration as he addressed the elders, concluding that they must be clearly aware that the war was not over yet, and that they could still suffer defeat. 3 of his brethren were in front of him as he said that their people were currently in no condition to withstand the onslaught of the enemy on their own. The patriarch rose from his chair as he added that he therefore feared that Brother Chuck was their last hope, concluding that the meeting was adjourned. The trolls were in a clearing near the water. The green monster extended his limbs to the sides. Another troll touched the ground with his hand, screaming loudly. White flowers bloomed in that place. The protagonist stood behind the smiling monster as he asked if he was serious, and if she had trained so long to show him this useless move. Maddie looked ahead in displeasure as Julie asked him not to worry, because even if it seemed useless now, it might be useful in the future, and the girl agreed with her, exclaiming that it was, and that he had called the stone skin that before. The protagonist touched the shaman's head as he explained that the soldiers of the Highland Fortress should be able to cast powerful spells, and then turned to her, telling her that she should train even harder. The warrior in the helmet pointed to a dark passage. Several people were floating in the cave. Chuck looked ahead in surprise. He passed a huge hand as he wondered if this thing bound with chains was the legendary Titan. A body wrapped in shackles was shown. The huge creature was floating vertically in the water. The boys in the diving suits were swimming next to each other when the Lord thought that these gnomes were not simple, and that they were using the iron ore as a cover to keep him a secret. They approached the giant's face. His eyes suddenly started to work. The protagonist in the helmet looked ahead when he realized that this was simply unbelievable, and then wondered if the Titan had sensed their presence. The boys began to climb out onto the shore. The protagonist took off his diving suit when he said that at first he thought they were hiding a gold vein there, but he never expected it to be a giant. Eric held a diving helmet in his hands when he answered that giants could have such short descendants like them. The dwarves were standing in the water next to the Lord when Eric addressed him, asking if he saw how his eyes glowed, to which he answered in the affirmative, adding that they stopped glowing when they left. The dwarf jumped into the water in front of those present when he told him to look again. The Titan's glowing eyes were shown up close when it was told that his soul sensed the blood of the dwarves, which is why it began to glow. The patriarch was waist deep in water when he exclaimed that they shared the same blood, and that he was their god. The giant took a step forward when it was told that they were ancient magical creatures, and that in legends they were taller than even dragons. The 4-armed giant bent his leg when it was explained that in the times when chaos reigned on earth, they personified power itself. Monsters chased a fairy when it was explained that the Titans, who possessed the magic of creation, were the only rulers of the world. A huge giant fell to the ground with a crash when it was explained that all creatures obey the law of life and death. The giant carried away a child when it was explained that over time, it became more and more difficult for them to survive, and that, in the end, they disappeared from this world. The protagonist stood in front of Eric when he asked why they did not simply run away with this giant, since it was no problem for them to get through the mountains, to which he replied that it was not that simple. He introduced workers with pickaxes as he explained that the iron ore there created a special magical field that held the ancestors' spiritual power, and that if he left the place, his spiritual power would dissipate. The protagonist stared straight ahead tensely as he asked why they thought that, since there was no evidence that iron ore could actually trap a Titan's soul. The saddened dwarf touched his bald head as he countered, saying that they did exist, and that the light that emanated from the giant's eyes had been much stronger before, but when they began mining the ore, it had weakened considerably. The water surface of the lake was shown. Chuck was surrounded by dwarves as their leader explained that this was why they had recently banned their tribesmen from mining iron ore, and the boy exclaimed that he understood, assuming that they were going to protect this giant to the death. Eric looked ahead with concentration as he replied that it was not to that extent, and that they had noticed that during the full moon the giant's soul power would activate on its own and that he did not need anyone to be around during that time. The full moon was illuminating the lake as he added that at that time his power was much stronger than usual. Between the patriarch and the Lord was another dwarf who said that they believed that it was during this phase that the moon could stimulate the Titan's power. The patriarch stood in front of the protagonist with his eyes closed as he informed them that they also had ancient books that said that this power could be inherited and that if it was adopted there would be no enemy to fear, Then he assumed that they wanted to inherit his spirit power. The dwarf looked away with a tense gaze as he replied that it was correct and that they had tried many times, but to no avail. A companion stood at his side, adding that he and Elder Reno had calculated that tomorrow night would be the fullest moon in a century, and that the giant's power could be taken over by casting a spell at that time. The satisfied protagonist looked ahead with a smirk as he thought about how he now understood why these shorties were so zealous in protecting Lake Bayou. He and the halfling leader were standing in the water when the boy asked why they were telling him all this, assuming that they were afraid that he was doing all this to steal the soul power. A serious Eric stood before the fair-haired lord as he replied that it would not be so bad if the giant's spirit power fell into his hands, and that it would be much more dangerous if no one inherited it, and it simply disappeared into oblivion. Chuck looked at the scowling dwarf, who said that they had discussed this at the Council of Elders, and that if none of them succeeded in inheriting the power of the Titan, they would let him try too. Sweat was pouring down the protagonist's face when he asked if he was kidding, reminding him that they had tried so many times to do this, but they had failed, and now they wanted them, humans, to find problems for themselves. The bearded dwarf folded his arms in front of himself when he explained that it was not necessary, and that the young man could succeed if he had enough physical strength. The protagonist looked at Eric with a smile when he said that the soul and body complemented each other, and that he thought that they, as blood relatives, had a better chance of success, and he laughed, answering that it was true. The blond man had his back to the patriarch when he said that it was time for them to go back and that if they were gone too long, the others would get suspicious. The shore of the lake was shown when the Lord was approached and asked to help them keep this secret. Chuck glared at the dwarf, who added that it was especially true for Miss Julie. Eric turned his head to the Lord, who replied that it was nothing to worry about and that he would definitely not tell her. The tower with the red flag was shown when he added that they should go back as soon as possible, or she might get suspicious. Chloe and the centaur were in front of the boss when the girl asked about where he went and why he was wet. The protagonist stood with his arm bent in front of him when he replied that he accidentally fell into the lake and then asked her to bring him his towel, to which she responded yes. The protagonist turned to the smiling subordinate when he inquired why they were there and where the rest of the humans were, to which he was told that Miss Julie had gone to watch Maddie train the trolls and Heather, and the others had gone with them. The soaking blonde was wiping his face when he thought that he hoped the dwarves would be safe until they inherited the Titan's power. A centaur spoke up, informing the Lord that things were bad. Chuck and Chloe looked in the same direction when he asked what had happened. Heather's face was dripping with sweat when she spoke of an enemy army, telling him that they were moving in that direction and that there were about 70 miles left. The blonde lord's serious face was shown up close when he said that it was very bad timing, asking how many there were. A crowd of monsters was shown when he was told that there were about 4,000 to 5,000. The protagonist's mouth fell open and he smirked as he said that they would not stop until they had achieved their goal, and that he feared that there would be another battle tomorrow on the night of the full moon. Lightning flashed in the sky. On the tower, the dwarves blew their horns. Their brethren loaded the crossbow when they were ordered to do so faster. The shields were placed on the ground. The dwarves stood one behind the other when Bill thought about Hephaestus' blessing. The humans stood behind the halflings when someone reported that they were trying to resist, like wild animals cornered. The monster with the trumpet opened his mouth as he exclaimed that they must destroy the dwarven fortress before sunset. He sat on the throne when the subjects answered that they obeyed, calling him king. The army moved towards the fortress when they were ordered to attack and spare no one. A tired Eric clutched his head as he cursed, saying that if the battle could be delayed for just one day, and that if someone from their tribe could inherit the power of a Titan, they wouldn't have to fight. The protagonist placed a hand on his shoulder as he called out to him, reminding him that now was not the time for regrets, and that the defense of the fortress was entirely under his command, and he called the boy by name. The leader of the beasts pointed his paw forward as he ordered that the shorties be finished off. The armed beasts rushed forward with loud cries. Bill opened his mouth, looking ahead, when he announced that the enemy was attacking and that they should prepare. Bears with axes ran, raising dust. Chuck and the patriarch were on the roof of the fortress when they decided it was time. The Lord put his hand out to the side, ordering them to open fire. Arrows flew out of the dwarven guns. Centaur archers fired again and again. Hares tried to defend themselves with shields. There was a huge army in front of the fortress, when someone wished death on the enemies, ordering them to be killed. Behind Medi stood a troll. Fireballs attacked the beasts. The battlefield was shown, where an explosion thundered. Bears walked forward, throwing dwarfs. Minotaurs stomped on people with a grin. There were armed animals behind the protagonist, when he ordered the giants to be left to him. The protagonist swung his blade, jumping. He chopped off the arm of a huge bear. The scarred beast turned around as he addressed his big brother. He attacked Chuck with a morning star as he called him a scumbag. The Lord was thrown back by the force of the blow. Chloe looked away with her mouth wide open as she called out for the boss. The enraged bear was in front of the blonde. The protagonist took a fighting stance, looking forward as he said that he was the king of the bear man for a reason, and that he couldn't remember the last time he was wounded. The beast was surrounded by his subjects, as he shouted that he would take his life. The protagonist gritted his teeth, looking forward as he assumed that he wanted to die. He swung his blade, killing enemies. Rain fell from the sky. The bodies of half-bulls lay on the battlefield. A pool of blood was shown. Chloe looked towards the boss fight as she reported that they seemed to have gone mad and that they could not defeat them. A system window appeared in front of the blonde boy as he cursed. The blue system window was shown close up as it was told that the first-class barbarian warrior Romeo and the centaur Harry had died in battle, and that 9 soldiers, including the first-class barbarian Jarvin, were seriously injured, and that the third-level berserker and 2 others were slightly injured. Chuck looked closely at the notification in front of him as he cursed emotionally, exclaiming that the Highland Fortress was losing people for the first time. A huge army of enemies was shown as he added that this man, not sparing his own lives, was pushing forward. The blonde's mouth was slightly open, staring ahead tensely as he addressed his subordinate, telling her to tell Heather to cover them with a volley of arrows, and that they were retreating back to the dwarven castle. Green leaves were falling from the trees. The entrance to a room was shown, as someone screamed that it hurt and asked to be gentle. Warriors were helping the wounded, who were asking to be saved and talking about how much pain they were in. The dwarf was sitting in front of the wounded Bill, calling his name. The protagonist looked at the crying Eric, when he asked if he still had time to cry, despite the fact that they were in this situation. The protagonist grabbed the patriarch by the beard, when he reminded him of who he was, and that he should pull himself together and call on his brothers to defend this place. Summing up that they cannot give up, then he asked him again. The leader of the gnomes headed for the exit when he agreed with the boy, saying that he should do it. In front of Chuck was Bill's body when he asked him to rest in peace. Julie looked at her companion with concern when she asked about the situation. The blonde was shown from behind when he announced that the assault on the city had begun, saying that the elves made a beautiful noise, so she should hear the sounds of battle coming from outside. The enraged bearmen opened their mouths. They tried to knock down the gates with a battering ram. The green troll bared his sharp teeth when he used the petrification skill. The people tried to hold the stone slab at the gate when they decided that they should all attack together. The enemies climbed the walls using ladders. The monsters were met by a dwarf spearman. The goblin swung his blade at him twice when he announced that the enemies had gotten inside and that they should run. The red-eyed hooded monster smirked. Ned-Eye was sitting on the troll's shoulder when she turned to the Lord, saying that things were bad and that enemy soldiers had gotten into the fortress. The elf stood next to the protagonist, who asked about it being so fast. The protagonist stood in front of the shaman when he asked why the 2 had returned and why she hadn't shot them down with a fireball. It was raining over the fortress. When the girl replied that the rain was too heavy for the spell to do any good, then he called her useless, asking where Chloe and Heather were. The stone slab was broken, then a scream was heard. The leader of the barbarians looked ahead tensely when she realized that this was the end. The Minotaur raised his axe. Chuck turned to his subordinate as he addressed her, asking if she was okay, to which she replied in the affirmative, saying that she was, but even the petrification technique could not stop them from breaking into the city. Sweat appeared on Eric and the Lord's faces when the blonde asked how many men he had left, to which the dwarf replied that it was less than 100. The blonde looked ahead, smirking, when he realized that this meant that each of them had to defeat at least 100 opponents. Armed horn monsters appeared in front of him. The protagonist looked ahead with clenched teeth, when he decided that they would first separate them. The protagonist and his warriors rushed into battle, calling for everyone to do so together. Chloe held the blade with both hands when she screamed. The warlike Chuck cut his opponents with his sword. He cut the goblins in 2. The Bear King pointed forward with his mouth open as he ordered to deal with the Pompeians first, finishing him off. The beasts ran with weapons in their hands, raising dust. The Lord looked ahead menacingly, gritting his teeth. He suddenly raised his hands up and spun his blade. The protagonist slammed the weapon on the ground, causing the enemies to scream loudly. The barbarian leader had a smile on his face as he exclaimed that they were fried badly. The protagonist leaned forward as he said that today he would let them see the power of their lord. The beast threw the dwarves around, swinging his sword. The dwarf approached his open mouth. Chloe held her hand out in front of her as she addressed the boss, telling her that the halflings seemed to be failing. Chuck looked worried as he looked at the dark figure and asked her again. The blonde man opened his mouth wide as he addressed the shaman, telling her to use the bloodlust technique. The girl with the staff stood before him as he commanded her to cast faster. Ned-Eye reached her hand up, her eyes wide. Streams of light energy rushed towards the dwarves. The blonde lord's mouth was wide open as he addressed the enchanted group, asking them to use all their powers without reserve. Behind the halflings was a huge troll. The hare with an eye patch grinned as he ordered them to be killed. The bearded dwarf broke his blade. Sweat appeared on the muzzle of the long-eared beast. The dwarves swung their hammers at him. The halfling with red eyes opened his mouth as he wished death to his enemy. He struck the hare with his weapon. Someone was watching the battlefield through a round pipe. The king of the bearmen looked at the ram as he shouted that they should also join the battle, to which he agreed. The armed rams rushed into battle. The protagonist looked at his troll as he ordered him to cut off their path. The green monster crouched, touching the ground with his hand as he screamed loudly. Tree roots were shown. They blocked the path of the rams, who wondered what it was. tree trunks were placed in front of the crowd of opponents as they realized that the road was blocked. The Beast King's mouth was wide open as he called the guy a cunning bastard. The protagonist smiled widely, looking forward as he exclaimed that everything was fine, and that now the ruler of the Bearman was alone. He jumped, touching the troll's shoulder as he ordered him to use the invisibility technique. The guys were shown from behind. They squeezed between the tree trunks. The enemy king stood with his head turned to the side. Chuck grabbed the hilt of the blade as he said that his life was at an end. The monster's body was impaled. His face was shown close up as he asked him again. The lord stood behind his troll as he bid farewell to his opponent. The body of the bear king fell to the ground. The beasts looked scared as they realized that their leader was dead. The army began to move away from the fortress as everyone began to shout that the king was dead, calling for everyone to run. The armed men ran after them, wishing them death. The hares turned around and fell dead. The main character looked very serious, looking forward as he said that as soon as the leader fell, they began to run like rats. The fortress was illuminated by the sun's rays, while the enemies were running away. The full moon rose in the sky. The wounded dwarves were shown. The halflings raised their weapons joyfully when it was told that in this brutal battle, the dwarven clan and Chuck paid with the blood of their people to protect the allied fortress. The protagonist sat in front of the fire when it was told that for him this battle was very fruitful. His hand reached for the system window, which showed who and to what level had risen. Then the guy said that the Highland fortress had risen to a new level. The blonde looked at Eric standing next to him, who wished him good night. There was a wide smile on the lord's face when he turned to the patriarch, noticing that he was very idly dressed, and asked where he was going. The bearded dwarf was illuminated by the moon when he asked him if he had forgotten that it was a full moon today, explaining that they were going to hold another ceremony to inherit the Titan's power. The protagonist stood on the green grass, looking up, when he replied that he had completely forgotten about it. The leader of the dwarves stood straight, looking ahead, when he said that although they had just survived such a terrible battle, a chance like this night was extremely rare, and that they had selected the strongest fighters and were ready to try again. The protagonist and Eric watched the sky when the dwarf added that today was the fullest moon in this century, and that he hoped that luck would favor them. The halflings walked into the water of the lake when he summed up that they would finally be able to inherit the power of the giant. A view of the moon opened up. People were swimming underwater. It was heard that the ritual of transferring the Titan's powers would take a long time, so first the spellcasters had to drain the lake. Looking at the statue, the man said let them cast the spell. People stretched their hands forward. The water in the lake began to move. The statue began to appear from under the water. The hero sighed, grinning. The face of the statue appeared. It was heard that they could begin the inheritance ceremony. The men, standing still, heard let them begin. People were standing on the shore. Frowning, the protagonist asked what they were doing. It looked like they were swatting away flies. Looking at him, Maddie replied that it was nothing special, just a ritual for luck, a useless thing, to which Chuck asked what and how much this method of inheriting power was trustworthy. Looking at the people, she said that personally she had not seen it, but among the shamans they say that the experience of the older generation can be passed on through dance. Frowning, the hero said what nonsense, if shamans had such an overpowered technique, would they have to work hard all day to raise their skills? The girl looked angrily and replied that of course, it was impossible to inherit everything, half at most, to which the protagonist said that it made sense. Looking straight at her, he added that if they managed to get only 10% of their ancestors' power, they would not be able to get even these 10% in their entire lives. The man began to blow into the pipe. Fire appeared in front of them. People walked into the fiery circle. Closing his eyes, the man said that he should use the blood connection to call upon the great Titan. Looking away, Chuck asked that it wasn't dangerous, to which Maddie replied that it was. After all, it was not easy to squeeze the soul of a Titan into the body of a dwarf. Grinning, she added that if the body was weak, it could simply explode. Looking up, he was next. He knelt down on one knee. The man bowed. The man stretched his arms forward. Closing his eyes, the man said that they had all failed. Raising his hands, he shouted that he asked for mercy on his descendants. The Titan silently looked at them. The man was kneeling. It was heard that this was the end. The protagonist looked away, hearing that he could also try. Taking a step forward, Chuck said that well, he was not a dwarf. He did not think that it would work. Closing his eyes, he added that okay, since he asked so much, he would try. Turning his head, the hero asked what they did there. I think so. Suddenly, a glow appeared around him. The Titan's eyes lit up. It was heard that he moved. What was this? He turns out to be a dwarf too. He looked at him angrily. Suddenly the Titan opened his eyes wide. Frowning, the protagonist shouted that they should run. It seemed like it was about to explode. The gnomes looked at him in amazement. The animal's eyes lit up. The Titan stood still. An animal appeared in his eyes. Looking straight ahead, it made a sound. Chuck looked at him in bewilderment, and wondered what this thing had to do with the Titan. Had he really been reborn into this? The man looked at him in amazement, and shouted that he should take his time and not fall, and the gnome added that he couldn't get hurt, he was the descendant of the great Titan. Wiping away his tears, the hero said that it was so touching, and the girl said that maybe they should cook him and eat him so that his powers would pass on to them. The beast began to jump down. The gnomes looked at him in amazement and shouted. Grinning, the protagonist said that it was no wonder that he was the son of the great titan. He liked to tower over everyone. The beast looked at him in bewilderment. Suddenly, he rushed forward. The orcs looked at him in bewilderment. Looking straight ahead, the creature exclaimed. Suddenly, the hero grabbed him. Looking at his paws, the protagonist asked what membranes between his forearm and ribs were. Perhaps with their help he could hover. Smiling, the dwarf said that he should quickly hand him over to them. The beast closed his eyes and screamed. Opening his eyes wide, Chuck said that it was the same. Throwing the creature to the side, he shouted for them to catch it. A small explosion flared up. The dwarves froze from the impact. Smiling, the hero said that it was not bad. Who would have thought? He inherited the technique of titanic thunder. Raising his hand up, the dwarf shouted for him to look at the titan. Suddenly, his body began to collapse. Looking at him, the man said that apparently he had completed his last mission. The head of the statue fell off. It was heard that it was time for him to return to the earth. The pet exclaimed in bewilderment. Looking at him, the hero said that they would name him Charlie. A view of the hills opened up. The carts were moving forward. Frowning, the girl asked why he was in such a hurry to return to the Highland Fortress. They had not even had time to discuss the terms of cooperation, to which the protagonist replied that he should not worry, she would get her share, as they had agreed. Julie looked at him angrily. Sitting in front of the hero, she asked what he and these gnomes were hiding from her. Looking away, Chuck answered that no, that she, and the pet exclaimed. Julie looked in amazement. Smiling, she said that he was so cute. Taking the pet by the face, the hero said that at first the gnomes wanted to raise it themselves. Opening the bottle, he added that but as soon as he left. Charlie drank from the bottle. It was heard that he began to refuse food, so the gnomes had to give it to him. People were riding horses. It was said that a few days later Chuck and Julie safely reached the Highland Fortress. The hero looked ahead. The thought arose that then Julie, together with the merchants, went back to the trading guild, promising to send people as soon as possible to establish trade relations. People were sitting on horses. The thought arose that but a few days later, still not waiting for Julie, Chuck met with the head of the reserve. Grinning, the hero said that they had not seen each other for a long time, to which he replied that he was popular lately. Dave looked at him and said that all the bards sang his story. Bowing, the protagonist asked if he was just passing through or if he came here on purpose, to which the Lord replied that he came here on purpose, to be more precise for him. Chuck looked at him in surprise and asked what for him, and then said that he was not interested in men. Looking down, the man said that he did not mean it that way. Turning his head, he added that he had brought a rare delicacy. How about a little chat over food? The hero grinned and answered approvingly. A huge squid appeared. Sitting on the floor, the protagonist said that is, in Dave's opinion, a rare delicacy. It is teppanyaki squid. Suddenly, the pet jumped up. Chuck caught it. Closing his eyes, he asked why it had come to bother him again. Chuck looked at the nut in amazement. Suddenly, it cracked it. The hero closed his eyes. The pet lowered its head. Looking away, the man asked, "What a cutie." He was emitting vibrations of elemental energy. It was a demonic beast. Turning his head, the protagonist answered that he was not a demonic beast, he was a descendant of the Titans. Raising his hand, he added that he should call the dwarf cook. Here is his reward. Charlie began to eat. Looking at him, Chuck said that despite the fact that he was such a tiny thing, this baby inherited the purest essence of a Titan, to which Dave laughed. It was heard that he wanted to believe it, he wanted to not believe it, but it is so. The squid's tentacles appeared, and he could hear it thanking him. Sitting at the table, the hero said that if it weren't for his permission, his expedition would hardly have gone so smoothly. Closing his eyes, the Lord asked what he knew, why he did it. He poured the solution into the bottle. Looking straight ahead, the protagonist thought how he had simply tried to intrigue him. Raising his head up, Dave asked that he knew that there had been two factions in Pompeii for many years. Looking at him, Chuck asked what those two factions were. A temple appeared, and the thought appeared that the first faction was the minions of the Holy Church of Light, who dreamed that all power over Pompeii would pass into their hands. The girl raised her hand up, and it was said that the other faction was the followers of the goddess of ice, who were at odds with the Holy Church. The map appeared. The thought arose that at the moment the Holy Church of Light is the main religion in the human world. Almost 1/3 of the countries on the continent have the prefix holy before their name. The girl stood still. It was heard that, however, Pompeii is the northernmost country of people on the continent, so many people believe in the goddess of ice. Closing his eyes, Dave said that in winter, various natural disasters often occur in Pompeii, which contributes to the spread of faith in the goddess of ice. The hero grinned and asked that he and his half-brother belonged to the same faction. Sitting in front of him, the man replied that they are magicians, do not believe in gods, so they consider themselves secular people, thereby maintaining neutrality. Looking at him, the protagonist replied that but magicians usually do not smoke, to which the man said that it is not tobacco, it is powder from the brain of a giant beaver. Putting his finger to his forehead, he added that magicians are weak physically and often have to strain their brains. This thing just helps him ease his migraine. Chuck looked at him silently. Closing his eyes, he said that in fact, he also does not believe in gods. Because there is no evidence that gods came to this world, no one can make him believe in something he has never seen. Holding a squid on a fork, the man replied that he has been looking after it for a long time. It is not often that he meets such unbelievers as they. He decided to help him, because rare species of people need protection. The hero looked at him in amazement and asked if he was joking or yes, and that's all. The protagonist leaned on the table and asked that he was not trying to drag him into a faction that adheres to neutrality. Looking at him, the man said that there is such a thing. Chuck shuddered and shouted that he should not even think about it. He crossed his arms and added that when the argument started, the neutral side would have to fight both factions at once. To which Dave replied that although it didn't sound very good, it was a good idea. Frowning, the man said that that's why if they ever really found themselves on the brink of war, he suggested that he choose the Church of the Holy Light. The hero looked at him in confusion and asked why. Dave put his hand on the table and said that he should take a look. These were 3 types of Pompeii coins. The coins were lying on the table, and it was heard that 1 gold coin could be exchanged for 12 silver coins, and 1 silver coin for 24 copper coins. Raising his hands, the man said that they only had 10 fingers. In fact, Pompeii could have changed this ratio to a number that was easier to count, but they didn't, he thought. Why? Putting his hand to his face, the protagonist replied that it was because the goddess of ice had 12 wings. The people looked at the goddess. The coins appeared. It was heard that in the end, the Church of the Goddess of Ice has too much influence. Chuck abruptly took the coin. Dave closed his eyes and said that he had a good reputation, so why not take advantage of this small advantage? To which Chuck replied that it was better than nothing, and besides, he owed him 1,000 gold. 2 coins were lying on the table. It was heard that now 1,001 gold. The hero threw the coin on the table. They were leaving the settlement. Looking straight ahead, the protagonist asked that he really would leave like this, to which Dave asked what was wrong. Could he really not digest everything he told him? Chuck closed his eyes and said that not really, in any case, he would act at his own discretion. The thought appeared that he really thought that he could just come to the Highland Fortress, wander around here and get out. Pointing at the horse, the man said that he had heard that it was developing very quickly, so he put aside all his important business and came to see it in person, to which the hero replied that it was not a bad privilege to ride wherever he wanted. Looking straight at him, Dave said that yes, it was a privilege, but he saw no reason to envy the privileges of an old sneak like him, because he, the Lord of Discovery, still had a vast and beautiful world waiting for him. Smiling, the protagonist asked if he really regretted not doing it alone, because now he couldn't get higher, and he didn't want to be lower, to which he replied that of course not. Mounting the horse, the man said that he would give him a small example. In fact, he was allergic to the powder from the brain of a giant beaver. As soon as he inhaled it, his throat immediately began to itch, but a migraine was much stronger. He lowered his gaze and added that even when he complained about his itchy throat, he still realized that this powder had relieved him of an unbearable headache. People were riding horses, and it was heard that this was what was called making a choice. A view of the river opened up. The hero was lying on a deck chair. The girl grinned and said that Julie's sister had returned. The elf looked at him in amazement and said, "Oh my god, this!" A view of the fortress opened up. Taking off his glasses, the protagonist asked what was going on. Didn't he recognize these places? To which the girl replied that this place had changed beyond recognition. Frowning, Chuck replied that it was all thanks to the orcs. They had been regularly using the fertility technique lately, so the whole area was covered in flowers and herbs. Looking at the fortress, he asked, probably, he wanted to ask, what are these gnomes doing here? Almost all the gnome warriors died, so gathering and living together is not something self-evident. The elf looked at him in amazement, and asked that he really made a secret deal with the gnomes. Turning his head, the hero said that they decided everything after her departure, and not at some secret meeting. Frowning, the girl asked what he was doing here now. The girls were fanning him with leaves. Lowering his head, the protagonist said what it was. Stretching his hand forward, he added that she knew that he was quite a philanthropist. After the war, some races were on the brink of destruction. Wiping away tears, Chuck said that when they came to the threshold of the Highland Fortress, he simply could not refuse them. Stretching his hand out to the side, he shouted that it was Maddie's idea anyway. She said that these little girls had no one to rely on, so he let them become his maids out of good intentions. The girl looked at him in amazement. Julie closed her eyes and said okay. She had one more thing to do with him. Stretching her hand forward, she added that she wanted to introduce him to a famous naturalist. Bella took off her hood and said hello. Taking off his glasses, the hero asked again. Grinning, the elf said that Miss Bella came from a very famous clan of white tigers, but she was much more knowledgeable about art than about battles. Bowing, Bella said that her nickname was Tan, so she could call her that. Looking at her, the protagonist said that he was glad to meet her, and then thought that what an interesting coincidence. Lowering his head, he said that he hoped she would be able to fully carry out her naturalistic research. Chuck grinned and said that it was okay that we didn't have anyone to go to. Bella looked at him in confusion. The insect was sitting on the leaves. Standing at the fortress, the man said that they were leaving, to which the hero replied that the sooner they left, the sooner they would return. Smiling, the protagonist said that he hoped everything would go smoothly and that they would see off a few barbarians, but not overdo it, to which Chloe replied that he shouldn't worry, in any case, they would bring all their tribesmen here someday. She waved her hand at him. Looking away, the protagonist asked what could help him see if there were any high-quality books on the market on improving the spiritual power of warriors. Smiling, Julie replied that it was good, but he shouldn't expect much, usually good books cannot be bought for money. Looking at him, the dwarf turned. Chuck looked at him in amazement, and told him to remember to take good care of his condition and not to overwork himself. Nate extended his hand to the side and said that they had finally finished building the new blast furnace. The blacksmiths were preparing to open it. The hero grinned when he heard this. Putting his hand on his side, he thought that the addition of the gnome chieftains had brought many blacksmiths and ore. The military industry of the Highland Fortress had reached a new level. The equipment appeared. It was heard that it was so cool. Looking at the armor, the girl said that after so many days, they finally have so much good weapons. Raising his hand, the protagonist asked, well, how does she like all this equipment? To which she replied that it is simply gorgeous. Looking up, Chloe asked but still, what is this for? Grinning, Chuck replied that this is a special invention, you just need to press this button. Suddenly, the armor began to unfasten. The equipment appeared. It was heard that this is fast armor technology, let him say, very modern. Turning her head, the barbarian said that but the blacksmith calls it a little differently, and of course. Frowning, the man said titanium armor, to which Chloe replied that she liked the second one better. They looked at the blacksmith. The hero looked angrily to the side and asked what they were doing there. Let them help him take it off. The girl closed her eyes and asked what the fast armor was, he said. Looking at her, the blacksmith replied that there were still problems with removing it. Closing his eyes, the guy said that the lizard men had come here and said that they wanted to see them. Looking to the side, the protagonist asked again and said that he should give her a telescope. The people were standing on the tower, and it was heard that those dwarves were coming again. It looked like they had weapons, they could detain them. The lizards were moving forward. Chuck frowned when he heard them say that they were passing through, to which he asked, so what? Smiling, the barbarian said that it was unknown why they were here, they would have to arrest them, to which the girl replied that it was okay, only fools would worry so much about it. Putting her hand to her face, Bella said that they must be going to Pompeii. Turning his head, the hero asked what Pompeii was, why they were going there. Smiling, the girl replied that His Majesty had begun to gather a powerful army of beast races many years ago, to which Chuck asked what and how this related to these tailed tourists. Julie, looking straight ahead, said that they should not be underestimated. This nation of lizardmen calls itself Psyker, but they have another name, Dragon Tamers. The hero looked at her in amazement and asked again. Looking at him, the girl replied that she should not get worked up, not real dragons. We are talking about a dragon-like beast, which is called the dragon of the land of Cygair. Looking away, the protagonist replied that she had not told him about this before, to which she asked what he was talking about. Closing her eyes, Bella said that the life of this people is special, starting from birth. The embryos of the lizards appeared. It was heard that each lizard was born together with one dragon. She grinned and added that that's why Dragon Tamers isn't quite the right name because they're relatives, not master and pet. Looking at the hero, the girl heard who's in charge of reproduction, to which she replied that all land spirits are sterile, so the Psyker people are definitely in charge. Looking away, Chuck asked how big these land dragons are. Adjusting her glasses, Bella replied that they're a little smaller than his armadillo, and they're also ungulates, which is useful when fighting. She raised her finger up. The hero clutched the telescope in his hands. Stretching his hand forward, he shouted that he should quickly bring them here and provide them with a place to stay for the night. Looking at him, the girl asked what he wanted to do, to which the protagonist asked again. Smiling, he said that he was going to let them stay in the fortress. Bella closed her eyes and asked him if he still dreamed that people who did not choose a king would choose him, a pioneer lord with an uncertain future. Shaking the lizard's hand, Chuck thought it looked like it. Smiling, the hero said that they could bring all their people here and they would discuss matters later, to which the lizard replied that of course. The girl shuddered and thought that they also called him lord. Smiling, she asked what happened. The hero looked at her and asked again that it could have been different. The protagonist crossed his arms, hearing that he gave them some kind of potion. Even young girls are harder to deceive, to which he replied that no potion, he simply told them that he had magic herbs to increase strength, and that they could stay if they wanted. They were so happy when they heard this that they immediately agreed. Frowning, the girl thought that he was an idiot. The pet looked in amazement. The protagonist looked down in confusion. Smiling, Chloe asked that the centaurs would be able to resist them, to which Heather replied that they were so stupid that they would not have a chance. Looking through the telescope, Chuck said that here is his cavalry. The lizards rushed forward. It was heard that this is worthy of the name of the Great Lord's detachment. Looking at them, Julie said that it was a pity that the people were so physically weak, they would not have been hindered by stronger riders. The hero grinned and said that they could easily change riders, but there was a blood connection, thanks to which trust was achieved between a steed and a rider. Looking straight ahead, Bella said that there should be a balance everywhere. Even if nature gave them more strength, they were not such good riders. The lizard lay on the ground. It was heard that the psyker people are always twins, but because of physical weakness, women sometimes have a hard time getting pregnant and giving birth to children. The beast raised his hand and said that he was glad to see his master. His name was Adam. He was the leader of their people. Looking at him, the hero asked how they were doing here. The lizard looked away. Buildings appeared. It was heard that it was promising. Crossing his arms, the protagonist said that he would make sure that the medicine he spoke of went to everyone, to which Adam thanked him. Chuck sat at the table. It was heard that he did not expect that dragons would appear in the system, probably because the psyker people and their earth dragons are blood relatives. A notification about the beasts appeared. It was heard that after his medicine, both of them would begin to gain experience together. Looking to the side, Bella asked what Julie said, that he wanted to buy a book of light magic. Looking at her, the hero asked that she had one. Closing her eyes, the girl answered that she did not, and then thought that who did he take her for. Holding a fork in her hands, Bella said that but he had heard of the art of sacred prayer, she would advise him to try it. Having bitten the chicken, the protagonist said that it seemed that this art was connected with the power of the voice, and compared to physical development, it could hardly add power. Raising his hands, he added that many do not survive natural selection because they do not keep up with the times, so he is not interested in this ancient crap. Looking at him, Julie said that she also thinks that the art of sacred prayer is a relic of the past. The girl smirked and said that today's youth not only grows up without brains, they die without brains. Looking to the side, she asked how hard he can punch. Looking at his hand, the hero answered that he no longer remembers exactly. He clenched his fist tightly. The protagonist struck with his fist. Looking at the cake, Chuck asked that it was probably about 2 tons. Looking at him, Bella asked that he knew what the effect of the art of sacred prayer was. Closing his eyes, the hero said that he certainly respected all her knowledge, but did not understand what she wanted to say. He extended his hand forward, hearing that the effect of the art of sacred prayer is to increase strength, to which the protagonist asked what so what. Chuck looked away in surprise, hearing that in proportion to all of his parameters. He raised his eyebrows and asked what in proportion, that is, if he is strong, he will become stronger, if weak, then weaker. Sitting at the table, the girl answered that in addition, practicing the art of sacred prayer increases resistance to dark magic. Extending a scroll, she added that in her youth, she came across it and very quickly mastered all the teachings. The hero took the scroll from her. He began to read the text. Holding the scroll in his hands, the protagonist asked that this is the same battle mage. Items appeared. It was heard that 3,000 years ago, in the era of the great tide of the elements, conjuring was extremely difficult, so without relying on it, the art of sacred prayer was created. Flames appeared around the weapon. It was said that the magician himself not only succeeded in the art of holy prayer, but could even practice dark and light magic in the magical realm itself. Looking away, the protagonist said that it was impossible. Closing her eyes, Bella replied that well, ancient scrolls are not stored for so long, so these are all theories. Looking at the scroll, Chuck said that well, if so. Looking at him, the girl asked that she could serve him as the governor of the Highland Fortress. Smiling, the hero replied that of course. The protagonist raised his hand and said that the Highland Fortress was currently experiencing stagnation, but such an educated woman could turn this backwater into a beautiful place. Bella waved her hands and said that finally. Stretching her arms forward, she added that the Highland Fortress was ancient, full of vitality and great prospects. She had not felt so good for a long time. Buildings appeared. It was heard that she was so happy. The hero was sitting on the bed. Looking down, he said that this art of prayer has 5 levels of energy. Stars appeared. It was heard that the spell of dawn, star twinkle, moonlight and sunlight, and daylight. A ray appeared. It was heard that the lowest rank is the spell of dawn. It is used once a day. The effect lasts for half an hour, and increases the strength by half. Putting his hand to his face, the protagonist said that with each subsequent rank, the level and duration of the effect increases. Raising his hand, he added that okay, enough theory, it's time to try everything out, starting with the basics. Clenching his fists, Chuck said that he was fucking cool. Looking at the scroll, he added that the scroll said that it usually takes a month to learn the basics. Looking down, the hero said that if the feeling of warmth reached the heart, then the spell worked. Smiling widely, he added that he could use it before going to bed. Sitting on the bed, the protagonist said okay, he'll think about it tomorrow, and now he'll look at the troops in the system. He looked down in bewilderment. Chuck screamed in amazement. A notification appeared. A question was heard about the progress being so fast. Looking at it, the hero asked that he could throw a few points into this skill. Unallocated skill points appeared. It was heard that he had received these points quite a long time ago, and new ones were getting harder and harder. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that if he continued practicing, the level would soon increase very slowly. Frowning, he shouted that he had decided that he should never stop improving for a second. Raising his hand up, Chuck shouted to increase the skill level to the maximum. He quickly extended his hand forward. A notification about the maximum level appeared. Looking down, the hero said what he felt. A glow appeared on his heart. It was as if a small sun appeared in his heart. Looking down, the hero said that this is the power of light. A glow appeared around him. Looking up, the protagonist said that now he can see, all the details of his past appear before his eyes. Raising his hand, Chuck added that he felt like he could discharge the air and change the density of water, as if nature itself was under his control. Clenching his fist, the hero said that it was no wonder she spoke so much about this art, it would really be useful to him. Looking up, the protagonist shouted that he had to invest the remaining points. A window appeared in the building. People were standing on the street. It was heard that he had managed to master the art in one evening. Smiling, Bella said that he was really very smart. She was proud of him. Closing his eyes, Chuck said that he had expected to hear praise in his honor. Raising his hand, the dwarf said that he was great, and the girl added that he had done an excellent job. Raising his eyebrows, the hero thought that it seemed that someone had remained silent. He looked at Bella. Smiling, the protagonist said that he had already read the scroll that she had given him. The girl smirked and asked that he had already read it. Now he should continue trying to summon streams of heat. Chuck looked at her in bewilderment and thought that he was a redneck. Gritting his teeth, the hero thought that they were a bunch of bastards. Standing in front of him, the dwarf asked, "Let me ask him, this bronze weapon is still in the warehouse, what should he do?" Looking at him, the girl asked what kind of bronze weapon, to which the protagonist replied that he almost forgot that there is such a thing that when wild peoples dig up some ancient weapon, it turns out to be captured by them. Putting his hand to his face, Chuck said that he remembers the sword. Judging by the decoration, it dates back to the time of the uprising. It probably cost a lot of money. Standing next to him, Bella asked that maybe she could take her with him, to which the hero replied that he would go too. If there were more than a dozen bronze treasures, most likely they could be sold quickly. They looked at the equipment. The protagonist looked surprised and asked why so many. The girl and the hero froze in amazement. Holding out his hand, Chuck said that this figure was some kind of nonsense. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Bronze is not some kind of junk. The high price is evidence of its shortage. Looking through a magnifying glass, Bella said that wow, she knows the wilderness better than anyone. Frowning, the girl shouted that why were they arresting him here? She did not steal the second general's milk. Grinning, the protagonist said that from now on he asks and she answers, to which Maddie responded approvingly. Looking at the girl, Chuck asked that when she was in the tribe before, she saw this bronze. Smiling, she replied that she did. Clenching his fist, the hero asked where it was from, what time period it was, how many. Looking to the side, Maddie said that about half a year ago, they were exchanged with their eastern neighbors. At that time many tribes bought them because they were much cheaper than iron weapons. The protagonist opened his mouth wide and asked why the hell she hadn't said such an important detail before. Raising her hand, the girl asked why he needed this nonsense. The weapon they made themselves was much stronger than those broken pieces of iron and bronze. Chuck looked at her silently. Putting his hand to his face, he said that he should calm down. Maddie was just ignorant, you shouldn't blame her. The hero looked down. Taking the girl by the shoulder, he said that the organization had now decided to give him a very difficult task. Looking at him, the girl heard that he would give her 10 fighters, let her go and find out where all these things were from, to which she asked that she could refuse. It was heard that, moreover, she could not even be asked this question. The squad went forward. It was said that so many with 10 warriors went in search of the source of bronze. Fortunately, after several difficult battles near the fortress, the famous golden sign was installed, the castle of the Scarlet Order. The hero smiled broadly. The goblin raised his hands. The thought appeared that as soon as Medi entered, countless natives began to flatter her and madly showed their affection. People stood near the ruins. The thought arose that bronze items were also circulating along the entire path in public. Soon Medi found the birthplace of the ruins. The squad stood still. It was said that on the way back the number of the team had already increased to hundreds of people. The protagonist looked at him in amazement and shouted that he almost thought that someone had attacked the fortress again. Standing next to him, Bella said that they did not know their origin and from which tribe they had all escaped, to which Chuck replied that one day, a man handed out a sickle, and they all mowed the grass so that he could feed the cows. The hero put his hand to his face. Smiling, the girl said that she was almost there, to which the protagonist replied that there were hundreds of miles of land in this place. Putting his hand behind his head, Chuck said that he should go and choose a reliable guide, bring dozens of people, he should see the situation with his own eyes. Looking away, he added that when the time came, she would be sold in exchange for wheat beans, and he would return several hundred tons. The animals walked across the field. It was heard that these earth dragons were even more terrible than the parasites. Their mouths were a bottomless pit. Turning his head, the hero said that he should return and give him good protection of the Highland fort. Smiling, Julie said that it was Chuck. They returned. Closing her eyes, Bella asked how things were going. Everything was fine. Stretching his hand to the side, the hero said that if he takes up the matter, is there anything he cannot achieve? The elf looked surprised and said that such a large number would suppress the price of ancient weapons on the market. The protagonist dismounted from his horse, listening to the fact that, however, where did all the free people go? To which he replied that he thought there was a beautiful fresco on the wall, so he allowed them to leave it and figure out how to destroy it. Standing in front of him, the girl asked that he was not afraid that something would happen to them, to which Chuck asked again that it could happen, someone would get bored, and he would attack the rabbit man. The man sat on the griffin. It was said that at the same time, the massive leak of bronze also attracted the attention of another legion. Henry smirked slightly. Looking at the ruins, he said that he had finally found them. A map appeared. It was said that Henry was from the Stuart Kingdom, one of the 3 great states. Images of people appeared. The thought appeared that as a kingdom comparable in strength to Pompeii, Henry in the true sense of the grandson of an imperial marshal, a rich family, noble origin, a bright future, the label of an aristocrat perfectly suits a person like Henry. Unfortunately, everything is far from simple. A camp appeared. It was said that after hard training with several of his brothers, only Henry was sent to the border and became the commander of the Roar of the Brown Bear. The view of the flags opened up. The thought arose that, however, in the Stuart Kingdom there are strict rules for naming armies. Because the name alone is enough to understand a lot. The Frontline Elite Army, named after natural disasters, such as the fury of the storm and the tremor of the earth. The second-tier armies are named after powerful monsters, such as the Dragon Battle, the courage of the Griffin and the Swift Hawk. The flags were raised up. The thought arose that bears, boars and elephants are ordinary animals. All the worst armies of the third line are named like this. The squad walked forward. It was said that it was no coincidence that in the future he would have no chance of promotion at the age of 27. Henry looked forward. It was said that he was not one to give up easily. The people stood near the equipment. The thought arose that when the bandits were suppressed a few months ago, Henry accidentally discovered that they had a lot of ancient bronze products. The guy looked at the ruins. It was said that he immediately began to investigate. Finding the origin was not difficult. Raising his hand, the knight asked that he did not want to first capture the living and beat the information out of them by torture. Closing his eyes, Henry said that it was not necessary. Let them just defeat them and they will tell them everything. Let everyone rest, eat and go to bed. Prepare for an attack after sunset. Putting his hand behind his head, the man said that this fresco is too difficult. If they continue to hammer it like this, then when will they finish? Looking to the side, the young man said that these savages used to at least give advice, and now they just watch and have fun. Raising his hands up, the worker said that the chores are postponed until tomorrow. It is already getting dark, so they will finish here. Smiling, the guy said that he agreed. They will go to bed. Holding the tool in his hands, the young man asked what he was doing. The boy, walking forward, answered that he was going to the toilet. The view of the moon opened up. The goblins were lying on the ground. Wiping his weapons, Henry asked if everything was clear to them, to which the knight replied that the bronze was discovered by chance. Putting away his sword, he added that it was wonderful. Frowning, the boy asked why he still couldn't see it. Lowering his head, the knight said that 3 days ago, a Pompeian nobleman took a step ahead of them and they were all replaced. Looking at him, Henry asked what about the other people, to which the soldier replied that it was the Pompeian leader from the Alpine castle, and he added that these villagers described them as very powerful, like the coming of the holy light. The goblin was lying on the ground. Raising his hand, the boy said that it was just a small pioneer, so he should not take it to heart. Looking straight ahead, he added that however it seemed like war was about to start, to which the knight replied that but if the Pompeians found out they would be in big trouble. Grinning, the boy said yes, it would be a problem if they found out. Putting his hand out in front of him, Henry asked that but if the leader of the pioneers was destroyed, how long would it take to be discovered? To which the soldier replied 1 month. The griffin looked at the goblin. It was heard that if the griffins got rid of the corpses. Smiling, the boy said that maybe it would never be discovered. The boy was sitting in the bushes. It was heard that one of them farted. Why did it stink so much? Sitting at the table, Bella said that the monarch of the Stuart Kingdom is called Barry, and he is a geek with a lot of ideas. Looking straight ahead, she added that he had appointed many ambitious boys as army commanders, and all these boys felt that they would be handed the banner again, so they built armies from their own pockets. The men held swords in their hands. Stretching her hand to the side, the girl said that such a trick, they know how many gold coins will be in the treasury in a year. Her eyes lit up and she added that she was telling them, 100,000 at least, 100,000 gold coins. Putting her hands on her hips, the barbarian asked why there was so much money that year. What did Barry use it for? Smirking, Bella replied that Barry was known for his gluttony and lust. Naturally, he spent all the money on this. Looking away, the hero said about corruption. Entering the building, the guy turned. The protagonist looked in amazement and asked what happened, and then thought that perhaps this was not the same Frank. Looking at him, the young man mumbled. Chuck shuddered when he heard that someone was going to attack the fortress. The shell was lying on the table. Sitting at the table, the hero asked what the Brown Bear Legion was. Looking to the side, the girl said that the Stuart Legion is usually about 4,000 people, and the Brown Bear flag should be a garrison legion. The maximum will be 3,000 people, so he should not worry too much. The protagonist raised his eyebrows and asked why there were so many people. Isn't the legion a high-level unit? Looking down, Chuck asked that but compared to the total number of people, the most important thing is whether the other side has a mage with an army. Once upon a time he played a huge role in the battle against the Minotaur. The elf looked at him with fear and said that it is true, if the other side has any high-level mage, then he will not be able to play. Putting his hand to his face, the hero said that on the contrary, their own mage is an idiot plus 2 fools. Smiling, Bella said that he should calm down. Although high-level mages are strong, their number has sharply decreased. to which Julie replied that he was right. His Majesty Barry is very suspicious, and high-level mages are appointed to the army only in wartime. Sitting at the table, the protagonist heard that now is peacetime, to which he asked how she knew this. He thought she was a financial addict and knew nothing else. Closing her eyes, the elf replied that he did not even know this. Of course, the voices of supporters and opponents are very loud, and everyone in all countries knows about it. Rolling his eyes, Chuck asked what then. He does not remember anything, how many years ago it was. Closing one eye, Julie said that probably more than 20 years ago, to which the hero asked that he was not even born then. He thinks everyone lives like her. Looking straight, Bella said that they will get down to business, they should not worry about the mage. Putting his hand to his face, the protagonist said that all the same, the foreign magicians are not as good as their 3 fools. Sitting at the table, he added that there were only 3,000 people, there was no magician with an army yet. Chuck stood up abruptly and shouted that he had decided that if they dared to come, they would never be able to return. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked what was that. She opened her eyes wide and said that even if they mobilized all the people who could fight, the number of warriors would not exceed 600. With only 1/5 of the enemy's strength, he had the courage to say only 3,000 people. Smiling, the hero said that when the time came, the loot would pass into her hands, to which Julie replied that of course, no problem. She raised her eyebrows and asked what they would say about them needing help. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that if he asked for help, let them kiss his ass, the great lords do not need anyone's help. The shell was on the table, and it was heard that they should disperse. The view of the river opened up. It was said that soon thousands of people throughout the fort began to act, preparing for the upcoming war. Chuck stretched out his hand forward. It was thought that the Highland Fort was located on the west side of the river. In order to avoid losses and damage, Chuck decided to place the battlefield in the east. The hero looked at the tower. It was thought that, and for realism, Chuck also ordered people to build a fake Lord Hall on the east bank of the river, which would be attractive and authentic. The creatures raised their hands up. It was said that the second general used the soil fertility technique every day, and the weeds and reeds grew quickly, forming a green city wall adjacent to the river bank, and 20 days later, both sides finally entered the first preliminary confrontation. The people rushed towards each other. The thought appeared that after a round of careful analysis of the situation, both sides attacked each other. The girl aimed her bow. The thought appeared that no matter how good the scout's riding skills were, he was no match for the centaur's own legs, and the outcome would be decided in an instant. The centaurs looked at the corpses. Putting her hand on her side, Heather said that when they fought, it seemed to her that there was some heavy cavalry on the other side, to which the hero asked that heavy cavalry is good, its equipment is the most valuable. Looking through the telescope, he added that but they were too slow. In 20 days only the rangers reached the battlefield first. At this pace, waiting for their army to arrive, it is estimated to take several days. Holding an arrow in his hands, the guy said that using a centaur as a ranger is quite smart. Smiling, he added that but this is just a fight to the death. When his army arrives, they will definitely lose. 2 days passed, the young man looked ahead. Gritting his teeth, Henry said that the damned weeds, they fall into the wheels and because of them the speed is reduced several times. Looking to the side, he added that but they can't be left behind. Inside are 2 teams of heavy cavalry of 100 people, who are the key to the battle. Stretching her hand forward, Chloe said that here they are, to which the protagonist asked that finally here. He looked through the telescope. Chuck's eyes widened in amazement and asked what the hell. After so many days of waiting, they received a group of broken legions in such a miserable state. The knights walked forward. It was heard that only the front half of the cavalry armor was iron, and the back, what, leather. Looking at the horses, the hero said that this horse armor is also, with a bare bottom from behind. Frowning, the protagonist asked that when it rains, will he hold an umbrella? If he has no money, let him at least learn from others. He just doesn't look very good, but he thinks that he can be intimidated. The guy grinned, looking straight ahead. The warriors stood by the fence. It was heard that, surprisingly, all those who wear armor and these big guys do not look like ordinary masters. Holding a telescope in his hands, Henry said that the equipment and the number of people are much more than he expected. He underestimated them. Stretching his hand forward, the knight said that he should look at these reeds. A fortress appeared. It was heard that this plant, which withers every year, grew to 3 or 4 meters and is lush, like a grove. Looking at Henry, the soldier asked that there really was an ambush behind these reeds, to which he replied that the muddy shallows would not allow the horses and soldiers to pick up speed and make the raid impossible. Turning his head, the young man said that they were preparing for an attack. The swordsmen were moving forward to suppress. The infantry was marching in formation. All the cavalry was outflanking. The knights stood still and responded approvingly. Looking to the side, the guy shouted that they were shooting. Pulling his sword forward, he added that they were lining up to storm. The people covered themselves with shields. Looking at the hero, Chloe said that she couldn't, to which the protagonist replied that he should wait. There was still distance. Let him come closer. Henry grinned. It was said that in this battle the commanders have a common feature. They are both absolutely confident in themselves. He fears that the fort is fleeing. The hero crossed his arms. The thought appeared that Chuck is worried that the roar of the brown bear will find his ambush. The girl clenched her teeth. It was said that even Heather was focused only on defense, fearing to undermine the offensive enthusiasm of the opponent. Looking to the side, the girl shouted that it was only 20 yards away. Raising a finger up, the hero turned. Stretching his arms forward, he shouted that they would defeat them. The people rushed forward shouting for murder. The boy looked at him in amazement and asked what the hell, why so many big guys? Henry said, wide-eyed, it was an ambush. Gritting his teeth, he added, the roar of a brown bear, he could not be defeated with all his heart and hope. Stretching his hand out to the side, the boy shouted for the heavy cavalry to attack. The horses rushed forward. The knights ran forward at a rapid pace. It was heard that it was so exactly. Looking straight ahead, Henry said calmly, dozens of people turned into 200 people. The cavalry ran forward, it was heard that but they still had an absolute advantage. The man swung his weapon, and someone said, let the infantry hold out, the heavy cavalry will soon arrive. A blow flew at the man. The guys fought each other. The people swung their weapons. Gritting his teeth, the boy said they are advancing, the flank detachment will surely catch them by surprise. Plants appeared. Henry looked to the side and said that yes, it was the sound of the reeds. The earth dragons were moving forward. They had shooting towers. The hero grinned and said that the earth dragon was a heavy vehicle, its dash was extremely strong, and agility was its only weakness. At such a short distance they would not have the opportunity to change their course. The man's eyes widened and he shouted, what the hell was that? The cavalry suddenly stopped. It was heard that forcing a turn at this time would mean giving the enemy the most vulnerable flank, which would be tantamount to suicide. The dragons rushed towards them. The man looked at them in fear. The knights suddenly flew up. The soldiers rushed forward. It was heard that they were attacking. The people flew to the side and shouted. Sitting on a horse, the warrior shouted forward. The dinosaurs threw them up. Crossing her arms, Medai said it was their turn to have fun. Raising her hands up, she shouted to get ready. A powerful explosion erupted. The people grabbed their heads. The orcs began to attack. The beams rushed towards the soldiers. The knights fell to the ground. The guy looked angrily. Looking at the griffin, he asked that he saw 3 magicians on the other side. Let him kill them. The beast raised its head up. Suddenly it rushed forward. Holding a weapon in his hands, Henry said that everyone should get ready for battle. Sitting on his horse, the soldier responded approvingly. The girl looked away in amazement. She opened her eyes wide and shouted that the griffin. Turning around, Medai said that they were folding up, they were in sight. The orcs covered their eyes. Flames appeared from the griffin's mouth. He shot them sharply. The girl looked in surprise. She frowned. Medai held the staff in front of her. A powerful explosion erupted in the sky. The warriors were fighting each other. A fierce fight seemed to be taking place. The hero smiled widely. He swung his sword sharply. Lying on the ground, the young man asked that this guy was a monster. Henry rushed forward. It was heard that this was the Lord. He frowned angrily. The young man swung his weapon sharply. The protagonist looked to the side. A pile of smoke appeared in front of him. Chuck squinted from it. Standing in front of the rift, he thought that he had such a strong fighting spirit. Maybe he was the leader. Henry closed his eyes, hearing that as expected from their lord. With him they could definitely win. Looking straight ahead, he said that he should introduce himself. The hero sighed heavily. Holding the weapon in his hands, he said that he did not deserve it. Smiling, the protagonist asked what kind of causeless invasion of the fort he was sentencing him to death. Wanted to say something last. Gritting his teeth, Henry said that yes, he was waiting for him to die, but first he would shut his filthy mouth. Suddenly he jumped up. The guy looked forward angrily. The man swings his sword. The young man blocked the blow with the blade. The protagonist parried the opponent's attack. The guy struck the enemy. Chuck raised the weapon above his head. A flurry of blows fell on the knight. Henry falls to the ground. 2 people stand opposite each other. The young man raised his head and noticed that the enemy was well prepared, because he blocked his first blow. The antagonist looked down and thought that he had the power of the unloading effect, otherwise he would not have been able to withstand the attack of his sword. Henry began to smile. 3 knights fly at the protagonist. The crowd looks forward. Chuck bowed his head and said that he thought they had a regular army, but it turns out they are only capable of 1 surprise attack. An aura enveloped the hero's heart. The hero raised his hand and said that he also has a hidden technique and activated the power of radiance. The hero bent down. The protagonist tries to hold on to the sword. The slashes pierce the attackers. Chuck killed 3 opponents. The crowd looks up. The girl sits on the orc and asks the protagonist to help her. The griffin chases the girl. The griffin breathes fire. The orcs dodge the opponent's attacks. An arrow flies. The arrow pierces the creature's mouth. The griffin coughs up blood. The woman lowered her bow. Heather raised her hand and gave the order for the centaurs to attack the griffin. A hail of arrows fell on the creature. The arrows pierced the griffin's body. The soldiers look up and realize that it was Lord Henry's pet. The antagonist raised his head. The hand grips the hilt of the sword. The man rushes to attack. The protagonist blocks the opponent's blow. The young man looks up and notices that they attacked first. The guy kicks the man. Chuck raises his sword to strike. The antagonist holds the blade with both hands and thinks that his magic armor has a powerful reflective power. The man raises his sword to block the blow. The blade passes the opponent. The antagonist looks up and tries to understand why the hero's fire element does not work. The young man makes a cut across the man's body. The blade cracks. Henry is on his knees. The hero's foot kicked the man. Chuck stands over the fallen enemy. The young man lowered his head and said that a weapon is just a weapon, and added that if he can't fight without his sword, then he is not worthy of the title of leader. The guy looks at his hands and says that the fire reflective element of the magic armor is cool, so much so that his hands are covered in blisters. The man raised his head and said that 5 times the fire element attack is enough to incinerate a person, but the protagonist only burned his hands. Henry lowered his gaze. The man is on his knees and says that he admits his defeat. The soldiers look forward and understand that the master has accepted defeat. The protagonist's army raised their hands and realized that they had won. The woman looked at the young man and asked if they should be caught, all of them, to which the hero replied that they should definitely be caught, but first Henry. An image of the sky appeared, and the guy said that first, he will take the magic armor. The armor is lying on the ground. The young man is standing with a breastplate. The protagonist looked ahead and said that he himself had broken the armor, and added that he shouldn't have gotten so mad. Chuck started crying and said that the armor had suffered because of him, and the girl tried to find out what was wrong with him, and whether he had been wounded. The hero picked up the armor and answered that he had been wounded right in the heart. Julie looked at the young man and thought that it was good that he wasn't wounded, because she could have spent half a bottle of holy water on him. The girl adjusted her glasses and asked if it could be a magic crystal. An image of a weapon appeared, and the girl added that magic crystals were so expensive that their price couldn't even be measured in gold coins, because they were considered a necessary material for creating magic equipment. Sylvie turned around and said that the magic crystal in the armor had run out, and added that Chuck should ask the blacksmith to remake the armor, and then the crystal would work again. The young man picked up the breastplate and asked how it could be that simple. The girl bowed her head and said that he might not believe her words, but he shouldn't say later that she didn't remind him that even if he fixed the armor, he still wouldn't be able to use it, because it wasn't for him. The boy stood there silently. The hero threw the armor down and said that someone else could deal with it, because he had more important things to do right now. Chuck raised his head and noted that these prisoners would probably fetch a pretty penny and ordered the girl to deal with them herself. Julie raised her finger and added that they needed to resolve the issue with the remaining spoils of war, because that baggage and horses could be sold and make a lot of money. The young man scratched his head and said that he wanted to make some horse meat. The girl folded her hands and added that these prisoners could also be sold in a trading union that specialized in selling prisoners, because it would be much more convenient. The boy opened his eyes wide and heard that each person could be sold for 4 or 5 gold coins. The boy looked at the girls. The protagonist put his hands on his chest and said that compared to the two of them, his knowledge of commerce was very superficial, and added that in addition to military power, there were many more laws and rules in this world that he should learn. An image of falling money appeared, and the hero noted that there were now enough bronze weapons to completely fill the palace vault and forget about the problem of poverty forever. The boy looked away. A system window appeared and reported that the lizardman's level had been increased. The dragon opened its mouth wide, and the hero noted that even the level of this dragon had increased, and its muscles and body had grown greatly. An interface window appeared that the army had been improved. Late in the evening, fire illuminated the entrance to the building. The boy was eating a piece of meat. The girl raised her head and said that she advised the hero to go with her to the city this time to exchange coins. The boy looked away and asked why he should do that. An image of people fighting appeared, and Sylvie replied that this time their enemy was the fine legion of the stewards, and Pompey's relations with the stewards had been very tense in recent years. When the girl said that if he encountered an invasion from the stewards, he should immediately report it to the House of Lords, the boy looked up and asked if it could be considered an invasion. Sylvie looked up and said that it was not up to him to decide whether it was an invasion or not, and the hero added that the top brass of Pompeii might make a fuss about it. Julie wiped her mouth and replied that they liked to drag things out, because they only wanted to get something to cling to, and since they were involved in this matter, they would also be in trouble. The boy looked up and said that this seemed true. The caravan moves on. It took 6 days to collect all the loot and prisoners, after which Chuck and the others set off. The shackles bind the man's hands. The boy raised his hand and shouted that he realized that the antagonist was cultivating himself with sacred prayers. The prisoner bowed his head. The man turned his head. His gaze slid to the side. The man tries to break free. The young man turned his head and made fun of the antagonist. Henry raised his head and shouted that only sacred prayers could give such power without the fluctuations of the basic elements. The young man dismounted from his horse and replied that this was indeed the art of prayer, but he would not give him a pie for the correct answer. The man ran to the protagonist and tried to find out what rank he was, because even the fire element did not affect him, and the young man replied that there were some problems until he could enter apocalypse mode. The man looked ahead and tried to understand how this was possible. The image of the ranks appeared, and Henry realized that the protagonist had reached the solar rank, which was second only to the apocalypse regime, and he still dreamed of capturing this place. The man raised his head and asked what he meant by problems. The young man scratched his head and replied that the problem was that he had not yet reached Xinhua. The man bowed his head. The man lost consciousness. The carriage entered the city. After several days of travel, Chuck and company finally reached Horan. The young man looked out the window and realized that time had flown by so quickly, and it seemed like yesterday that he had come to Horan alone. The sun illuminated the carriage, and the hero realized that now he was completely different from then. The army was lined up in front of the wall, and the hero noted that he was already the owner of thousands of elite soldiers and hundreds of powerful centaurs, and added that returning here this time, he felt completely different. Chuck looked at the caravan. An image of a girl appeared because the vast majority of people wanted to follow Julie in closing the deal. Chuck was left hanging around. The sun was shining on the tavern. A guy was holding a mug and saying that ale always tasted strange without ice, and the bartender said that at this time of year, wasting winter ice on magical creations would be a luxury. A foot kicked the door and a voice said that 3 mugs of dark ale and quickly. Bayan clutched at his belt. The man threw in some coins and added that they should also bring a roast shank, beef tongue, and 3 sandwiches with butter. The old man looked at the coins and noted that this money would not be enough, because it was worthless coppers. The man slammed the table and said that they knew who his master was. The young man wiped his mouth and noted that they were a bunch of screaming louts. The big guy raised his hand and said that he worked for my Lord Chuck, the master of the Highland Fortress. Gerald leaned on the boy and said that he had heard the name of Lord Chuck before. The old man raised his hand and asked if this was the same Scarlet Ripper, Lord Chuck, that the savages admired so much. Bedrick bowed his head and added that they had recently defeated the entire army of the Stuarts, having only 300 men. The boy raised his head and realized that they had entered only a few hours ago, and the news had already spread so quickly. The protagonist approached the man and asked if he was the lord of the Highland Fortress. Bayan looked ahead. The man swung his sword. The weapon lay on the table, and Bayan added that it was his huge sword, with which he had beheaded the dragon. The crowd raised their hands and someone shouted that he really was the Scarlet Ripper. The boy raised his head and thought that it was clearly a bad sword made of light iron. Its weight and lightness were only 1/5 of the weight and hardness of real iron. Chuck approached the squad and asked their names. When Gerald said that he was Heather, the boy raised his hand and pointed out that Heather was a centaur. The old woman slapped the man on the shoulder. Gerald raised his hand and said that these were just rumors and that there was no need to believe them, because his horsemanship was so honed that he was almost like a real centaur. That's what was meant. Chuck closed his eyes and thought that if something serious happens, 80 to 90% of the time some swindlers will appear. The crowd drinks for the heroes, and the hero understands that everything that is happening before his eyes, although different from reality, is quite reasonable and not devoid of details. The boy looked at the people and said that Heather is actually a centaur, to which the people replied that if Heather is not real, then neither is Chuck. The lodger pointed his finger at the weapon and said that the young man looked at his huge sword. If he is not Chuck, then who is Chuck? The guy pointed at himself and said that he is the real Chuck. The people silently look at the protagonist. Bedrick put his hand on the hero and asked where he would go later, and when the young man said that he will go to the noble garden, he added that they are also going there. The man raised his hand and said that very soon they will leave on a merchant caravan, and this is a luxurious column of carts of several hundred people. The detachment stands and says that they are going there to establish contacts with major figures, so they would take the guy with them. The girl looks at the big guys and tries to understand who they are, and Chuck added that while the caravan is waiting, he will go to the noble garden to find Dave. Light penetrates through the window. The maid looked at the hero and asked what he is doing here. The old woman raised her head and said that Lord Dave had gone to the Highland Fortress to see him a few days ago, and Chuck asked when he had left. The protagonist bowed his head, since the Lord had left 4 days ago, and tried to understand how he could have made such a mistake. A hand squeezed the guy's shoulder. The old man leaned over and asked if Lord Chuck had called him. The man stood next to the guy and said that in order to return from the Highland Fortress as soon as possible, they had driven 6 high-class war horses and used wind magic to speed them up, and the hero noted that it had taken them 4 days to go there and back. Chuck raised his head and asked what had happened. Lord Dave raised his head and said that the war with the Stuarts had begun. Chuck raised his hands and asked his interlocutor if it was true that Pompey had started a war with the Stuarts. The man with the mustache turned and told the hero to follow him. The guys were walking across the room. Dave grabbed the red curtains with his hands. He threw a wrapped letter on the table and asked Chuck to look at it. The protagonist, holding an unfolded sheet of paper, asked if Dave wanted to create a more atmospheric setting, and then noticed that they were not on such a close relationship. A letter appeared, which said that Pompey would avenge the dastardly attack on their lord. The blonde youth, furiously throwing the letter on the table, asked if they really declared war on the Stuart kingdom just because of this crap. The protagonist clenched his fists. He, smiling sarcastically, noted that it flattered him, and then realized that he did not think that his Highland fortress would ever be associated with such a historical moment. The protagonist, spreading his arms, said that His Majesty really was correcting mistakes, and then added that although his fortress was attacked, they were not seriously damaged. Dave turned around and asked Chuck if he thought the war with the Stuarts had actually started because of the attack on him. The blonde guy, putting his hands on the table, asked if his interlocutor thought he was just bait, to which he noted that, in fact, it was the Stuarts who had declared war on them first. The blue-eyed youth took hold of the piece of paper with both hands. An image of a letter appeared, which stated that during a standard military patrol, Henry had encountered an unprovoked attack from Pompey, putting up a tough fight. Unfortunately, he had died. Chuck, furiously tearing up the paper message, screamed that it was clear that their Highland fortress was simply defending itself, and in the letter it was presented as if they were the ones who had attacked. The protagonist, putting his fist in front of himself, asked how they could not know that Henry was still alive. Dave, clutching the gold ornament in his hand, replied that until the Stuarts themselves admit it, no one will be able to prove that it was Henry. He noted that this old grudge had long since reached the boiling point, and now everything can only be resolved by war, to which Chuck, dumbfounded, opened his mouth and asked what kind of old grudge. Blue crystals glittered in the cave. Dave explained that 5 years ago, Pompey and the Stuarts discovered a mine with magic crystals on the disputed border, and then added that the reserves of these stones were simply impressive, but they still could not determine who the mine belonged to. The protagonist, lowering his head, said that for the sake of the mine with magic crystals, both sides were ready to declare war. The man with a mustache, looking at the protagonist, said that a storm was approaching, and then asked if his interlocutor was afraid, to which he replied that he was not. Dave, parting the curtains, asked the young man to stay here for a few days, and then explained that a man wanted to meet with him. The blue-eyed guy, peeking out from under Dave's shoulder, asked why they couldn't meet now. People were walking around the city. The man said that they couldn't meet now because the gentleman was very busy, to which the protagonist asked who this gentleman was, and then clarified whether the man his interlocutor was talking about was the governor from the northeast. Chuck and his guide were standing at the huge gates. Dave said that it was His Majesty. The man with a mustache, knocking on the door, addressed His Majesty. He opened the door. Patrick, holding a gold ornament in his hands, said that they should pass. The old man with white hair, holding a book in his hands, said that he heard that he had detained Chuck, and then asked for forgiveness, to which the protagonist noted that the king was very polite. Patrick, looking ahead, asked the young man what he thought about the two countries declaring war on each other as a nominal party. The blue-eyed boy, leaning closer to Dave, asked what nominal party meant, to which he replied that His Majesty meant that in this war that Pompey needed a hero who would inspire the people's fighting spirit. Chuck, his mouth wide open, understood what the king was talking about and thought to himself that he should not dare drag him into it. Patrick, folding his arms, asked who the protagonist thought was most suitable. The main character, towering over the mustachioed man with a sarcastic face, replied that, of course, the head of the court, namely Lord Dave, was most suitable. He, raising his fist to his face, advised Chuck not to blab, because he was the only one suitable for the role of the hero. The Lord, happily turning his gaze to the sad young man, continued that the decrees of war of both states wrote the name of the latter as the owner of the Highland fortress. Patrick, sitting at the table opposite the heroes, asked Chuck not to perceive this as something very heavy, and then asked Dave to pour everyone a glass of wine, but first choose a 50-year-old bottle, to which he agreed. The protagonist nervously pressed his lips together. The king explained that the military corps was ready to give him the title of Eagle Knight, which is a very rare honor in peacetime. The fair-haired young man, raising his hand, reported to His Majesty that even thieves do not bother to touch his village detachment of the Highland fortress, since there is complete poverty there. The main character, grimacing slyly, continued that if the king was ready to share half of the division with him, then he would think about it. Dave, raising a bottle of wine over the guy's head, laughed and asked if he really dared to think about the division of the venerable palace. Patrick, touching his beard, replied that they would discuss this later, because he had another matter he wanted to ask Chuck about. He stated that the Scar tribe had recently responded to the call of Pompey, but halfway there they went missing, to which the protagonist gaped in shock. The king continued that the Highland fortress was located exactly in the place where the tribe went missing, and then asked if the young man could know where the Scars were, to which he began to sweat profusely. Patrick concluded that in the end, it was the people of this tribe who were natural-born warriors, and no one would simply accept their loss. Chuck nervously lowered his head, the man who intercepted the Scars halfway there. The protagonist, standing up abruptly against the backdrop of his surprised interlocutors, asked Patrick not to touch on the topic for now. The blue-eyed youth, his mouth wide open, reported that he did not know why, but an unimaginable fire of justice was burning in his heart right now. Chuck, hitting himself on the shoulder with his fist, declared that he was now an Eagle Knight. Patrick, raising his hand to his chin, asked if his interlocutor had changed his mind, to which he replied that selflessly serving the country was the duty of every Pompeian, and of course, he would take it upon himself. The gray-haired old man, smiling, explained that, in addition, being an Eagle Knight, the protagonist would receive great honor and respect. Patrick continued that, in addition, Chuck's soldiers could be enlisted in the Dragon Claw squad out of turn, but they would not be obliged to obey, because they would have great autonomy, to which he nervously glanced. The blue-eyed youth frowned and remembered that the Dragon Claw Squad was known for its bloody and brutal battles. Dave poured a drink into a glass. Chuck came to the conclusion that he did not care whether the troops were good or bad, this battle would not be easy for both sides. The brown-haired man, closing his eyes, asked the guy not to worry too much, and then added that His Majesty now also serves in this legion. The protagonist joyfully turned his head and asked if the king's son was really here too. Patrick lowered his head and replied that Bedrick was here too. The blue-eyed youth, rubbing his chin with his hand, thought that this was great, and concluded that the squad in which the prince served would definitely suffer the least, and would have many merits. The huge doors were closed. The gray-haired old man said that since they had discussed everything so well, then he would not detain the heroes any longer, to which they thanked him. The characters walked along the red carpet of the huge corridor. Chuck, looking at Dave, asked how good His Majesty's eyesight was, to which he replied that he could barely see. The man wrapped in a black cloak added that Patrick's sense of revenge was very deep, and the ability to understand the world with the help of this feeling and spiritual strength was no worse than the eyes, to which the protagonist, putting his hands on his belt, said that it was cool. The kings towered over each other. Dave began to tell that, in fact, the power of the past rulers was average. But this does not mean that they were stupid, and then added that, simply, power requires double the energy and time. The man with a mustache, clenching his hand into a fist, concluded that His esteemed Majesty was just able to cope with this. Chuck, shifting his gaze, thought that this old man was very furiously praising another man. The protagonist, stretching out his hand in front of Dave, did not let him finish. The fair-haired young man looked at his interlocutor and asked if he should go to Dragon Claw and meet everyone there, to which he replied that, perhaps, it is true. The protagonist concluded that then they will go now. The heroes stood at the entrance to the city. Chuck asked if they had arrived, to which Dave answered affirmatively. Two lords entered the room with the training men. The bearded guard, holding his hand out in front of the heroes, said that this was the location of the Dragon Claw Legion, and then asked what had happened to them. The man with the mustache, taking a letter out of his clothes, explained that it was Chuck, who was the owner of the Highland Fortress, and then added that he had come here by order of His Majesty. The guard, looking at the letter, asked again if it was really Lord Chuck, the owner of the Highland Fortress, who had come by order of His Majesty. The man in armor, turning around, asked those who had come to follow him. The blue-eyed youth, looking tiredly ahead, asked what was wrong with this man and why he was so strange, to which Dave replied that he did not know and concluded that he, in theory, should not have reacted like that. The man with a sword on his belt, knocking on the wooden door, asked the heroes to forgive him. He opened the door to a small room with people and continued that since his interlocutor claimed that if he was Chuck, then maybe they would find out the truth. Bayan, Bedrick and Geralt looked ahead in surprise. The protagonist, pointing his finger, shouted that it was that bunch of freaks again. The fair-haired youth, coming closer, shouted why they were so brave and whether they believed that he could finish them off, to which Dave wondered if he had misheard. The large guy, folding his hands in front of the protagonist, apologized to him for this little joke, and then explained that they did not mean any harm. The protagonist, looking away, asked who they were, after all. Bedrick, scratching his head, said his name. The heroes heard his name, and opened their mouths in shock. Dave, looking up in surprise, asked if the big man with the dark skin was really His Majesty, to which he replied that he was, and then suggested that his father had told the characters about him. The blue-eyed youth, opening his mouth wide, asked if the guy was really His Majesty's son, to which the man with the mustache replied that it turned out that way. Geralt, putting his hand on his chest, explained that he was a high-level swordsman from Horan, and Bayan gave her name, and said that she was a member of the court division. The protagonist, grimacing, thought that they had neither skin nor mugs, and then thought why he still trusted them, and in the end concluded that they were typical slackers and traitors rolled into one. Bedrick stands against a backdrop of kings and princes. Chuck mentally explained that most kings had multiple sons because it was easier to choose an heir, but even here, His Majesty stood out because he only had one son. The three soldiers lowered their heads in embarrassment. The protagonist realized that this was a very powerful omen of the fall of the state. The blue-eyed youth, putting his hands on his belt, asked the guard if he had seen the three before and why he also did not recognize His Majesty. The man with the thick beard, raising his eyebrows, replied that, in fact, he had not seen them before. Chuck, coming face to face with the bearded soldier, asked him if Bedrick had served in the Dragon Claw before, and inquired why he had not seen the prince. The muscular man, putting his hand on his neck, explained that although he was listed here nominally, but to be honest, he was here for the first time. He turned his head away and continued that now many noble children have learned to simply sign up for service, and then concluded that the modern generation has really become worse than the previous one, to which the protagonist asked if Bedrick was one of them. Chuck, twisting his mouth, asked who this guard was to speak for others. He, pointing his finger at the trio, asked why they pretended to be him. The king's son, lowering his head, noted that it would be very difficult for the protagonist to understand the soul of a squib. He, gritting his teeth, suggested that Chuck did not understand what it meant to be a rotten egg. Dave, raising his hand to his face, told the protagonist that this applies to those people whose talent is indistinguishable from a tree or a stone. A white flower grows in the forest. The Lord explained to the young man that in their world everything has its own talent and power, including leaves and stones. The long-haired man touched his palm in a stance. Dave continued that, however, history is not poor in talent, but a great wise man can become one by relying on hard work, resources and luck, unless he is talentless. Chuck, smiling, told Bedrick that it turns out he is talentless. The prince's eyes filled with tears. He said that he really is nothing special. Bayan, standing next to the muscular guy, said that His Highness has an excellent talent for the elements, and can absorb them on his own without even thinking about it. Bedrick lowered his head in tears. The girl continued that His Highness has a special physique, and these elements will affect him, so he must specially cleanse the accumulated elements in his body every week. Bayan stands in front of a girl with a burning hand and explains that, in general, elementalists cannot expel the elements from their own bodies, just as a mage would never worry about a fireball clutched in his hand. The blonde woman looked at the upset prince and concluded that, in fact, His Highness's strength was different at birth, but it became like this after a severe illness he suffered 4 years ago. Bedrick looked away. Chuck stated that he heard that he could pass through an army of 1,000 with the strength of his body, and then added that it made his heart tremble. The soldiers lowered their heads. The protagonist asked the prince how long he was going to pretend and suffer. The protagonist took his son Patrick by the shoulder and invited him to visit him in Gaoshan. Chuck, standing next to the soldiers and Dave, asked what about the commander of the Dragon Claw squad, and why he hasn't seen him yet. The warrior with a thick beard, closing his eyes, apologized for this and explained that the commander was often at the garrison lately, so he was not here. The protagonist, holding his face with his hand, replied that he understood, but still liked to hold meetings without pressing problems. The fair-haired youth, looking at the thick-bearded soldier against the open doors, concluded that, however, when the states declared war on each other, he could not stay here for long, and he needed to return to Gaoshan as soon as possible. The protagonist, resting his hand on his face, looked into the distance with a bored look, and when everyone was sharpening their knives, preparing for war, the only thing they all encountered was years of idleness. Chuck looks at the yellow note. Gaoshan barely kept up with the latest news that the messenger brought. The protagonist, holding a note next to the two girls, said that the Church of Light had given the two countries the Pope's signature, and then added that an attempt to smooth over the conflict would result in a war in the future, so the population had to be protected. Julie, happily opening her mouth, suggested that there would be no war, to which Chuck replied that the conflict might have been settled, but the issue itself had not been resolved, and if there was to be a battle, then so be it, because it was only a matter of time. The protagonist, handing the letter to Sylvie, orders that Chandra be brought to him for trial. The blue-eyed youth, frowning, states that it was originally planned that he would be given in exchange for ransom, but in the end Stuart sent him to his certain death to start a war, so he could not do anything. Sylvie looks at the note, and explains that the letter also mentioned that the Church of Light and the Church of the Goddess of Ice and Snow clashed with each other in front of His Majesty, and then concluded that it ended with the Church of the Goddess of Ice and Snow simply leaving the hall. Chuck, standing in front of the two girls, replied that in this war, the Church of the Goddess of Ice and Snow may not be on the battlefield with Pompey. The protagonist, nervously gesturing with his hands, notes that he really does not understand how one can insult such a powerful force as the Church of the Goddess of Ice and Snow right before the war. A light bulb appears above the blue-eyed guy's head. Sylvie states that he may not have learned all the information he needed because the text of the letter is a bit vague. The protagonist, slapping his head with his hand, remembers that this church is very powerful, and its power is comparable to the power of an entire country. The gray-haired old man sitting on the throne is bowed to by people in cloaks. The main character mentally explains that Patrick will not allow discord in his country, so they will definitely fall apart. Chuck, looking at the girls, asks what they think, will Stuart or Pompey win? Julie, frowning, replied that she heard that their forces are equal, so they can unleash a large-scale war, to which Sylvie notes that this information is already 30 years out of date. She, turning, continues that as soon as King Patrick ascended the throne, he did not have the same thirst for greatness and glory as the previous rulers, so Pompey was able to revive and is now thriving. The gray-haired man in a monocle examines the green sprout. Patrick writes with a quill on parchment. The girl with ears on her head adds that she rarely praises people for their actions, but King Pompey was able to become a powerful ruler. A fat man hugs two women. Sylvie said that Beluni of the Stuart line is the perfect example of a fallen monarch, since he is vicious. She, stretching her finger upward, concluded that they are opposites, and their powers are no longer similar. Chuck clarified whether Pompey will defeat them, to which the woman in glasses, putting her finger on her chin, replied that it is not necessary, and if it concerns a war between two states, then the issue is quite simple to resolve. The two kings glare at each other against the background of a shadowed figure. Sylvie declares that as soon as entry to other countries is closed, the situation will become more difficult. The protagonist, crossing his arms, asks the girl if she means that Southern San Jose is also going to have a hand in the war, to which she replies that most often the third party that decides to intervene ends up the biggest winner. The guards lead the long-haired guy by the arms. He complains that his head hurts. The fair-haired youth turns around. The young man lowered his head, Chuck noticed that the commander of the Legion Roaring Bear had arrived. Henry says that he is no longer of any value to the protagonist, so he can simply judge him, to which the protagonist, crossing his arms, replies that it is up to him to decide whether the prisoner is valuable or not. The blue-eyed guy, smiling, advised his interlocutor to say what interests him, otherwise his sword will decide for him. The protagonist's huge axe cut the shackles of the white-haired guy. The protagonist imperiously pointed his finger at the object and demandingly said that before revealing his secrets, he must look there. The prisoner looked up in shock from the document he saw and exclaimed in shock, "Did the Stuarts really declare war on Pompeii?" The protagonist pointed his hand downwards in disdain and coldly remarked that the prisoner should be more concerned with the fact that he was already dead to everyone, to which the prisoner sadly admitted that his country had disowned him. Chuck leaned menacingly toward the helpless prisoner and harshly added that in that case, he had better tell him what he was interested in. The protagonist ominously clenched his fist in a show of strength and mercilessly continued that the prisoner's life was worthless and no one would even notice if he accidentally died here. The prisoner desperately knelt down and pleaded that he knew where an artifact was. The blonde guy skeptically raised his hand up in disbelief and mockingly asked that the artifact sounded like some kind of nonsense, and that the prisoner was probably fooling him. The prisoner nervously looked at the floor of the dungeon and quickly clarified that, to be precise, this was a creation of the era of ancient titans. Interested people were examining the artifacts in the museum and the prisoner told in detail that about 10 years ago he and his father went to the Winter City to attend a banquet on the occasion of the coming of age of Lord Magellan's daughter and added with impression that when Lord Magellan was young, being a famous traveler, he brought many magnificent treasures from different countries. The long-haired boy looked forward with enthusiasm at the artifacts of antiquity and enthusiastically continued that on that day Lord Magellan opened his treasury for visitors, and explained to the protagonist that he had also been there. An image of a shiny gold ring appeared and the boy vividly described how an ivory bracelet immediately caught his eye and sadly explained that the Lord told him that it was a ritual bracelet of one of the clans of savages, and not a jewel at all. The prisoner squinted in admiration at the secret knowledge and confidently declared that he knew that this was not a ritual bracelet. The heroes looked at their freed interlocutor in surprise and he enthusiastically proclaimed that this was not even a bracelet, but a ring that the Titan gods themselves wore and majestically declared that this ring was a thunder ring. The dark figure mysteriously raised his hands up and the hero explained in an enlightening manner that the Titan king, who ruled the world in that era, created a whole set of rings from the bones of the rebels, and that they were in the hands of 4 Titans, and that they were called the Thunder Ring, the Red-Hot Iron Ring, the Earthly Vein Ring, and the Sea Storm Ring. The girl mysteriously leaned towards her interested interlocutor and meaningfully said that this legend is very popular, and that it says that if you collect all 4 rings, you can get unprecedented power, and the main character responded to her story with interest. The protagonist leaned greedily towards the narrator and asked him greedily if he had gotten the ring, to which he timidly replied that he had not, because Lord Magellan was a very powerful man, and he would not dare to ask him for anything. The prisoner squinted his eyes in disappointment from sad memories of the past and prudently added that Lord Magellan must not have revealed this secret himself yet, and added that this could play into his hands. The protagonist confidently shook his head and skeptically asked if he really couldn't understand this, and asked if Lord Magellan was mentally retarded. An image of a gold ring in a blue aura appeared, and the fair-haired guy enlighteningly explained that the higher the level of magical items, the more imperceptible the fluctuations of their energy are, and that therefore the energy of the Thunder Ring cannot be detected. The guy looked ahead doubtfully, and logically objected that even if it was an artifact, then the artifacts of the Titans could only be used by the Titans themselves. The protagonist smiled mysteriously at his own secret, and confidently answered that he had one Titan. The protagonist squinted suspiciously at the narrator of the story about the Titans and asked incredulously how the prisoner could understand that this was a ring, being a child, if no one could find this artifact for a long time, to which the prisoner mystically whispered that he was kissed by God. The protagonist looked down in confusion and the girl curiously asked again if a person kissed by God was a happy person, blessed by the gods and possessing special abilities, and then why did everything happen differently? Chuck scratched his chin in confusion and practically asked what abilities the prisoner had, and why then he did not feel anything special, to which the guy sadly explained that his right eye could not see in the usual sense of the word. The protagonist extended his hand to the interlocutor's head and rudely asked if he was blind, and the long-haired guy answered in a clarifying tone that this was not a very specific definition of the function of his eye. The prisoner, holding a sparkling crystal in his hand, patiently explained that he could not see things, but he could distinguish shine, colors, and energy fluctuations. The prisoner looked dejectedly at the table in front of him and convincingly added that the reason he was sure that this was indeed a ring was for something completely different. The long-haired guy looked ahead in confusion and mystically concluded that the ring emitted an unusual golden glow, accessible only to his eyes. The protagonist opened his eyes in admiration and exclaimed with impression that this was cool, because it was something like a golden pupil. The protagonist looked at his interlocutor with a cheerful look and said that he urgently needed to examine everything here, because, probably, something valuable had been lying around for a long time, to which the guy said that Chuck's pet was not ordinary at all. The protagonist looked ahead with disappointment, and asked if the freed prisoner could tell him anything else, to which the guy with long hair replied that he knew nothing more. Chuck looked at his new comrade with a trusting look and asked if he had told anyone about his talent. The hero languidly closed his eyes and explained in an exhausted voice that when he realized what it was, he was already old enough not to tell anyone about such suspicious things. Chuck stood in front of the dodging long-haired guy, puzzled, and asked why he did this with his ability, to which he assuredly replied that he had studied the history of blessed mages, and added that revealing his talent to people was akin to starting the countdown of his own life. A green-eyed girl named Julie, thoughtfully looking at the protagonist in thought, theoretically suggested that this could be anatomical research, alchemical experiments, or something like that. The protagonist grinned maliciously and practically explained to his interlocutors that special body parts of monsters could be used to create magical creations, and that perhaps his eye could also be used. The protagonist carelessly waved his hand in a joking gesture and frivolously added that he was joking, because now he had no alchemist here. The protagonist seriously put his hand on the shoulder of his new comrade and businesslike noted that he could not return to the Stuarts now. Chuck placed his hand on the freed prisoner's shoulder in a friendly, inviting gesture and generously asked if the boy would like to join them. The long-haired prisoner cautiously looked up at his master and asked warily what would happen if he refused. The protagonist smiled menacingly in a show of power and answered harshly that he would be imprisoned forever and asked if there were any other questions. The prisoner courageously extended his hand forward and resolutely stated that he had two conditions, and that if the protagonist did not agree, he would rather die here. The protagonist grinned imperiously and categorically demanded that, firstly, his eye could not be mocked, beaten or gouged out, etc., and nobly assured that he had always been kind to his subjects, and that the long-haired guy could have no doubts. The protagonist proudly raised his chin in a sign of dignity, and the prisoner added in principle that secondly, although he was a prisoner of war, he refused to join their squad as a slave, and added that at least he wanted to be a citizen, to which Chuck rightly agreed that this was reasonable, and accepted. The long-haired guy solemnly knelt down as a sign of loyalty, and devotedly proclaimed that from now on he would be faithful to him until his last breath. The protagonist ironically rolled his eyes from the pathos and sarcastically commented that it sounded so saccharine. The protagonist turned to his interlocutor and businesslike added that the guy should come up with a new name for himself, because Hendra was already dead. Hen thoughtfully raised his gaze to the ceiling and mystically said that his name would be Dracula. Dracula stood up to his full height and officially announced that from now on he, Dracula, had nothing to do with the Stuarts. The protagonist looked at his mobile device screen in surprise and thought analytically that Dracula was extremely two-faced, and asked who would have thought that the system would approve him so quickly, and noted in contrast that he was approved, unlike Morty Deer, who claimed that he would give his life for him, and whom the system never approved. The girl fanatically waved her fists in the air and devotedly shouted that he was faithful to the grave, and that he would give his life for his master, and Chuck shrewdly suggested that it was possible, because she was still angry about not having access to the greatest system benefit in the Alpine castle. The soldiers were standing near the horse-drawn carriage, and the protagonist asked in confusion why they were sending all this and cautiously noted that this thing looked like a coffin. The cool late autumn was gradually approaching, and that Chuck had finally received military help. Chuck gloomily put his hand to his head in dejection and pessimistically concluded that His Majesty wanted him to fight with resignation to death in battle. The messenger, gesturing with his hands, enlighteningly explained that in fact this was a primitive teleporter, and the protagonist exclaimed in a dissatisfied voice, "Could all this really be just some kind of interdimensional gate?" Chuck enthusiastically approached the magical device and astonishedly stated that he could not believe that it was completely covered with magical crystals, to which the messenger named Gandalf professionally explained that the teleporter could automatically accumulate magical power every 2 weeks and teleport one person to the specified location. Chuck looked critically at the teleporter and disappointedly noted that, however, they were waging a numerous war, and that teleporting only one person every 2 weeks was very insignificant, to which Gandalf insistently objected that my lord should not be ungrateful, and that if it were not for his highness's constant requests, Chuck would not have been able to get it, and it was so easy. The protagonist, angrily rolling his eyes, displeasedly noted that it was really him again. The messenger pressed his ear to the protagonist, and solemnly reported that His Highness asked to convey a message to Chuck: boldly kill enemies and achieve success. Bedrick turned to the messenger in a friendly manner and answered cordially that he could tell Brother Chuck that if they could not win, they should flee if possible, and that war was the country's business, and life was their own. The protagonist laughed merrily at the unexpected answer and chuckled carelessly. That was how it really was. Chuck looked at the unattractive banner with disappointment, and complained discontentedly that he had chosen such a beautiful name, the Ripper Army, and they gave him such a disgusting banner. In November the church was no longer able to resolve the conflict successfully, and war was about to break out, and Chuck, in turn, led the group to the city of Koran to meet a larger army. In front of the city walls lay a pile of stones. The wagons slowly drove into the fortress. A great war was coming, and the once barren lands outside Koram were now occupied by a few legions. The soldier girls shivered in displeasure from the cold and pessimistically noted that such weather was not suitable for war, and that it was quite possible to stay home and eat barbecue, and a girl named Gunther sympathetically added that when the war was declared, no one thought that this year would be so cold. The soldier pointed in amazement at the giant creature and exclaimed in shock that this thing was so big, and why was it bigger than their local dragons? A girl named Medai excitedly pointed at the approaching figure and shouted a warning that there was a sorcerer. An old man with a cane in his hand passed by the heroes. Bedrick approached the protagonist and said that this was a priest of the Church of the Ice Goddess, and jokingly asked if he scared the protagonist, to which he dumbfoundedly asked where he came from. Chuck turned to his interlocutor, puzzled, and asked him why he said it was a priest of the Church of Ice, because he thought they had problems with them in Pompeii, and his comrade sadly explained that it was true, and that in the old days each legion was supposed to have 20 spiritual ministers, and this year there were only 10, half as many. The priest turned towards the headquarters and businesslike suggested that they could go, and that he would take Chuck to a pre-war meeting, and that the guy should not forget to grab the banner of his legion, and the protagonist politely replied that he had a meeting, and that his friend should first take the guys to lunch. Mysterious figures surrounded the table. The red banner of the squad shone before the heroes. Bedrick looked critically at the tattered banner and mockingly asked if Chuck had really gotten the banner out of the trash, to which the guy indignantly replied that of course not, and that they had made it in the Alpine castle. The man pointed in the direction with his hand and added informatively that they would return later, take the banners and change them. Bedrick mysteriously leaned towards the protagonist and officially explained that when the meeting was over, there would be a procession of all the legions with the banners of the units, to which Chuck groaned discontentedly that he still didn't have enough hemorrhoids in such a situation. The herald solemnly straightened up and officially announced that the leader of the Dragon's Claw Legion had arrived. The man leaned towards the protagonist's ear and described in detail that this was Savak, and that he was descended from the famous Western Bohemia family, and in military circles he was always characterized as a wise but indecisive man, capable of taking responsibility for his actions, but not for the overall situation. The protagonist looked ahead in surprise and logically asked why Savak became the commander-in-chief this time, to which Bedrick enlighteningly replied that only a few years ago Savak took over the responsibility of commanding the troops when his partner's superior retired due to illness. Savak bowed politely to those present and formally greeted. "Good day, gentlemen commanders, Baron Chuck and your Royal Highness Derek." Prince Derek waved his hand democratically and replied in a friendly manner that he should be called simply Derek, and that in the army there was no such thing as your highness, to which he replied that there was no need to be modest, because his highness was such anywhere in the entire kingdom, and even the barracks were no exception in this regard. The man leaned towards his interlocutors with interest and added curiously that he was interested in what they thought of this war. The heroes silently surrounded the table. The mustachioed man persistently rose from his chair and frankly added that there were no strangers here, and they did not need to be modest, and they needed to speak as it was. The lord confidently straightened up to his full height and professionally stated that, based on his 20 years of military experience, he did not think that Stuart could compare with their Pompeii. The heroes looked at the speaker with enthusiasm, and he critically added that they had chosen the wrong time and the wrong enemy, and that His Majesty Berlini Stuart could still inherit the title of the Mad King. The protagonist turned confidentially to his companion and asked with interest if Bedrick really thought Lord Suffolk was as optimistic as he said, to which Bedrick answered frankly that he was not sure of the details, but his father usually did not do things he was not sure of, and that Derek knew how strong his hands were. Savak energetically raised his hands to attract attention and enthusiastically announced that in this battle on their side there would be a total of 150,000 men and 4 dragon cavalry, and that they, Dragon's Claw, would be the vanguard of the army and would be the first to attack Winterfell in the northwest. The guy in the cloak vengefully clenched his fist, and the man decisively concluded that they would make them pay for their gross ignorance. Chuck looked ahead with delight and worriedly thought that Magellan, whom Dracula had spoken of, lived in the fortress of harsh winter, and God help him. The protagonist entered the dwelling after the meeting and the girl politely asked him if the meeting was over. The subordinate looked around worriedly and asked worriedly where Abu was and why she hadn't seen him, to which the protagonist explained that there was a flag parade going on outside and they were staring and didn't want to go back. The subordinate turned to the commander curiously and asked with interest what the leader's flag looked like, and Chuck indifferently replied that it was just a piece of rag. The subordinate excitedly jumped up and down with curiosity, and exclaimed enthusiastically that she would go and have a look. Chuck blocked her way to the door, and skeptically remarked that there was nothing so wonderful about banners, and he thought she had no business in the cold, and why not wrestle with her a couple of times, to which she cautiously declined, explaining that then she would simply forget about it and not go anymore. The messenger rushed into the room in panic and desperately shouted that his master was in trouble, and that Abu and the others had started a fight with the people of Dragonclaw. The hostile warrior looked aggressively at the people and growled threateningly that he would not spare him. The warriors walked with banners through the streets of the city. The green-headed monsters watched the parade and declared that this was a parade of banners, explaining that it was very majestic, and this was the military banner of their alpine fortress. The banner fluttered in the wind. The boys threw their hands forward and shouted that it was a flag with a broken chicken leg, and asked how they were not ashamed to show such poverty. The boy grabbed his head and shouted that as far as he remembered, it was the banner of the Alpine fortress, and explained that he had no idea how they became famous, to which his short comrade thundered, how else could that shorty who was the head of this shameful squad become famous? Because he saw that the leader of the Eagle Riders was an ordinary yellow-haired boy. The lizard twisted his face in anger and hissed, how dare these people oppose their alpine fortress? The Dragon Claw soldier fell painfully to the ground from the blow, and groaned painfully. The Dragon Claw soldier looked at the enemy indignantly and shouted aggressively, what kind of creature is this? Because these reptiles beat up their soldier, and he will not let them go so easily. The Dragon Claw commander waved his fist belligerently and furiously commanded that the brothers must go forward, to battle, and that they dare not mock their people from the alpine fortress. The girl ran towards the fight and rudely growled, to hell with this. She belligerently knocked the warrior to the ground. The friendly soldier happily ran up to the protagonist and enthusiastically exclaimed that it was great that he was here too, and that maybe he could pull them apart, to which the protagonist adamantly replied that he would pull his girlfriend out, and after the fight they would talk. The fighting warriors fiercely continued their fight under the full moon in the sky. The Dragoclaw soldier recoiled in shock from his superior opponents, and exclaimed in amazement that these people could fight so well and that they were completely impossible to defeat and were as strong as bulls. The soldier desperately grabbed his weapon and firmly declared that if he could not defeat them with his hands, he would use his weapon. Bedrick pushed the guy to the ground and mockingly retorted that, in his opinion, the soldier had become bold and that he could not do anything but want to win. The conflicting parties continued their armed clash fiercely. The protagonist grabbed two opponents and authoritatively commanded that everyone must immediately drop their weapons and stop fighting. Savak sternly looked at the fighting soldiers and menacingly added that they were still soldiers and that the entire kingdom would answer for the stupidity they had committed today. The Dragon Claw soldier looked around in confusion and exclaimed in bewilderment, how was that possible? The observer looked at the fallen fighters in surprise and was amazed to notice that most of those who were knocked to the ground and could not rise were Dragon Claw soldiers. The girl looked around worriedly in search of a comrade and anxiously asked where her friend was. The messenger fell to his knees and shouted that something was moving towards them at great speed. The soldiers turned around in displeasure. The lizard rode into the city on a monster and ordered no one to escape and continue fighting. The soldiers opened their eyes in shock and shouted that it was a local dragon. Savak leaned menacingly towards the protagonist and ordered him to keep them under control, to which he replied that he vouched for his subordinates. The protagonist confidently walked along the alley. The lizard would appear menacingly on the scene of the fight and sternly exclaim what the leader wanted from him. Chuck would raise his hand in a decisive warning gesture and categorically state that he would only say it once. The lizard would sit imperiously astride the dragon and unquestioningly order that they should stop immediately. The watching protagonist would look at the multiple dragons in shock and would be stunned to note that there were so many local dragons, and that they all stopped after the word stop, and that all the Alpines were so crazy. Abu would turn to the commander justifiably and apologetically explain that the Dragoclaw soldiers were the first to insult their Alpine fortress, and Chuck would critically respond that they should forget about it and that it was fine for a little fight, but it was their fault for calling the dragon. Commander Savak approached Chuck with admiration and said with an impressed expression that he could not believe that they had such a powerful and huge earth dragon in their Alpine castle, to which the protagonist honestly admitted that between them, it seemed to him that dragons ate a lot. The commander seriously glared and officially warned that he hoped Chuck would understand that this brawl was a crying horror, and both they and the rulers of Dragon's Claw would have to pay for it, and the hero exclaimed in fear. The commander raised his hand and stated that Chuck's soldiers were new to their city, and they were too cautious in a new environment. The hero shyly scratched the back of his head and said that their people were fighting with others, and if the protagonist could not lead his people, then how could he be an officer? The protagonist turned to the hero, and he stated that his soldiers were too excited about the war with Stuart. The guy blinked and asked if the same thing applied to his subordinates. The protagonist slammed his hands together and asked how it could be his duty, since it was normal for a soldier to fight back. Chuck stood up straight and said nobly that no matter what, it was undeniable that the Scars had started this and that he, sir, was the real culprit, and the warrior honestly added that it was hard to blame Lord Chuck for this and that he, Booster, was responsible as an officer. The commander raised his hand philosophically in thought and fatalistically remarked that it was just fate. The protagonist cracked his knuckles and added that these were all just a few random and strange things. The man with the mustache languidly approached the heroes and understood the reason for this ridiculous farce. Savak looked at the heroes with determination and commanded them to stop, and that they had to shut up, and that they would do anything to avoid responsibility, and that it was a perfect combination, and that if they could use it in battle, they would not have to worry about the outcome of the battle. The heroes looked at each other with displeasure, and Savak continued on principle, that the honor they had passed on was too heavy for him to allow anyone to tarnish it. Savak looked at the interlocutors and stated that he had strictly decreed that in accordance with military discipline, he had decided that Chuck and Booster's teams would be included in the vanguard of the special forward team. Chuck and Booster turned back in shock and exclaimed in shock. Bedrick looked forward and said encouragingly that there was no need to look so sad, and they say this is the advanced battalion, but the enemy is not always in front of them. Chuck turned to his companion in surprise and asked him in bewilderment why Bedrick had come and that it was their business in Suffolk. Bedrick scratched his head in bewilderment, as a sign of friendship, and selflessly replied that he had volunteered to do it himself, and that he did not know anyone else. The bearded man, walking ahead, added practically that after all, the three of them were the most responsible, and if they were severely punished, he would not be able to stand aside. Booster grinned maliciously and mystically noted that there was so much snow this year, and that this was undoubtedly a sign of the goddess of snow and ice, and asked if it was really a wizard. The wizard turned his head skeptically and rationally objected that snow and wind were normal natural phenomena and that there was no need to drag in the goddess. The boy grimaced sarcastically and thought to himself contemptuously that it was no wonder that out of 10 famous ice and snow mages, he was the one appointed to the vanguard, and that with a low IQ they would be ostracized. The command headquarters of the Pompeian Expeditionary Forces. Magicians scurried around the city. Guards guarded the entrance. A girl in a hijab poured drinks. The king demandingly handed the goblet to the servant and commanded imperiously to pour. The girl worriedly raised her hand with the candle and carefully warned that Dr. Guan Yen would not advise drinking alcohol. The king impatiently tapped his finger on the table and categorically repeated that he needed to pour him more, and the hero confusedly complained that the sir was making his task difficult. Suddenly, the courtier turned around. Gerald turned in a friendly manner to his silent companion and thoughtfully noted that Zulu really should be in the sun more often. Gerald, shaking his head confidently in protest, replied professionally that the king knew his effectiveness did not depend on it, and the man added convincingly that it was beneficial. The old goblin looked down anxiously in shame and worriedly admitted that he was simply afraid that people would find out that the human expeditionary force was being commanded by a goblin from the most despised race. He sat in his chair and scornfully noted that he was also a disabled goblin. The goblet was full of alcohol. The servant decisively removed the wine goblet and sternly stated that that was all, and that no more drinking was allowed. Gerald, moving away from the throne, generously offered that he was sure his people did not care, and that they could go for a walk, and that Zulu deserved some fresh air. Zulu humbly bowed his head in agreement and respectfully replied that as he wished. The hero atmospherically left the royal apartments. Gerald looked at the magical device with an inquisitive eye and explained in an enlightening manner that it was the tuna's flame boundary, which maintained its internal temperature. The goblin looked down with warmth in his face and said that he took everything to heart. The king rode nostalgically along the sidewalk and warmly recalled that they had met in the cold and hungry winter, and that the goblin named Zulu had sadly confirmed that yes, and that there had been a food shortage. An image of the battle appeared and the hero figuratively told that when they found the creature, they saw Zulu in its all-consuming mouth. Gerald looked at the defeated enemy and added significantly that while saving Zulu, he had accidentally discovered something. The wounded goblin lay on the ground. The goblin angrily clenched his teeth and the hero enthusiastically proclaimed that Zulu was a god-bearer, and a very smart one at that. The long-haired man rolled his friend forward and solemnly promised that when he became king, Zulu would be able to continue to use his talents at the state level. Zulu modestly lowered his gaze in embarrassment, and honestly admitted that few knew that the real man behind the curtain was the one who pulled the king inside, and that everyone considered him a genius who managed to combine teaching with administrative work. The man looked at his friend with satisfaction and proudly replied that thanks to Zulu, Pompeii was flourishing in their days, and the goblin loyally declared that His Majesty had saved his life, and that he would do everything possible to help. Turning his head back, Gerald intriguingly asked what was up with that matter, and that there was nothing on it. Zulu turned to his interlocutor in bewilderment, and asked again in confusion what he was even talking about. Zulu mysteriously rolled the carriage down the street, and wisely replied that his master must be patient, and that a ripe apple will one day fall to the ground, and explained that he was talking about the goddess of religion. The goblin turned to his comrade in a businesslike manner, and asked him practically if their army had set out yet, and the man formally confirmed that it had, and that it had this morning, and that Chuck had been temporarily transferred to the vanguard. The Zulu rubbed his chin approvingly and strategically remarked that this was a good idea and that it would allow them to see what Chuck was capable of. The Zulu read the sheets of text analytically and astutely explained that when he had first analyzed the Alpine fortress he had found that every step they had taken was gigantic, and that he himself was a genius, and that naturally he had no doubt in the ability of others to perform miracles. The Zulu looked ahead in admiration and concluded impressively that he could only explain this by saying that Chuck was a rare and great general. The soldier yawned tiredly and noted with amazement that Chuck was in a great mood even after everything that had happened, to which the protagonist spiritually responded that he was practicing the prayer book for self-improvement, and that it was no surprise. Bedrick smirked ironically at his friend's religiosity and sarcastically added that, according to Chuck, his dear morning shrimp, Tianchi, and the temple were one and the same, to which the protagonist indignantly snapped that Bedrick should go to hell, because he was the only one who wouldn't shut up. The scout urgently ran up to the commanders and anxiously reported that gentleman, and that there was something ahead. The scout saw a fortified settlement, and informatively reported that this was a city that had gathered a detachment of Stuart's troops for its defense. The scout looked at the enemy positions appraisingly and added analytically that there might be a whole formed core of 3,000 to 5,000 people there and asked tactically if this territory was a relatively important military hub. Bedrick shook his head and simply answered that it was not, and that Jikishi was an ordinary farming town with a single specialty pumpkins. The commander squinted suspiciously at the strange picture and carefully asked how high the wall was and what the situation was with the defense, to which the scout professionally reported that the wall was thin and that the height was no more than 3 peaks, and that no guards were found either. The guy looked warily at the deserted settlement and noted with puzzlement that it was strange. Could it really be an empty city? And maybe everything was not that simple here. Chuck looked at the open gates and carefully suggested that most likely it was a trap to lure them. The protagonist looked through the telescope. Then he began to walk to his squad. Chuck folded his arms and said he had seen it. It was a small farming town in Cascade. The soldiers on the wall had noticed them too and were quietly moving their troops. The warrior held up a finger and said he thought he had just seen a griffin flag with a red background and gold stripes, and another said he knew of 3 legions with griffins in Stuart. Chuck smiled and said he had a man who had served in the Stuart garrison. He would call him to see it. Henry looked through the telescope and said it was the ambition of a lion. He had also met the leader of their army, whose last name was Capped. Then he turned to our hero and added that they were only the bottom of the regular legion. He was sure they were stronger, and Chuck shouted that then there was no need to hesitate. Let them prepare for the attack. Let the archers load fire. Let the infantry raise their shields and prepare for a siege. There was snow on the mayor's residence. Baron Capped was drinking mead at this time. Then he wiped his chin and said that several days had passed since the declaration of war on Pompeii, and the high command was still in complete chaos, or perhaps a piece of shit would be a more appropriate description. Then he bit into a piece of meat and added that 15 days ago His Majesty Bereni asked them, the Griffins, to go over to the King's Guard at Winterfell, and now, 3 days ago, they were asked to return to Wangdu, which was the same as asking them to become a monkey. The Baron gritted his teeth and thought that the army of Pompey was already on the move, blocking their way back. He had to lead his men to the small town of Cascade to be able to fight in defense. It was all the fault of that stupid Sir Berluni. The 2 scribes sat at the table, and the plot told that Berluni had never been interested in politics and always relied on a few ministers to form a cabinet. It worked well enough. Some people even thought it was a better way than the emperor's monopoly on power. Berluni controlled 2 puppets, and the plot added that then a few months ago, His Majesty suddenly returned as king and began to interfere in politics with greater force. Soon it became clear to everyone that he was pure delirium. The king ran his finger on the map and offered to play, and the plot ended that it was common knowledge that in recent years Pompey was developing much better than Stuart. But Berluni declared war on Pompey. The knight burst into the office and shouted that the barbarians from Pompeii were advancing. Already on the wall, the warrior covered himself with a shield and said that a rain of arrows was coming, after which everyone took cover behind their shields. Capped examined the arrow and said that, surprisingly, there were 3 large arrows. The knight opened his mouth and said to look at these dragons. It was only a matter of time before they destroyed the wall under them. Chuck looked through the telescope and asked why no one had broken away, and the Highlander next to him said that he would like to demonstrate their military prowess at Fort Alpine. They had too much cavalry, they could not escape, so they had to defend themselves. The protagonist landed on the ground and asked what was the point of discussing this. Let them just let the dragon take the initiative and break through the walls, and then heard that the trial arrows had been fired, so they needed to discuss how to attack the city. After which the mountaineer turned and noted that the siege was a delicate matter, not as easy as it seemed, since they were all inexperienced. Why not entrust it to him? Chuck scratched his nose and noted that it did not matter, everything depended on him, and the mountaineer next to him noted that he would like to gather his orcs and tigers. Such a battlefield suited them. A moment later, our hero's army went into battle. Chuck opened his mouth and shouted that the girl hit with a fireball. Let her make a hole in this wall. The girl quickly began to cast a fireball. At the same moment, she hit the wall. The protagonist looked at her with displeasure and asked that she was going to make a hole in the wall in this way. The man put his hand on his chest and asked to let him do it. Then he began to summon a snowball. Then he released it forward. This spell managed to break one part of the wall. After some time, a hole was formed in the wall. The tower stood in the middle of the city, and someone in it asked what they should do. The heir of Capped closed his eyes and replied that the enemy would certainly attack through this gate. Let them give the order for all infantry to prepare for battle, and the warrior asked what to attack now, not defend. Van Dan looked at him furiously and shouted not to be stupid and go forward. The powerful warrior followed the lord and said that his nephew did not seem to understand what war was, and the heir noted that this was true. Maybe he would begin to grow up when the army stopped calling him uncle. The warrior looked at him and asked what he said. Now is the time to attack. Van Dan smirked and noted that now was not the right time. Then he looked straight ahead furiously and added that it was Stuart's most secret weapon, and he would not allow it to be revealed until there was a need. The heir presented the magic stone and said that Stuart had an excellent black crystal sodawara, which could be purified to create the famous magic equipment, the Stone of Fate. After which he introduced several warriors and added that the method of application was also very simple and cruel. The heart of a living person is ripped out and a magic stone is inserted in its place. Those who are on the verge of death are reborn and gain the ability to manipulate their own blood. But what gives the stone its name is that the power of a soldier manipulating blood is completely random. The guy looked at his hands with tears in his eyes, and Fang Dan continued that some of them may be good fighters, others are most likely useless. The doctor cut out the patient's heart, and the heir continued that the solution to the problem of the lack of black crystal is simple for Stuart. Several dead bodies lay on the table, and the man continued that for each stone, a certain number of human receptors are prepared, and if the person is too weak, they are simply killed and the stone is filled by the next person. The three warriors stood one after another, and Fang Dan finished that qualified recipients of the stone, who become Stuart's best soldiers, are known as blood transfusions. The heir smiled and thought that in the city of Cascade there are 50 blood knights, who are his main force in this battle. It will not take him long to destroy their entire army. Then he clenched his fist and shouted that it will not take him long to destroy their army. The soldier looked away in surprise. Then he received a powerful blow. The heir watched this from the gate. Then he opened his mouth and shouted, "What the hell is this?" The warrior in orange armor cut down the opponents. The blood knight grinned and said that he was indeed half man and half beast. Then he folded his arms and noted that it seemed like it was time for them to move out. However, Fan Dan turned and noted that not yet, they needed to wait, they needed to strike back. The barbarians began to pass through the crack in the wall. The archers were standing on the roofs, and the heir reported that although Pompey was advancing quickly, their archers were in a more powerful defensive position. The barbarians began to die from the hail of arrows. 2 archers stood still. Then a projectile flew at one of them. At this time, a hail of ice fragments approached. The ice began to kill the archers one by one. Fan Dan raised his head and shouted who was doing this. The ice mage stood on the other side of the battlefield and sent projectiles. Then he silently looked straight ahead. The blood knight looked at the owner and asked that in the end, it was they who would have to turn the tide. Then he smirked and said that he would bring the seriousness of the problem to their attention. The protagonist carefully watched the battle. He carefully looked through the binoculars and noted that a truly worthy demi-human is the pinnacle of courage. The barbarian opened his mouth wide and shouted to stop staring. Let him give him the binoculars, he also wants to see. After which both stared at the battlefield, and Chuck noted that his demi-humans were really something. Maybe he would somehow use them. However, at that moment, the warrior opened his eyes and shouted that this couldn't be happening. It looked like they were at a disadvantage. Chuck also looked through the binoculars and wondered what kind of nonsense was going on. The blood knights appeared on the other side. They had curved blades. They began to chop down our hero's army. The leader of the blood knights looked straight ahead. The protagonist turned to the reptile and said that this was his area of responsibility. First, he needed to escort them into retreat. The knight's helmet flew off to the side. The man headed for the exit. Then he gritted his teeth and shouted what kind of creatures they were. Our hero's army silently moved forward. A bottle appeared in front of the knight's face. Chuck looked at it and asked what was going on, and immediately heard the answer that there was an excellent group of magic knights there. The warrior took a sip and added that he did not know what kind of magic they used, but it was quite amazing. The protagonist turned to Buster. The warrior took off his helmet and reported that they use red weapons. They also stretch and can fly without hands. And Chuck wondered what other bug power there was. The long-haired man came up from behind and shouted that they were the Blood Knights. The barbarian opened his mouth and noted that he had heard a lot about them. The protagonist turned to the long-haired one and noted that he knew several. But in all of Stuart taken together there was no more than 1 brigade of Blood Knights. How could there be so many Blood Knights in such a shitty city? He knew how strong they were, and he replied that they were stronger compared to him. Another warrior turned to our hero and noted that they needed to wait for the main part of the legion to arrive. They would not dare to leave the city. And Chuck noted that there was no need to strain themselves so much. After which he darkened and ordered the entire Alpine fort to prepare for battle. Lord Booster looked at the protagonist and shouted that these Blood Knights and their entire legion were not something they could just take and defeat. At that moment, the barbarians brought improved armor. It was lighter and faster. Chuck touched it and noted that if the Lord could not do it, let him say that he could not do it, but not including them. Booster opened his mouth and shouted that they can't attack the city with dragon cavalry. He can't attack the city with cavalry. The protagonist put on his armor and told him to just wait. The protagonist smirked and thought that he really thought that his Alpine army only had ground dragons, barbarians, and Alpine centaurs, the best of the best in the world. At this moment, the monsters with orders approached. Booster put on his helmet and shouted that he was coming too, and the mage behind him said that he couldn't help anymore. The spell attack had exhausted his divine power. The Orange Knight bowed and asked them to return to the battlefield again to kill the enemy. The barbarian opened his mouth and said that he wouldn't do anything to undermine morale. Chloe opened her mouth and shouted for all the newbies to back off, they didn't belong here, and Heather pointed out that it was right, they should take the initiative. Chuck pointed out that the old guys needed to be let fight. Our hero's huge and powerful army headed forward, and the plot said that the Alpine fortress was once again assembled to lead the attack. Would it be possible this time? Van Dan put his finger on his chin and noted that it was so fast again, and this time only an eighth of the number of people who were there last time were there. This time only the dragons of the area and the cavalry centaurs who watched from afar were watching the battle, and the warrior from behind asked to join the fight as well. The heir turned and said that he could go, but he should be careful, he should stay with the knightly reserve and not go alone. Then he headed for the wall, where he immediately opened his mouth and shouted that Pompey's barbarian soldiers were already close. Let them shoot. They needed to shoot as much as possible. The archers looked forward. Then they received 2 arrows in the head. Van Dan hid behind the wall and shouted, how is it possible that they were moving at high speed, and at the same time they shot with such accuracy? Let half of the warriors raise their shields, cover the archers from fire. The knights raised their shields to protect the archers. Heather took aim and reported that they raised their shields, and Chuck ordered them to aim at the back of the shield and shoot if they dared to show even one body. At that moment, an archer was hit right in the face. The heir gritted his teeth and said that these were veterans with huge numbers and experience, and they did not even reach the second round before they suffered great losses. Maybe these younger Pompey horsemen were stronger than 3-bladed orcs. Chloe walked forward. Chuck pulled his sword aside, after which he bent down to jump. Our hero's army entered the battle with the enemy. Van Dan gritted his teeth on the wall and thought that especially the sword of that military man, his weapon was clearly not sharpened, but was able to inflict such a crushing blow. The Blood Knight grimaced and asked if it was their turn. The heir closed his eyes and thought that the Bloody Rider was his card, and whoever played it first at such a moment would be at a disadvantage, but then again, it seemed he had no choice. After which he grinned and asked Lord Cervantes to help him achieve this victory. Chuck scattered the enemies with a circular blow, after which he sharply strained his gaze. At that moment, he saw Cervantes walking towards him. The protagonist was all fired up and shouted not to let him down. The Lord ran towards him and shouted for him to die. Chuck smiled and remarked that he had never heard such a strange request before, but he would grant it to him. 2 powerful warriors clashed. The protagonist grinned and asked, straight to the point, he is a wolf. After which he threw the enemy back. Cervantes twisted his face and shouted that such a heavy, huge injury, inflicted in an instant. The protagonist suddenly appeared from behind and remarked that it was not worth being distracted on the battlefield. The Lord quickly turned around, after which he defended himself from the blow, and did not die from shock. But even if he did not die from shock, his internal organs would probably be half destroyed. Cervantes' face completely darkened. The protagonist swung at the enemy, after which he delivered a powerful blow. Chloe and Heather moved forward. The girl covered herself from the blow of the Blood Knight. The protagonist looked at the opponents, after which he struck them. Then he swung and shouted for them to go to hell with their leaders. The Blood Knights looked at him with a smile. The protagonist stood in a stance, after which he saw shurikens behind him. The projectiles flew past him. Chuck clenched his teeth tightly, after which he thrust his sword into the ground. He stood behind the blade, after which he wiped his cheek from the blood and noted that it was disgusting. 2 Blood Knights began to approach from behind. Chuck turned his head sharply, after which he did the splits, dodging blows. Then he immediately hit the enemy. With the second blow, he threw the second one back. The protagonist picked up the enemy's weapon and noted that without their weapons, they would not be able to fight with their bare hands. After which he approached them and added that he would not be able to win against him. Chuck looked closely at the blood, after which he turned his gaze to the team. Chloe clenched her fists and noted that this Blood Knight was really something. It took a lot of effort to kill one. Lord Booster ran forward. Then he swung at his opponent. The Blood Knight grabbed his stomach. 2 warriors struck him. Chuck noticed this and thought that this blood manipulation technique was truly universal. It could not only be manipulated remotely, but also turned into a shield, otherwise it would not allow him to finish this game. 1 barbarian received a blow. Then the second. Van Dan broke through the protagonist's army and thought that these barbarians were not easy guys, but this time he would die trying to win. The protagonist stood in the middle of the battlefield. The heir opened his eyes and realized that Cervantes was dead. The knight quickly ran past. Then he received fatal damage with a cry that he would fight the Lord. At the same moment, Lord Fontaine died. Van Dan darkened and thought that Cervantes was dead. Even Fontaine was dead. Chloe's mouth opened wide. Chuck quickly cut down the enemy and shouted how dare they sneak up on him. Then he opened his mouth and ordered them to retreat in a wave first. Their area dragon will be here soon. Let them not get caught in the wave. Van Dan stood silently in the middle of the battlefield. Then he clenched his teeth and thought that it was all over. At that moment, 2 monsters ran towards her. He stood near the wall and shouted for them to get out of here. The next moment, another part of the wall was broken through. The Blood Knights looked at each other and said that the city walls were destroyed. Then they pointed at the protagonist and shouted that this man killed Cervantes. Then they headed towards him and added that this was unforgivable. Even if they lost this battle, they would avenge the death of the Lord. Chuck went towards them and heard that he would take his life. Then he opened his mouth and noted that he knew that his side was defeated, but he still wanted to avenge his lord. Then he raised his weapon to his head and shouted that his courage was fully accepted. The protagonist swung his sword and shouted that if he valued his master's life so much, he should stay here with him. The powerful blow killed many soldiers of the army. Fan Rad stood near the destroyed wall. Then he took out his blade, immediately pierced the heart, and said that he asked to forgive his son for his incompetence. A monster with a giant sword, enveloped in the flames of chi, he cannot restrain himself. After which he slowly began to die. Our hero's army began to celebrate their victory. The man smiled widely. After which he walked forward among the joyful crowd. He opened his mouth wide and shouted that it was hard work for everyone, participating in 2 sieges in one day. Chloe ran up to our hero and shouted, "What kind of moon wave was that? It's amazing." Chuck opened his mouth and noted that he was hungry. "They have a suckling pig, if not, ham will do." Derek's mouth dropped open and he remarked that he couldn't believe he'd committed suicide. Booster turned his head and noted that he probably knew that if he lost the battle, he would stay alive and sit in a cage for the rest of his days. Chloe raised her hand, heard what Chuck was doing there, what he was doing with the air, and replied that their leader had always had such a habit, and she did not know why. It surprised everyone, he should just get used to it. The death count appeared on the system window, and Chuck shouted that he did not expect some blood knight to appear out of nowhere in this shitty city, and cause so many deaths this time. Then he narrowed his eyes and added that maybe everything was going so smoothly that he got a little carried away with himself. Then he began to walk forward and said that they were all soldiers who had walked this path with him. Chuck turned to the corpses and added that he would remember them all, he promised. A fire flared up sharply. The mage stood next to the funeral pyre and noted that the great ice goddess would accept their lost souls. There were a lot of fires burning in front of the army. Chloe turned her head and noted that the leader should not blame himself for them. Fighting and dying is a part of life, and Heather added that it was a rare privilege to die in a large enough battle. The protagonist closed his eyes and said that he did not need them to come here to talk to him, he was fine. Then he looked at the system window and added that there was good news. Another update after this battle, the first system top fighters were finally born, Berserker and Centaur Pioneer, 2 names that first appeared as top titles. The protagonist scratched his chin and thought that being the last newcomer to Alpesite Castle, it was no wonder that no one had been promoted for some time, but the mountain barbarians, the earliest of the patriarchs, had produced only 1 top warrior, while the later centaurs had produced 4. Perhaps the experience required for a barbarian to be promoted to Berserker was unusually high. At the same time, Ratio evolved. The girl raised her hand and remarked that she seemed to be on the path to enlightenment. Then she opened her mouth and shouted that she was going to explode. Chuck opened his mouth and asked what she was doing. Everything stopped abruptly. The protagonist glared and asked if she was playing with his feelings. Ratio nervously scratched the back of her head and replied that she thought he was really angry, and Chuck remarked that since she was not angry enough, he would help her. After which he began to kick her. The girl lay on the ground and asked him to stop. The protagonist stared at her. The girl clenched her teeth and screamed that this was really enough. She covered herself in dark energy, and added that she seemed to have really broken through. Chuck opened his mouth and asked what he felt, if there was anything special. Ratio looked at her hand and replied that she wanted to hit someone. It was like a fire in her heart. Derek opened his mouth and screamed that it was a berserker, and Chuck wondered that Derek could not see the system interface, and whether there was such a thing as a berserker in this world. The magician looked straight and asked that he had not even heard of the famous berserker, and Chuck wondered why he was not talking about the berserker of ancient times. The protagonist introduced warriors of different races and said that in ancient times, when the Titans were the kings of the world, they, humans, had no advantages over the orcs, Titans and elves. Then he introduced 3 mighty warriors and added that the human race in general arose to hold the glory of the future continental hegemon, that is, Werther leads the berserker. Chuck put his hand out and asked what this has to do with Ratio, and the mage replied that the history of that time is so vague that many races mysteriously disappeared during that period, including the berserker race. After which he came as close as possible to our hero and noted that according to rumors, the barbarians have more or less pronounced berserker bloodline, but he does not know whether this is true or not. The mage scratched his beard and said that judging by how their subordinate looks now, she has definitely gone berserk. He thinks perhaps she activated the berserker blood. Then he turned to the protagonist and added that he may not know that the wind berserker has disappeared, but the secret of berserking has survived to their days. The secret art of berserking has been modified and turned into the current holy prayer, which is said to be more effective and has fewer side effects, and Chuck said that all this may be related to the prayer of the word. Now that the fight is over, why not try to get out of it? Let her try to breathe deeply. Ratio began to breathe deeply. After which she fell to the ground and noted that she was so tired, she did not sleep for 3 days and 3 nights. The mage approached her and noted that perhaps it was because she was not used to it yet, so let her go back and rest and everything will be fine. Chuck turned to the barbarian and ordered him to hurry up and put away the loot and count the losses. After which he opened the system window and said that he did not think that he would improve himself to invest all the attribute points in the holy prayer, leaving 2 points each in agility and strength. The protagonist stared at his hand and noted that the system increases were proportional, and with his current base of 2 attribute points, this was an exaggerated effect. After which he turned to the Lord and asked how the capture of war trophies and the collection of captured tigers was going. Chuck smiled and also asked where the camp of the commander of their army was. Booster opened his mouth and replied that he had not yet had time to see why he was looking for the camp. The protagonist clenched his fist and shouted that for robbery, of course. Our heroes walked along the city street and discussed that 80% of the camp is in the original residence of the commander. He does not know where it is, he is familiar with this place, he can take them there, he has already forgotten about it, then let him show the way. Chuck turned his head sharply and noted that it was surprising that there were still quite a lot of commoners in the suburb, and Booster said that it was normal. Even if the repatriation was carried out before the war, there were always people who had nowhere to go. The protagonist suddenly opened his mouth and asked what was here. He was sure that he was not mistaken, and the long-haired man answered that it was true, it was right here. Chuck immediately kicked the door down, and noted that it looked shabby from the outside. He would eagerly wait for his moral damages to be compensated. A moment later, everyone was surprised by the wealth inside. Chuck turned and noted that it looked shabby from the outside. He would eagerly wait for his moral damages to be compensated, and Booster said that of course, this must be personal property brought by the army commander himself. Everyone quickly began to search the premises and said that the wine was really good, it tasted quite nice. They also found an official letter. The protagonist walked up to Derek and shouted to let him take a look too. They both stared at the letter in surprise. The protagonist opened his mouth and said what kind of joke was this, they wanted to scare the Stuart army. Booster started walking towards them and asked what was going on, what they saw, and Chuck said that the brave Griffin and the Bloody Knight had received several conflicting transfer orders, but were eventually blocked in the suburb and couldn't move a step. Derek pointed at the letter and noted that this was issued by the Council of Ministers, and this was the Imperial Court, but the command plan and route had nothing in common. The protagonist grinned and ordered to immediately go to the rear with a copy of the letter, and also let him ask whether they should move forward or rest, and the Lord said that the crazy Stuart king actually interfered with the command at his own discretion. The streets of the city were empty, and the building noted that in that case, it was time to start the banquet. He had seen a lot of cattle on the way, he would slaughter them for a snack. A moment later, the entire army of our hero was celebrating their victory. Chloe looked ahead with a grin. There was a pile of corpses in front of her. The girl turned sharply and asked the leader to be quiet. Then she smiled and noted that in their hearts there was a very powerful and valuable magic stone, and she was going to pull it out. Chuck leaned over and asked why she did not use pig brains, how she could find such a good thing, and Chloe shouted that in the end, it was their alpine fortress that was the main force, and it was reasonable to choose the best war trophies. Then she blushed and added that she gave all the war trophies from these surroundings to others. The protagonist put his hand on his head and said that he really wanted to kill her now. Stuart is not an idiot. How could it be that she does not realize this kind of problem? All these mystical knights have explosive fruits in their body. Once the carrier, the fire element explodes and burns the magic stone. Chloe smiled widely. Heard that if there is a fruit tree by the road and it is full of fruit, but no one eats it, does she know why? And answered, because the passers-by are fucking idiots. The protagonist abruptly opened and shouted that it was because the fruit was bitter. The long-haired man pointed out a finger, and noted that this man had a jewel on him. Then he pointed his finger at the corpse, and said that next to the man's heart he saw a flame of light. There must have been a fate stone that was mistakenly not self-destructed. A moment later, Chuck stood with it in his hands and said that controlling blood, depriving feelings, stimulating killing intent, this is the role of the magic stone, it is too abnormal, this kind of thing will definitely bring chaos to the world. The stone glowed unnaturally brightly red. Longhair turned to our hero and asked if they still wanted it, and Chuck replied that they didn't want what he had in his hands, he was mentally ill, no one was allowed to talk about it today, they needed to take advantage of the darkness, hurry up and burn all the corpses so that there would be no traces left, and they wouldn't be found. The cart was filled with corpses. The protagonist was riding in one of them, heard how he made it look like theft, this is what she got in exchange for justice, and replied that he was the main brain, let him shut up and calm down. The drunk lord opened his mouth and asked what they were doing. He just didn't see them when he was drinking wine. The protagonist turned to him and replied that they were going to bury the corpses, otherwise it would cause a plague, and Booster asked if he was okay, it was winter now, everything would thaw out by next spring, what plague? Then he opened his mouth wide and shouted that wouldn't he still have to deal with this next spring, he thought it was better to deal with it late than early, let him forget about it, they had to do it themselves in the Alpine fortress. The caravan moved and it sounded like he wasn't quite right in the head, maybe they would still be here next spring. Maybe he couldn't bear to see the mutilated corpses being carried into the darkness. He couldn't look at Lord Chuck, a man with a kind heart, anymore. The next day was morning. The people were going about their daily lives quietly. Derek closed his eyes and said that what the Falcon had sent yesterday afternoon had come back. The main army had asked them to stay put. When they arrived, it was said that they would begin to attack the Winter City. Chuck looked straight ahead and thought that Dracula had said that the Thunder Ring was in the house of a high-ranking nobleman named Magellan in the Winter City. At that moment, food was served and they said that he remembered that the Winter City, the main and important city in the northwest of Stuart, To attack like that is the same as looking for a missing person. But now it seems that Stuart is surprisingly slow to respond to their attack in Pompeii. Chuck grabbed a cookie and noted that, frankly, this war does not look like a national war at all. It is too easy. Cities are successfully conquered one after another. And Derek noted that now there are only a few large cities left in Stuart, and all of them are guarded from the inside and cannot retreat. Derek lowered his head, heard where the hundreds of regiments of the regular army under their jurisdiction had gone, where the Dragon Knight and the Great Mage had gone again, and noted that the accidental violation of command by the Mad King Beluni must be one of the reasons, but it is not the only reason. A raven flew over the trees and the warrior added that maybe Stuart really is secretly plotting something. A huge detachment entered the city, and the plot told that 3 days after Chuck led the detachment that successfully broke through Choksh, the main forces of the Pompeii Legion also rushed to the city for a general assembly. Chuck stared at the warriors in surprise. Then he put his hands on his hips and shouted what they were staring at. They saw gold on his face, and Derek noticed that they were jealous of him. The Knight of the Falcon defeated the Bloody Knight, won his first victory, captured the banner of the Legion. It was all him. The main character grinned and noted that it sounded good, and the warrior said not to be proud. Now he is in the very center of attention, so when the Legion returns, he will simply be kicked out. Chuck smiled and asked if the board will rot if replaced with gold. At that moment, Adam appeared, who noted that for him his victory in the first battle was a surprise. It was hard for him. Chuck bowed sharply and noted that he overestimated him too much. The girl looked at him and said that he was rude. The protagonist scratched his head and asked what the girl was so angry about, and Derek replied that it was even stranger that he had to reprimand him. Mr. Egwene was a guy, and he didn't like being mistaken for a girl the most. Chuck opened his mouth and shouted if he was really kidding, and the warrior replied that it might be hard to understand, but that's how it was. They even went to wash together. Adam looked at the protagonist and asked if he knew why such a powerful beast as a dragon wanted to become a partner of a dragon rider, and Chuck wondered why he suddenly asked such an inappropriate question. The man raised his head and said that dragons have intelligence not inferior to humans. Their life cycle is measured in millennia, but they live it in boredom and indifference. They do not mind spending several decades to travel with individuals who interest them, who eventually die, because they become partners. Derek opened his mouth and said that there are special ones, arousing interest in the chant, touching the soul, or relying on appearance. Chuck opened his mouth wide. Then he looked at the guy walking forward and asked what he wanted to say. That boy is a dragon rider. The main character introduced the guy with the dragon. Adam opened his mouth and said that there was a dragon willing to take the initiative to make a contract because of Mr. Egwene's appearance. In terms of aesthetics, there is no significant difference between humans and dragons. Beauty is beauty. He had heard that after the defeat of the friendly forces, he took responsibility for re-attacking the enemy army. Mr. Egwene recognized his fearlessness, so he came here on foot, not riding a dragon. The guy was looking at the bright light at that time. At that moment, a strong wind appeared. A dragon appeared in the sky and Adam noticed that it was Mr. Egwene's dragon, and the name of this wind dragon was Osiris. The red dragon hovered in the sky. Then the griffins appeared and Adam added that, to tell the truth, this is the first time since the contract between Osiris and Egwene, when they went on a sortie beyond Pompeii. Except for the dragon, there are also 9 falcon knights. They have amazing maneuverability. Chuck raised his head and said that frankly, he was delighted. If he ever got a flying beast to ride, he would fly over the heads of other riders and shit on them. In the next frame, the gates of Winterhirsch appeared. The ruler approached the edge of the wall and asked if there was any news, and the servant replied that none, not a single message had arrived. The man remembered the people entering the gates and said, "What are the upper classes thinking about? They themselves declared this war, so now they pretend to be dead. At first everything was fine, their city received a large amount of provisions and reinforcements." Then he remembered how they left and added that suddenly, for some unknown reason, reinforcements from other provinces from afar were transferred one after another, and the delivery of supplies abruptly stopped. The ruler introduced Beluni and noted that it was obvious that the war would affect the fate of the state, but they were acting carelessly. The servant gritted his teeth and noted that they needed to think carefully about how to use the power of the provinces to resist the country. They only had 30,000 city guards and 10,000 volunteers among the civilian population, and the Pompeians had 200,000. The old man opened his mouth and said that anger was often accompanied by stupidity and excessive aggression. Then he put his hand on his shoulder and said that they would do everything possible and leave the rest to the god of light. Everything around him trembled sharply. Griffins quickly appeared over the city. Heather looked straight ahead and asked if he thought they could really take it by storm. The local city walls were much more majestic than any she had seen before, and Chuck and Derek noted that there should be no problems. In books on the art of war it is said that 10 times more enemies may be needed to besiege a city. Maybe the difference with them is small, but it is there. A woman appeared on the wall in the pipe. The main character looked closely at her figure and wondered who it was. It was hard to tell by her clothes. Maybe a Stuart pastor. She had a stunning figure, in modern parlance, a MILF among MILFs. Derek looked at him and asked what he was watching, and Chuck replied that he hadn't noticed anything strange yet, just the usual security and patrols. The warrior looked at the table and heard that they had completed their reconnaissance. Nothing unusual had been noticed inside the city walls. The Griffin riders looked beyond the walls and added that there were equally half-ruined buildings and low walls, and they didn't have many weapons and crossbows to counterattack. Derek took the magic radio and told them to get back into line, and Heather asked how soon they could occupy Stuart after the reconnaissance report. Chuck put the pipe away and replied that if there were only 2 countries on the continent, everything would have gone much easier. Then he imagined a dark silhouette and added that the reality was that, in addition to Stuart and Pompeii, there was also the Holy Lotus West. The protagonist folded his arms and said that they clearly weren't going to just watch Pompeii or Stuart suffer a total defeat in the war. The view of the camp opened up. It was said that the engineers began to collect wood for production. The installation of siege equipment took 10 days, and these days were the calmest before the battle for Winterfell. People were carrying equipment. It was thought that while one side was preparing siege equipment, the knights were sitting behind the wall. It was thought that the other side was adjoining the wall and preparing for battle. In the end, the big battle finally began. The heavy weapons of Pompeii are ready and the tabernacle is open. A view of the hills opened up. People were standing behind the rocks. Looking to the side, the man said that they should keep the pace, keep the line, to which the man replied that he understood. The people were moving forward. Looking down, Chloe asked if they were too secretive. She thought they had already seen them, to which the hero asked what she thought. Let them mobilize their troops and be ready to defend. The knights were sitting on the wall. It was heard that there must be troops on the city wall now, determined to die. Frowning, the guy said that everyone was in position and ready to attack, to which the man replied that they should wait for his command. They would be ready. The catapults were loaded. The people stood still. The protagonist clenched his teeth tightly. Frowning, the man shouted a command. The knights hid behind the wall. The catapults suddenly began to shoot. The man looked forward angrily. The magicians began to shoot fire spheres. The charges flew forward rapidly. Stretching his hand forward, the magician said to stop these boulders quickly. The young man began to use a spell. Explosions thundered in the sky. The people looked up in amazement. Chuck's eyes widened, thinking that an eye for an eye. This is war, this is really shocking. Gritting his teeth, the man said that these boulders were annoying, to which the man replied that he shouldn't worry, these boulders weren't made to break through walls. The knights ran away in fear. It was heard that they were deliberately throwing fire stones at the walls so that they would have nowhere to run. Frowning, the hero thought that of course, when he can use his intellect to the maximum, he can organize everything competently, even killing allies. Stretching his weapon in front of him, the man shouted that he should go ahead. Rushing forward, the knight shouted that they should continue and attack them. Standing by the stairs, the guy said that they should let them know who the Pompeians were. A view of the buildings opened up. Sitting by the fireplace, the man said that if they were attacked from the air, they were at a disadvantage, they should investigate the enemy. Standing next to him, the boy said that there was no need for that, he was too panicky. Because when conducting aerial reconnaissance at high speed, only blurred colored spots on the ground were visible, it was impossible to distinguish many details. Sitting on a chair, the man said that so, instead, they could use a good opportunity to transmit false information, to which the young man replied that it was good. Frowning, he added that hot air ballooning was a taboo for them to win. They needed heavy firepower on the ground. Let them stay at high altitude only for reconnaissance. To which he was told that the Lord had previously used all the necessary materials to capture all the military bases. The camp appeared. It was heard that those things that were covered with cloth covers, many would think that this was just the roof of houses. And it was impossible to think that this was cloth. What the hell was there? With wide eyes, the young man said what it was. The towers appeared. It was heard that these buildings, in fact, this is their nirvana. The man looked at them in amazement, and asked how this was possible. Their aerial reconnaissance did not report this. No one said that they had such firepower. Standing next to Milord, the guy asked what but why exactly he, although relatively weak, the militia and volunteers of the city defense army guard this fortress, to which he replied that they are generals. This is the brain of the entire army. All they need to do is just think. How can he think like some old man? The people stood in front of each other. It was heard that they were in the province of Sela, to fight against the country, so the city wall will definitely not be guarded. Looking straight, Vincent said that they will definitely rely on the superior numbers to suppress the defenders of the wall, helping their infantry to climb the wall, and they will definitely do it. The men were lying on the floor. It was heard that good steel for using the blade. They use a weaker army and volunteers to guard the city wall as bait, although it is merciless, but they have no place for friendship. Looking straight ahead, the man asked what was going on. Did they really give up? Sitting by the fireplace, Vincent said that the war had officially begun. They would take the initiative, let the other links leave the fight. Looking down, he added that it was time to counterattack. Standing by the stairs, the guy thought about what was happening. Suddenly, people began to fall down. Gritting his teeth, the man said that there were siege-heavy weapons and throwing towers, to which the knight asked what, but the report did not mention this. There are only houses behind the wall. The hero clenched his teeth tightly. Frowning, the man said that he should tell him. Now that they were already attacking the wall, even if they were torn to pieces, they had to take the city. People started to climb the wall. They started to fight, and it was heard that they should kill them. Larry frowned and said that the hell, where is the mage? Let him hurry up and provide support at the front. Looking straight ahead, Vincent said that it was time, let the mage act as support. The mages attacked. Arrows rushed forward. The people on the wall fought. The knights fought each other. Frowning, the hero said that this was wrong. They had been fighting for a long time and still could not attack them. What would they say to this? To which the man replied that because Winterfell had equipment called magical extraction, this was his greatest merit. Such equipment was not available everywhere. The protagonist turned around when he heard that it could be launched using the energy that the mages possessed. It saved his own magical powers, to which he asked what about theirs. They didn't have one, and Larry added that the device was too heavy and the structure was also too complex. No one could carry it. A glow appeared around the mage. It was heard that it was like two children fighting among themselves. When one was thirsty, he drank milk. When hungry, he ate meat. The other might have an empty stomach, but with tears in his eyes he fought envy. Chuck's eyes widened, asking that they used it for the siege at the very beginning. And what about the fire trebuchet? Where is the fire mage? To which the man replied that they couldn't win just like that. They needed a stunning success. The mages stood in a circle. It was heard that everyone was here at the moment. They needed to rest and restore their magical power. Frowning, the hero asked what an unexpected advantage in strength. Can you win this way? Putting his hand to his face, the man said that the planning and strategy are so precise. I wonder who is in charge. Looking straight ahead, the protagonist said that the siege is very important. People were fighting. The thought arose that they were really losing. The dragon opened its mouth wide. Raising her hand up, Chloe said that she should look at the sky. Dragons were flying in the air. They were directing flames towards the city. The attack came flying at the building. The knight was sitting astride the dragon. The man's eyes widened in amazement. He clenched his teeth tightly. Clenching his fist, the knight said that he should report the situation. Retreat first. Retreat to a safe distance or go back. To which the guy asked what to go back. Standing still, Chuck asked what it was like after the attack. Just leave. Standing behind the man, he added that this height is estimated to be 3,000 yards. This no longer counts as a return. They want to go back. To which Larry replied that there is no way. He can only buy time. Let them retreat temporarily. This battle is considered lost. Looking up, the man said that everyone should give the order for an emergency retreat. Let them run as far as possible. To which the warrior replied that they seem to have retreated to their camp. Let him go and see. And the protagonist said that he will go too. Suddenly, they rushed forward. Standing near the dragon, the girl said that he gave the order to return. Why did he want to retreat? And the man asked what the hell was going on here. Zack opened his eyes wide and replied that when they got far enough, he saw the inside of Winterfell. They have many weapons for hunting dragons. Crossbows appeared. The girl looked at him in amazement and asked what the dragon hunting weapon was. She remembered that it was an idea from a genius alchemist, a magic weapon in his hands. The arrow flew into the target. It was heard that he was fascinated by his whirlpool system, giving the ordinary arrow a speed much faster than the bowstring, causing it to spin at a high speed. The arrow pierced the target. It was said that at the same flight speed, the high-speed rotating blade tip can penetrate armor. This is not cool at all. Frowning, the hero said that it was impossible. There can't be so many dragon hunting weapons. At most, only 5 of them are genuine. Unless they need to pay a lot of money. This is an astronomical number. Most of them are fake. The girl glared and replied that despite this, they were on a hill. It was impossible to tell which ones were real and which were fake. What he said was bullshit. The thought appeared that this brat was speaking too arrogantly. Were dragon knights really that biased? Looking at the hero, she added that in the end, it was not because the hole dug during the first siege was too big, only for everything to end like this. To which the protagonist asked what happened to him. He was not responsible for attacking the city. What did he want him to do? The thought appeared that if he was responsible for leading the team, it was still possible to lose. The camp appeared. It was heard that so, their team would participate in the next attack on Winterfell. The protagonist closed his eyes. Sitting at the table, the man said that he should know that soldiers must obey orders. They have no choice but to obey. Looking at him, it seems he still does not understand much. Looking at him, Chuck heard that he should be serious about him. Standing still, the hero listened to the fact that if this siege fails again, then probably they will be in for a disaster. Looking straight ahead, the protagonist heard that if this siege fails, they will be in big trouble, to which he asked when they will storm again. Frowning, the man answered that in 4 days, at dawn, they will have enough time to prepare. Standing in the office, the man said that they received a report, to which he answered that he hoped it was good. Smiling widely, Ralph said that it was true. Reinforcements are already on their way to them. 3 legions of 12,000 people will arrive in Winterfell, including the elite of the Thunderers. Sitting on a chair, Vincent said that Winterfell was already surrounded by Pompey's troops. How reinforcements could get into the city was a real headache. To which the man replied that they seemed confident in their strength, and thought they could hide from the enemy, taking advantage of the darkness of the night. Looking down, he asked when they planned to arrive, to which he was told that in 3 days, at dawn. People were standing at the gate. The man held a torch in his hands. Taking a step forward, the man said that they were Thunderers. They came from the capital, let them enter. Raising his hand, Vincent said that he heard that 3 legions would be arriving, to which the guy replied that they had some difficulties. It seemed they were the only ones who could help them tonight. The man looked ahead silently. Standing behind him, Ralph asked what was wrong. They needed to receive reinforcements as soon as possible. Standing with a torch in his hands, Vincent thought that something was wrong. Despite the strict discipline and the ban on talking, the soldiers who had come a long way did not show even signs of fatigue. Closing his eyes, he added that in the pitch darkness, when nothing can be seen, no one took measures to ensure the safety of the soldiers. The man widened his eyes, wondering if this could be. Standing in front of him, the creature asked if they could enter. Ralph's eyes widened in amazement. Smiling, Vincent said that now that they were defeated, the fall of Winterfell was only a matter of time, so there was no point in sacrificing people unnecessarily. Stretching his arms out to the sides, the creature said that there was no need to be discouraged. One of the dragon knights would soon arrive to help them, to which the man asked if that was true. There were 3 dragon knights in the empire. Which of them would arrive? The man's eyes lit up and he said that they said he was a golden dragon himself, but as far as they knew, he had recently died in battle while leading a siege against an evil dragon. Standing in front of the monster, the man asked how the dead could protect them. Smiling, the zombie asked why not. Lowering his head, Vincent said that it looked like the other 2 legions had fallen by his hand. Raising his hand, the monster replied that they had eaten their flesh and drunk their blood, a real delicacy. Standing in front of him, the man said that it looked like the emergency evacuation from the capital last time was their doing. Let him tell them what had happened. Grabbing his weapon, the zombie said that he didn't need to know about it. The monsters rushed forward, and he added that it was because he was going to die soon. Raising his hand up, Vincent said that he was going back. The boy looked at him in fear and screamed that it hurt. The boy froze in bewilderment. His eyes widened and he made sounds. Looking straight ahead, the zombie asked what was wrong with him. He seemed to be losing consciousness. The gates of the fortress appeared. Chloe looked at him in surprise and asked what was going on. Frowning, the hero replied that he had just heard something like screams, to which she asked if it was true, and he added that maybe someone had slipped and fallen in the shit. Standing behind him, the man said that dawn was coming soon, it was time to begin the attack, to which the protagonist replied that the inevitable could not be avoided. Raising his hand up, Chuck said that everyone was out of the fortress. On his signal, let them attack. People rushed forward, hearing that they were attacking. The knights were approaching the wall, and Larry said that they were in ambush. Let them be quiet, they would not let them hear them, to which the man replied that they could do whatever they wanted. Looking straight ahead, the hero said that they had moved his guys forward and made them cannon fodder. Standing next to him, Chloe asked where they were, and the protagonist added what the hell they were doing. Stretching her hand